Hey guys, hope you are well. So, welcome to the I'm Fictions 2.0. This is the story about what if Naruto neglected by Hinata. Part 6. Hope you loved previous parts. Check out full playlist. If you did, do subscribe for more awesome what if. Share with your friends and enjoy them. Check out the other videos I have created. Comment down your opinion. Share with your friends. So, without wasting any time, let's jump into the 6th part. Chapter 18. Talking. Thinking mental conversation. Demon god or the like. Jutsu. Family is for verily one person was absent from this. Naruto stood looking over at Hinata, her eyes narrowed, but more in question than anything else. When Hinata had begun using her powers in the fight, Kyuubi had gone ballistic, telling her that somehow his father's enemy was connected to Hinata. As she looked at Hinata, she felt a small shiver run down her spine as her eyes turned to see Naruto looking directly into her eyes, blue into the purple and black ones, and a horrible thought went through her mind, even as the referee's voice rang out. Okay, next up Naruto Namikaze and Naruto Uzumaki, please make your way to the arena now. Called the voice. Both teens seemed to take no notice of the announcement at first, their eyes locked onto one another, both experiencing a feeling that they could not quite place. After a moment Naruto broke their gaze and turned blinking to face the arena as if coming out of a dream. She seemed to recognize what was happening and willed herself forwards down the steps and out of the contestant box. Naruto's eyes tracked the blonde-haired girl as she slowly descended away from him and turned his thoughts momentarily inwards. What was that feeling just now? Thought the boy, questioning himself as if he expected some insight of information to suddenly bloom out of the silence. Fortunately for the blonde youth, he happened to have just such a source currently living within his head. That feeling, Naruto, is fear, but not one for yourself, but of yourself. Spoke the comforting tone of Juubi as she listened to the boy's inner thoughts. Naruto blinked slightly at the voice, noticing for the first time that he had unknowingly slipped into his own mindscape. This realization caused him to let out a small panic sound before prompting him into speech. Crap. Oh crap, the match, I can't be in here, where's the exit, do I have an exit, darn it, how do you work this thing? Called Naruto, reaching up to grab his own mental projection of his head in distress. However, before he could get well into his personal mental flagellation, Juubi landed a small blow upon his head with a light smack of impact. The sudden feeling snapped Naruto out of his mini distress before looking over at his companion, his eyes still showing traces of worry. Sorry Juubi, but I have to hurry if I'm zoned out here, that means I'm probably face down in the contestant box right now. I need to get back. The excited boy fired off, drawing a slightly confused look from Juubi as he spoke. For a second she just looked down at the boy, her arms drawn up to cross under her bosom, and one eye quirked up in apparent confusion. Then she seemed to brighten, swiping her fist into her open palm with a look of understanding, before having to stifle a small giggle looking down at Naruto. Naruto, she began, her voice twinged with the traces from her recent laughter. Naruto looked up at her as she continued, you still think that time passes the same in here as it does in the real world? Replied Juubi as Naruto seemed puzzled by her words. How of course it does, I mean doesn't it? Asked the boy while Juubi just shook her head in apparent amusement at the blonde's distress. Hi Naruto, it does, so don't worry, outside almost no time has passed at all, maybe a few seconds, but nothing more, so we have time for a small talk before this next match. Continued the woman, getting an accepting nod from Naruto, who allowed himself to sink to a sitting position as Juubi did the same, alighting upon a branch behind her. So that feeling was me being scared of myself. I don't get it, why would I be scared of myself? Asked Naruto as Juubi seemed to consider her next words for a moment. Well Naruto, you see, this is the first time you have fought someone that you know and care about, you've never risen a hand against someone you truly loved before. It isn't something anyone can do easily, it tears at you from the inside, and that is what you were feeling. You are afraid of hurting your niece and Naruto in the coming match. Finished Juubi, her eyes not leaving Naruto's as the teen blinked a few times in surprise before shaking his head slightly. So what you're saying is I don't want to hurt her. But Juubi, I don't know if I love her anymore. I don't know if I have for years. Naruto said, his eyes dropping to look down at his hands in apparent frustration. Naruto, I can't tell you what to feel about your sister, but what I can tell you is what to be ready for in the coming match, because something tells me that her hesitation will not last. You and I both know that if you enter this fight half-hearted you will lose, and with that loss will come the end of whatever chance you had at saving Naruto from the damn prophecy Kushina learned about. So for now, put aside your doubt and fight Naruto and change this world for the better. Juubi said, looking down at Naruto with a small sad smile on her face. Naruto looked up from his hands and into Juubi's for a moment before letting out a sigh. Hi Juubi, you're right, I guess it's time Naruto and everyone else learned a little more about me. Replied the boy, pushing himself up from the ground with a small effort and looking over at Juubi, who was smiling. Of course I'm right, when am I ever not? Juubi said with a smile playing across her face as Naruto began to fade, a small smile playing across his face as he did. Sure Juubi, whatever you say. Called Naruto as he faded, leaving Juubi alone once again. For a moment her smile stayed, but it faltered after a moment as her thoughts turned to her own worries. Her thoughts turned to what she had feared for some time, but hadn't spoken of to anyone. Her youngest Sachi had been split in two, and she knew that before his split that he had adored the sage. It was why she had been so afraid when she first met Caillou, and honestly why she had delayed her meeting for so long. She had suspected that at least one half of her Sachi would follow the sage's words. Now however, it was worse because she now knew which of her Sachis she was going to see soon. No, it wouldn't be the kind face of a happy child that she would meet, but the anger and hatred of one she loved more than her own life, and that thought terrified her. Ami, help me to be strong. Help me to stay strong against my Sachi's rage. Juubi whispered, even as she turned her gaze to look back out through her host. Naruto re-entered his body to see that almost no time had passed for him. In fact, he still stood beside Hinata, while Naruto was only about halfway down the steps leading to the arena. Giving himself a little shake, he took a step forwards towards the stairs before he felt a small tug on his sleeve, causing him to halt and turn to face the feeling. The blonde turned to see Hinata had taken his sleeve lightly in her fingers, her eyes looking into his with a small worried look in her eyes. Hinata had been there to see Naruto and Naruto slowly drift apart, the sadness that occurred between them, and now the fear that had played across Naruto's face a moment before. So as Naruto turned to face her, Hinata took a quick breath before pushing herself forwards into Naruto, her body pressing lightly into his as her eyes slowly closed and her delicately pink lips pressed gently into his own. Naruto simply froze as Hinata pressed into him, even as his senses took full notice of her. His boy feeling the warmth and softness of her form as it seemed to mold with his own. His nose picking up on the small touch of lavender still distinguishable even after her recent battle. Before he could take notice of more, her lips had found his own, and his body acted on instance, pulling her close him, even as his eyes narrowed themselves as he allowed his lips to taste the girl's own. The two stayed like that for a few heartbeats before Hinata slowly pulled away from the boy with what seemed like an effort. For a second they just looked at one another, Hinata's pale eyes looking back into Naruto's own points of purple and black. Hinata's face slowly turned red as she looked at Naruto before her head dropped and she spoke, apparently directing her words at Naruto's feet. That was for luck, Naruto, so now it's your turn to show everyone. She said, not looking at Naruto. For a second Naruto didn't answer. Finally he seemed to rouse himself slightly before he leaned forwards, slightly cupping Hinata's cheek gently in his hand and raising her now bright red face to look into his own smiling one. Thanks Hinata-chan, don't worry, I'll be okay, so cheer for me, okay? Said the boy before planting a soft second kiss upon the girl's lips before turning to start descending down the stairs towards his coming battle. Hinata simply looked after the blonde boy, her face still red from the moment before, not even noticing the other girl's presence until a small elbow poke drew her attention to the other. I swear you and nice and need to get a room. Chuckled Minami, causing Hinata to eep softly and turn to see the entire competitor's box looking her way. The poor girl flushed an even brighter red before moving to stand by the railing, looking pointedly away from everyone around her, even as Minami and Sakura let out some knowing giggles. As the two teens made their way into the area and the stands above, Kushina was watching her two children walk out to battle one another, and her heart clenched at the sight. Oh Sachi Musum, I'm so sorry, if only I'd stopped this sooner, please my maelstrom, please save our family please. Thought Kushina, forcing herself to keep the tears that threatened to fall from her eyes in. From beside the woman, Mito seemed to notice her cousin's discomfort and reached a small hand over to grab hold of Kushina's gently. As the two Riti's hands closed on one another, Kushina looked down into her Musum's eyes, Mito giving the women a small hopeful smile. Hakusan, are you okay? Asked Mito, her small voice laced with concern. Kushina let the words wash over her as she looked into the hopefully face of her youngest. After a moment Kushina gave the girl a small smile before nodding to her. Hi Mito, I'm fine, now let's cheer for your Nisan and Nyasan. Kushina replied, attempting to force a smile onto her face as she spoke. Mito, however, was not convinced by Kushina's words and hopped down off her seat, diving beneath her chair, again apparently looking for something. Kushina stared after her Musum in a mix of confusion and worry. Mito had just pulled herself out of Kushina's hand and apparently taken shelter under a chair for some reason. However, before Kushina could mentally berate herself further, the smiling face of Mito popped back up with something held behind her as she smiled up at Kushina. Dear cousin, Naruto-san gave this to me this morning and said to keep it close if I was sad, so don't worry, Caillou will make you better. Announced the little Riti as she pulled from behind her back a large black and red orb about the size of a small watermelon. The girl's announcement drew confused looked from Hiashi and Hitomi, who along with Kushina thought the same thing at one. Caillou. Kushina looked at the orb for a moment before she recognized it as one of Naruto's seeds, but something was off. Instead of being the solid black orb she had known, there were several bright red stripes along the ball that seemed to wave gracefully in and out of each other all along its surface, something she had never seen of any of Naruto's seeds before. However, before she could allow her mind to wander further, Mito had pushed the orb into her open hands with a satisfied smile on her lips as she hopped up to sit beside Hanabi, apparently pleased with her work. While Hitomi vaguely recognized the ball as one of Naruto's seeds, she had noticed a difference as well, but decided that it wasn't something she was going to find out anytime soon, so just settled her eyes forwards once again. The Ashi in turn had decided after a quick check with his Byakugan that the ball was indeed just a ball, nothing but a black and red solid ball, so turned his attention away as well. Kushina in the meantime was looking down at the orb in her hands, her mind trying to piece together why Naruto had given it to Mito, and possibly more importantly why it was different. Absent-mindedly she ran a hand along the surface of the orb, tracing one of the lines as she did. To her utter surprise the orb vibrated softly at her touch and let out sound. Gooor. The noise came from the orb softly, causing Kushina to almost drop the ball and look wide-eyed from the orb in her hand to Mito, who was smiling up at her. "See, Kaiid will help, he likes you," spoke the redeed as if that somehow explained everything. Kushina looked from Mito to the orb again before looking out over the arena where Naruto and Naruko were just reaching the center. Without even realizing it, she gently lowered her hand to once more pet the orb in her hand, the soft purr almost too quiet to hear issuing from it again, and a strange peace flooding over her as she looked out at her children. For some reason she could not explain, she was confident that Naruto had things well in hand. And maybe, just maybe, he had this planned out as well. From up in the cage booth another figure was busy letting his thoughts race through him as he looked down at the teens below him. This fight isn't going to be fair at all. I mean, Naruko is already high chunin in skill alone, and her power is easily above some jonin. Naruto doesn't have a chance. And that's my fault, isn't it? Thought Minato looking down at his children as they turned to face one another. Damn it, why is this happening? I did this so that they would all be safe, dear Kami, why are you forcing them to fight? Not like this. Don't make me watch my son be humiliated because of me. Please, just have him walk away please. Continued the blonde man, letting his face drop slightly from the match below. As Minato looked down, a figure who had been hidden until recently decided to speak up. After all, the tournament had been going perfectly smoothly, maybe his old teammate wasn't going to pull a stunt after all. With those thoughts, Jiraiya the Toad Sage slowly rose out of the shadow cast by Minato's chair, giving a little cough as he did so to alert the others to his presence. The other cages simply gave him a small look before focusing forwards. They had known that Minato would not have stood so close to them with no guards, and given his connection with the Toad Sage, they had rightly predicted that the spy master was in the room with them somewhere. Jiraiya rested a hand on Minato's shoulder before speaking up. "So kid, ready to see your girl win this tournament?" asked Jiraiya, trying to make his tone one of comfort and happiness. However, his words just made Minato flinch slightly, but this was not the place to show any weakness, so despite himself he straightened before replying, his tone forcibly pleasant. "Jiraiya, let's not assume too much, remember that Naruko has many strong opponents before her," replied the blonde, giving a small incline of his head towards the other cages, who gave him small nods in return, accepting the gesture. Jiraiya shrugged his shoulders in reply, personally knowing that Minato had to keep up a public face between the other two cages, but personally thinking the only contest that Naruko would have would be Minami, and either way it had to come down to one of those two, the children of prophecy. Hi, still never hurts to bet on your own children, right?" replied the sage, giving Minato a smile. Minato seemed to consider the sage's words for a moment as he turned to look down at the arena again, his mind repeating the sage's words over and over as he did. Finally, after a moment, he spoke up, his voice coming out with a weight as though the words were somehow physically heavy. "My own children. Right. Never hurt," the blonde whispered as his eyes fixed below at his greatest success and most shameful mistake. Below in the arena, Naruko and Naruto had taken their position facing one another, bright sapphires staring across into amethysts that flashed with an intensity that could almost be felt. The jonin between the pair looked back and forth for a moment before speaking up. "Okay, you two, you know the rules, so Naruto, are you ready?" asked the figure while shifting the senbon in his mouth slightly to point towards the boy, as if he was a teacher in a class calling on a student. Naruto broke his stare for a moment to look up at the man before replying. "Hi Jonin-san, I am prepared," replied the boy, returning his gaze to the other blonde, who looked back at him, a mixture of concern and anger on her face. "Damn it, Naruto, why couldn't you just give up? I don't want to hurt you, don't you get it? You don't have a chance against me. I don't want to hurt you, Naya-san," thought Naruko as the jonin turned his attention to her. However, before he could speak, Naruko cut across him. "One moment please, Jonin-san, I have something to say to Naruto," fired off Naruko, her voice crisp but respectful despite that. The Jonin looked at her for a moment before shrugging slightly. "Fine by me, but make it quick," he replied, stepping back slightly to give the two some kind of privacy. Naruko turned back to face Naruto, her face set in determination as she did. Naruto for his part was now looking at his niece and with some confusion playing across his face at her actions, but before he could do more than stare, the blonde girl spoke. "Naruto, I want you forfeit the match, you know you can't beat me, and I don't want to hurt you, so please, just stand down. If this is about proving something to Towson or something, just stop now, before you force me to embarrass you," spoke Naruko, her voice heavy with emotion, both aggressive and concerned, as though she was fighting with herself just to speak what she was. Naruto looked at her for a moment before the shock slowly faded away from his face. That confused look and expression fell away as though a light rain had washed it away. As his confusion left, his eyes dropped slightly into ones of a small gentle happiness, even as his mouth quirked slightly despite itself. The change shocked Naruko enough that she stopped speaking and simply looked across at her fellow blonde, allowing him to reply softly, his voice wistful, almost as though he was recalling a distant happy memory. "Still trying to protect me, huh, Naruko, just like you always did. I guess we really don't change as much as we think we do sometimes. Me still trying to keep up with you and Minami, you always trying to shelter us, even if it cost you everything," replied Naruto, his voice still carrying that wistful tone, his words hitting Naruko like a physical blow, not from their force, but from the simple sincerity in that tone. Before she could pull herself back together enough to respond, Naruto had continued. "But Naruko, you shouldn't have to bear that burden. And I'm not okay with hiding behind you anymore, so I'm going to take some of your burden away from you, Nisan. Even if you don't want me to," finished Naruto, sinking slowly into a fighting stance, his arms hanging limply at his side and his face sinking into one of joyful concentration, as though he had suddenly been invited to join a game he had only been able to watch for a lifetime. Naruko in the meantime was staring at Naruto, her mind torn between confusion at his words, concern for the boy, and a growing aggravation at his seeming calm at the coming fight, a fight she didn't want to fight. She shouldn't have to have. Damn it, Nisan, what the heck is wrong with you? I don't want to fight you. But darn it, if that's the only way to get you to wake up to reality and see this isn't some game, I will," she thought back, sinking slowly into her own stance, one hand held before her palm up, while her second crossed her in front of her chest and slightly behind her other arm, her face setting into an annoyed, determined look. The Jonin seemed to sense the two's intentions and slowly made his way forwards. "Well, I guess it's not necessary to ask if you are ready," joked the Jonin, looking between the two before raising his hand high and calling out to the crowded stadium. "Naruko Uzumaki Namikaze vs Naruto Uzumaki, match of the Chunin exam finals, go," he called, swiping his hand down in an arc and taking a leap back from where the two teens stood. Naruko was the first to move, shooting forwards like a bullet, crouching low to the ground as she did. She closed so quickly on Naruto that he only had a moment to cross his arms protectively in front of him and an X to catch the fist that Naruko had driven upwards towards his chin in an attempt to knock him out early and finish the fight. Naruto's X-guard caught the blow, but a dull thud of pain shot through his arms as the hit actually lifted him slightly off his feet and into the air as it connected. Naruko didn't waste a moment, and even as her first blow landed, she pivoted her body, bringing a spinning roundhouse kick to crash into Naruto's guard, flinging him back from the impact. The boy, already in the air, flew several feet back, hitting the ground with a roll, before managing to find his feet and facing back towards Naruko, his face still holding that excited expression, as though he wasn't actually fighting her at all. Naruto pushed himself slowly to feet, staggering just a bit with the impact from the last blow. "Darn it, I forgot Naruko hits like Kasen when she wants to. Ow, my arms feel like they want to fall off, and she only hit me once," Naruto thought, falling back into his stance. "Well, Naruto, no one said this was going to be easy, just remember what Kushina told you," spoke Jubi in an encouraging tone. Naruto let out a little chuckle in his mind before replying. "Oh, you, if it hurts, don't get hit. Why didn't I think of that?" Naruto laughed to himself even as Naruko bent forwards before rushing towards him once again. Naruto was ready for her speed this time and was able to turn aside of her next strike, grabbing her wrist as he did so and pulling hard while swinging his other fist up at the girl's chest. Naruko didn't even slow down, taking the blow right on her exposed chest and plowing forwards through it, throwing her head forwards to deliver a crushing blow to Naruto's own, causing the boy to falter in his footing. Before he could steady himself, Naruko pulled her hand free of Naruto's grasp and dropped down, sending out a leg sweep that caught Naruto's legs, forcing them out from under him and causing him to fall to the ground hard on his back. Before Naruto could move, Naruko was upon him with one hand pinning him down, while another was suddenly filled with a kunai pointed down at his chest, the girl's bright blue eyes blazing into his own. Naruto was pinned below Naruko, and it looked like the fight may be ending here and now. "Live it up, Naruto, you're no match for me," shouted Naruko, looking down into Naruto's face that despite his position still held a small smile upon it. Naruto's face changed from a small grin into a longer one for a second before he let out a happy little laugh, shocking Naruto for a second. "Come on Naruto, you know I'm not that easy to pin down." Chuckled Naruto, causing Naruto to suddenly look around, spotting Naruto's hands with both his sleeves opened up and an odd blackness within them like dark shadows found only at midnight. Before she could do more than notice their presence, a black bar shot out of the sleeve aimed directly at her face, causing her to push herself up and away from the prone boy, skipping back a few steps as she did. Over with Naruto, he had pushed himself up into a sitting position, his hands on either side, still with that happy smile upon his face. "Pretty fast Naruto, I thought I might have actually gotten you with that one, guess all your training wasn't for nothing." He finished pushing himself up to his feet and throwing his arms out to either side, causing two black bars to extend from each sleeve to be caught in his open hands. Meanwhile Naruto was shaking a little with anger at how close Naruto had gotten to getting a hit on her. "Darn it, I was careless, I can't let him get me distracted, I need to concentrate now. Where the hell did those bars come from? He was using them in the prelims too. Wait, Kasen, seals, that's it, he must have been learning seals from Kasen, okay now he won't catch me off guard again." Thought Naruto, dropping back into her stance, pulling out a second kunai to match the one already held in her right hand. "Stay focused Naruto, something is off about those weapons, I just don't know what yet." Spoke up Kyuubi, his focus centered on the two black bars now clutched in Naruto's hands. Naruto was about to question Kyuubi's sudden interest in the weapons, but was forced to focus forwards as Naruto advanced. Naruto was streaking towards Naruto, dragging the bars as he advanced, kicking up small twin trails of dust as he came. As he reached Naruto, he swung his arms up, the bars crossing each other before him, forming a cross shape before his left arm shot out, swinging the bar in it. In a wide arc, causing Naruto to bring up her kunai to block the blow, sending up a row of sparks as the two weapons scraped across one another. As the first blow was met, the second arm shot down, aimed at the girl's exposed shoulder, but again was intercepted by Naruto's other kunai, more sparks flying up between the two. Once again Naruto and Naruto stared into each other's eyes as sparks danced around the two. For a second the two seemed evenly matched, but Naruto slowly pushed Naruto's attack back from her, a small smile creeping across her face as she felt Naruto being pushed back. Just as she was about to speak, the pressure on her blades disappeared and she lurched unexpectedly forwards. Her eyes turned just in time to see that the bars had slipped back into Naruto's sleeves with a small twitch of his hands, and Naruto in turn had ducked down under both of her outstretched arms, his hands disappearing into his sleeves again. Recognizing the danger, Naruto pulled herself sharply back from Naruto, trying to catch herself from falling forwards, but this appeared to be what Naruto had been waiting for as he threw both his hands towards her, and from his sleeves came four familiar-looking lengths of metal. Before Naruto could react, the newly appeared black chains, in the same style as her Kasen's, had shot out of his sleeves, wrapping around her arms and binding them close to her chest. Before she could do more than register the odd pressure that the chains made as they tightened around her, there was a yanking sensation as she was pulled forwards along the path of the chains. Naruto pulled for all he was worth, flinging his bound Nisan up and over him in a wide arc and throwing her across the arena towards where a small grove of trees grew, the chains from his coat clinking as they extended farther and farther downrange. With a crash, Naruto slammed into a tree trunk, sending a small series of spider cracks up its length. Take that Nisan, note to self, thank Kasen for working with me on her chain techniques. Thought Naruto, allowing himself a moment of excitement at what he thought could well be a coming victory. However, before he could let the thought go beyond the opening, there was another crash from over where his chains were. Naruto's eyes tracked over to see a blast of chakra, along with several pieces of rock, tree, and the remains of his chains falling around the blonde boy, his eyes growing slightly wide as he looked over to see Naruto, her hair disheveled, clothing dusty, and eyes shining bright red, revealing that she was drawing lightly upon Kyuubi's chakra. "Well crap," said Naruto, retracting what was left of his chains back into his sleeves and allowing a pair of bars to once more drop out of his sleeves and into his hands as he gripped them tightly as if looking for comfort in their presence. "Well now you've done it, she used Kyuubi's chakra to cancel out your own." Called Kyuubi, a little worry present in her tone. "Hey, since when? I thought your chakra could stop any chakra." Called Naruto, a little panicked. Kyuubi only offered a small shrug in reply before speaking up. "Well, he is my Sachi, figures it wouldn't work as well on him." She replied with a small nervous chuckle. Naruto faltered slightly at Kyuubi's words before dropping back into a defensive stance. "You know Kyuubi, sometime I really hate you," Naruto said just as Naruto pushed herself forwards into a sprint straight at him. Over in the contestant box, several of the other genin were looking out at the match with eager excitement. "Wow, looks like Naruto is taking this seriously, I hope Naruto is prepared for what that means," spoke Sakura, looking out at the fight playing out before her. Several of those who knew the girl well enough nodded their heads in agreement to the comment. Minami was about to speak up in support of her other sibling, but before she could, a small chuckle came from her left. Turning, she saw that Haku was standing a few feet away, his arms crossed before him as he looked out, focusing on where Naruto stood, his bars clutched in his hands. The feminine boy seemed to notice the girl's eyes on him and spoke up, never taking his eyes off of the fight before him. I may not know about the Kunoichi's abilities, but to underestimate Naruto would be a very large mistake, he said, his voice coming out with an experienced tone that made it clear this was not baseless flattery. Minami looked over at Haku questioningly, while a few of the other occupants gave the boy small exasperated looks. Look, you may not know it, but Naruto there is one of the 3 strongest fighters here, heck even I would have to push myself to be able to stand against her. Spoke Sasuke in a slightly mocking tone, seemingly pleased with being able to point out a flaw to the youth who had embarrassed him in the previous exam. Haku didn't seem to take even a passing notice of the black-haired boy's words and continued to look forwards as if he wasn't interrupted. After a moment Minami spoke up, curious to find out what Haku seemed to know about Naruto. She herself was still only starting to learn everything about Naruto, and something told her that Haku had information that she still lacked. Haku-san, what exactly makes you think that Naruto-san is someone not to be underestimated? Asked Minami. True, she knew that Naruto held many abilities, but so far as she knew, she was one of only a small handful that did, and all of those individuals certainly belonged to Konoha, didn't they? Haku seemed to consider the girl's question for a moment before speaking again, never taking his eyes off of the fight before him or changing his tone from one of calm knowing. I don't think he is not to be underestimated, I know because he did the impossible right before my eyes and to my master, replied Haku, causing many of the members of the box to focus their attention away from the fight and back to the boy. Minami was feeling nervous now, but her curiosity pushed that aside as she spoke up once again. What did he do? Asked the red-eyed girl for the first time, causing Haku to look over at her, a small look of confusion on his face as he did so. After a moment of looking at her face, he seemed to decide that whatever he was looking for was there and responded. He survived, replied Haku, his tone flat. Minami didn't like the sound of Haku's words, but before she could speak again a snort came from behind the two and Sasuke spoke up again. Ah, that's it, he survived, so what did he do, just run away or stall till his sensei and team saved him? Doesn't sound like too great an accomplishment to me, spoke Sasuke. Several of the other listeners could not help but agree with the black-eyed boy, even if they didn't agree with the tone or attitude he had presented. After all, what was so great about surviving a fight? It may be tough, but it is hardly something to be overly impressed with. Haku took a moment to look back at the arena before speaking a final time. You misunderstand me, Naruto did not run, nor did he wait to be protected by others, he took my master's abuser's blade for his sensei, to the hilt. I saw the blood drain from his body and fall limp before my master's blade, and then he was there, fighting. Driving sensei back and delivering a blow that likely almost cost him his life, and when I was leaving that fight, I saw him standing beside himself, one dead, one glowing. It was no clone nor a jutsu, he somehow survived, and I knew it when I saw him back in the first exam, so you tell me, is it wise to underestimate someone who can trick the Shinigami himself? Finished Haku in a tone that made it clear he was not looking for any answer to his question. Most of the box fell silent at his words, their thoughts turning from what they had heard and out to the field, as if trying to figure out what Haku had said. Most assumed that the boy had simply been mistaken and that he had misjudged the boy for a clone or something, or even more likely was simply trying to throw them off their games with far-fetched stories. However, a few looked confused and a little worried, none more than Minami, who was staring over at Haku with dawning horror, her mind remembering the words that Naruto had said to her when he had first come back from Wave. I lost something recently. The Naruto who desperately wanted us to be a family again is still here, he's just going to need help from now on. That was what he had said then. Oh, Kami Naruto, did you? Thought Minami, horrified at the possibility that was presenting itself to her. She was about to start panicking when a soft hand laid itself onto her shoulder, causing her to look over to see Hinata giving her a gentle smile. It's okay Minami, Naruto-kun is just fine, so let's cheer them on, Hinata said in a soft tone that allowed Minami to relax slightly, her wide red eyes closing for a moment before she drew in a slow breath and nodded to Hinata, allowing her to turn her back towards the match. Yamanami-chan, Naruto is okay, he has mama, so he will be just fine, piped up Caillou from his small grass-covered cage. Minami had to smile at the fox's enthusiasm and with a small smile turned back to watch the fight. In the arena, Naruto was flying forwards, her usual blue eyes changed into glowing rubies of fire which shone with power as she rocketed across the field towards Naruto. Before, as she had found herself wrapped in those black chains, she had felt her chakra fade as if it was being smothered, and from inside her Kyuubi had let out an angry roar of pure hatred, allowing a flood of his own chakra to push away the weird feeling and allowing her to break her bonds. Without wanting to lose the moment, Naruto had forced her own chakra through herself, making sure not to allow the Kyubis to overtake her, and flung herself forwards towards where Naruto had drawn back his chains. She was racing forwards when Naruto slipped another pair of those bars from his sleeves and prepared to meet her next strike. Naruto, however, paid the objects no mind, reaching into her pouches on either hip where an array of seals lay. In a blur her hands were full of shuriken and she was hurling them forwards towards Naruto, augmented by her own increased strength. Naruto saw her action only a second before the spinning stars were flinging themselves towards him too close to dodge. Luckily for Naruto, he had other options. Without any hesitation, Naruto allowed one bar to slip back into his sleeve. Just as the shuriken were about to reach him, Naruto flung up his now open hand palm out and from his sleeve billowed out a black form that snapped itself open to form a round shield before him. There was a shower of sparks and the sounds of metal hitting something hard and solid as the shuriken ricocheted off of his shield. Naruto saw all of this, her teeth bared in a feral scowl of anger, even as she closed and Naruto's shield collapsed in on itself and shot back into his sleeve. Darn Akasan, did you have to make him so many seals for weapons? God, they are doing half the fighting for him. At this rate I'm going to have to stay in stage 1 just to break through his seals. Darn it, Naruto, you're only making this more dangerous for yourself, why are you fighting so hard? Naruto shouted to herself even as she closed with Naruto. Just as she reached him, another smaller voice spoke up, almost too quiet to be heard. Why am I? It asked to the silence as Naruto closed in, throwing out a quick jab, her fingers connected to form a spear as she thrust forwards. Naruto had just lowered his shield and was almost too late to throw up one of his bars in time to divert his Nissan spear-like strike, but even still the impact made his arm feel like jelly, but there was no time to think on it. As soon as the blow was deflected, Naruto quickly drew the appendage back into herself before firing off a second, this one coming along with her other arm. To Naruto it was like being attacked by a small army of strikes, the speed of each blow, leaving almost no time to react. He managed to push one away, but two more found their way to his chest, causing jolts of pain to shoot up through him, two more parried, and another slipped through. Naruto was starting to panic slightly when he remembered back to what his cousin had told him about the hummingbird style the Hokage and his Nissans used. Flashback. In a fight, lol, they are everywhere. Okay Naruto, in your match against Naruto she will have the advantage in mid to long range, but in close you will have the advantage. Lectured Kushina to Naruto, who stood a few feet away with his arms folded across his chest. She and Minami use the hummingbird style for offense and it is pretty devastating, composed of quick strikes that quickly build up and overpower an opponent, but they do have a flaw, they sacrifice power for speed and there is where your opening will be. Using the stance they leave their entire body open for a counterattack, focusing entirely on the attack. While Minato has overcome this with his flying thunder god, the girls haven't, so if they start pressuring you, don't try and match their speed cause you can't, but deliver a hard enough blow and their offense will fall apart. Finished Kushina, looking over at Naruto, who was nodding his head in apparent understanding. So any questions, Sachi? Asked Kushina, Naruto tilting his head slightly at her question before replying. Hi, what was that first part again? I kind of wasn't listening. Replied Naruto a little sheepishly. This had resulted in him fleeing across the field with an angry Redeed in pursuit while he let out a series of girly screams of terror. Flashback end. Right, Kasen knew this would happen, let's just hope I can pull this off. Thought the boy as he allowed his arms to pull close, no longer trying to deflect the incoming attack and instead drawing them into himself like a boxer shielding his body. Before Naruto could recognize what Naruto was planning, the purple-eyed boy had pushed forwards into the girl's attack, taking a number of blows but pushing forwards until he was right up against her. With a swift motion, Naruto drove one knee upwards into Naruto's exposed stomach, causing her to let out a cry of pain and doubling over slightly despite herself. This allowed Naruto to bring his two rods out, swinging them up and around so that they slammed into Naruto's side, forcing her to stagger sideways a few steps. Seeing his chance, Naruto shot forwards to land another blow but was forced to jump back as Naruto's arm blurred and there was another wall of oncoming metal that forced Naruto to leap back and dodge wildly to avoid the attack. This in turn gave Naruto enough room to widen the gap between the two. Naruto wasn't going to make the same mistake twice, and when she had put some distance between herself and Naruto, she flew those set of hand signs before drawing in a deep breath. Naruto saw her moving only in time to raise his shield just in time for two concussive blasts of wind to impact it, dispersing as they did. Naruto, however, unlike the seedling, was made of more than just chakra and so the impact was enough to cause his arms to ache from the impact. Before Naruto could move to drop his shield, there was another impact of wind upon it, forcing him to take cover again. This was why he wasn't able to see the next attack coming. Naruto had been charging forwards as she fired her blast of air, her chakra able to reinforce her body enough so that the consecutive blasts did not slow her down. Just as she fired off a second volley, she lowered herself slightly, bending her legs down before kicking off hard from the ground and flying up into the air above where Naruto was huddled. In mid-air, the blonde girl twisted, brining one leg up so that she was now heading down in a perfect axe kick. Naruto was about a foot away from impact when Naruto noticed her shadow on the ground and tried to bring his shield up to block the oncoming strike, but he was only partially successful. Naruto's leg came down hard on the shield at an angle that forced it down and out of Naruto's hand, leaving him crouched before Naruto. As she landed, Naruto saw the opening before her and quickly struck forwards, both hands bent forwards while her arms shot out together in a strike taught to her by the toads. Unlike the hummingbird style, the toad style was built around powerful blows, and the double strike she had just slammed forwards was certainly that. Before Naruto could do anything, he found himself flying back from one of Naruto's strike, hitting the ground and sliding back a few feet as he did. Naruto struggled for a moment, trying to regain his bearings before pushing himself up enough to see Naruto standing a few yards away from him, looking at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Naruto, enough. Kasen may have taught you sealing, but even her weapons won't let you win this match. Being a ninja means that sometimes you have to know when you are beat, so just stop this now and give up. You fought well, now don't make me go any harder or you will get seriously hurt," called Naruto, her voice a chaotic mix of anger and sadness at Naruto, but more than that at herself. During the fight, Naruto was constantly fighting herself, trying to force herself not to notice as she hurt the boy before her. "This isn't right, this isn't why I wanted to get stronger, I wanted to protect him, I wanted to protect everyone, darn it, nice and stop, please just stop. Darn it, Naruto, you baka, just stop trying to fight me. Don't make me do this anymore," the girl thought, her mind changing between anger and sadness at such a rate that real rage was slowly taking control of her. Naruto looked up at Naruto for a moment and he saw her pain dancing across her eyes. How could he not? He had seen it often enough. Whenever Naruto had been conflicted, she had looked like that. Even now that hadn't changed about her, and what he saw forced him to push himself to his feet once again. "I'm sorry, Neeson, but I have to keep fighting, cause if I don't I'm scared that I won't ever be able to save you, so it's now or never, and I don't believe in never, not for my world," thought the blonde as he stood, his eyes looking back into his fellow blondes and another smile slowly spreading across his face. "Wow, Neeson, I have to say you pack one heck of a punch, but I thought I already told you, I'm not going to stop till I save you," replied Naruto. His words seemed to almost snap something in Naruto as she raised her hands into an all too familiar cross-shaped seal and yelled out at Naruto. "I told you I don't need you to save me. Cage Bushin no Judas," she almost screamed, and suddenly most of the arena was covered in smoke. As it cleared, Naruto found himself standing in the center of a small army of very angry-looking Narukos. "Naruto, I hope you have a plan for this," said Jubi, a little worry making its way into her voice as she spoke. Naruto in the meantime just gave a mental nod as he lowered himself into a stance with his arms crossed before him. "Hi Jubi, and even if I didn't I can't walk away anymore, never again," he replied, gritting his teeth as he looked forwards at the nearest blonde girl. As the arena floor exploded into smoke, the Jonin senseis and their students were almost enthralled with what they were watching. The fight below had started slower than the others that day, but the true excitement came from the unknown factor that was Naruto. Although a few of them had seen Naruto fight from time to time, it had never been like this, and the thrill of seeing something new before them drew their attention like moths to a flame. "Hey Kurenai, you know I can't remember hearing anything about the Hokage's other kid till now. I mean, I knew he existed, but besides that I don't know much, heck only Ino seemed to know him, and even then it was only cause they were in the medical class together," mentioned Azuma, looking over at his fellow sensei as he did. Kurenai looked up from the arena and over to the bearded man, shrugging her shoulders slightly in answer. "Well, I was about the same till last month. I happened to stumble upon him during training with my team, so I got to learn a little more about him, but besides that only what little I have heard from my team, though Sakura seemed to be friends with him to some capacity," replied Kurenai, careful to avoid mentioning what else she had learned when she had recently met Naruto. Asuma let out a sigh before looking back to the match. "Hi, but that's weird, isn't it? I mean, from what I learned he was a basic level genin, and now well, here," he gestured down below, "he's fighting one of the strongest genin in the village, and heck, he seems to get seals well enough to use them in combat, so why does it seem like no one knows anything about him?" Finished the man, raising a hand up as if expecting the answer to literally drop into his hand. "Gosh. His flames of youth are burning bright to have reached such a level in such a short time," called Guy excitedly, his eyes having changed into small burning orbs of fire. His volume and overall attitude actually caused Asuma and Kurenai to push themselves slightly away from the man before he did something crazier. Below the senseis, the genin were in much the same state, their eyes glued to the fight. "Wow, Naruto is actually pushing Naruto, that's crazy, he wasn't much different from us in the academy," Ino said, looking over at her team, who nodded in agreement. Choji pulled out another bag of chips before looking over at Ino. Hey Ino, you said he was always in class with you, Sakura and Hinata, did you ever see him fight like that? He asked before stuffing his face with another handful of chips. Ino seemed to consider the comment for a moment before shaking her head. Nope, in fact he wasn't any better than me at it, I mean he worked hard and all, but he really didn't have a knack for it, still this is something I've never seen before. Finished Ino looking back down. Shikamaru in the meantime was looking down at Naruto, his mind telling him that something wasn't adding up. Improvement was one thing, Lee was proof of that, but leaps in ability took time, and Naruto was apparently taking huge steps forward in no time, and it wasn't adding up. I swear something about Team 11 just isn't adding up, got troublesome, it's not like they are an enemy, maybe I'm just overthinking it. He thought, leaning back, still letting the small orb in his hand roll in and out between his figures, his mind wandering. While this was occurring up in the cage booth, Kakashi had arrived some time ago and informed Minato about the small orbs planted all around the stadium. In response, Jiraiya had taken to examining the orb, while a group of Anbu to go and investigate the area as well, without arousing suspicion. After a small time the group had returned, reporting to Kakashi before vanishing back into the shadows and leaving the gray-haired man to relay the message. Bakaji-sama, the search is over, and they are indeed scattered out all over the stadium, but so far nothing has been discovered about them. Members of the Hyuga have scanned them, and our sensors cannot detect any chakra coming from them, they appear to be nothing more than someone's idea of a prank. Finished Kakashi leaning back after delivering his message to Minato. The blonde Hokage relaxed at his old student's words, letting out a relieved sigh as his body relaxed as well. A few moments before, Jiraiya had reported much the same, saying that the marble-sized ball didn't react to any seals or spying tools that he could find, so it seemed that they were indeed nothing. Absent-mindedly, Minato slipped one of the orbs into his pocket before looking back down at the match, his focus back on the battle raging both below and in his mind. The boy seems to be doing rather well against your daughter Hikage-san, and if you don't mind me saying he does seem to look a great deal like you. Mei said, glancing over at Minato. The Mizukage was no fool, and she had seen that both of these children were obviously the Hokages, but the different last name spoke of something hidden, and considering that they were not yet allies, it never hurt to be cautious. Minato looked over at Mei for a moment before answering. Hi, he should Misama, he is my Sachi, and yes, he does seem to be doing well, but I am afraid that he does not stand much of a chance against Naruto in a fight like this. Replied Minato, forcing his voice to hide the feelings that were raging inside of him. Mei seemed to consider the Hokage's words for a moment before simply shrugging it off and looking back to the match. Hi, I suppose not, you have trained her well, and being a Jinchuriki doesn't hurt her chances either. I'm afraid that your Sachi simply drew a poor matchup. She replied. However, just as she finished there was a small snort from behind her, and the booth's occupants turned to see that Zabuza was looking around at them in apparent amusement. Mei's face slowly fell into a dangerous smile as she looked over at her bodyguard, her face adopting the dangerous sensual look it often did right before she took violent action. Zabuza, what may I ask you find so funny about what the Hokage and I were speaking about? Asked Mei, her tone frosty. Zabuza in turn looked over at her before shifting his view over to the Hokage for a moment before folding his arms in front of him and quirking one eyebrow up. Hi Mizusama, but first I have a question for the Hokage. Spoke the man, looking over at where Minato sat as he spoke. Mei looked as though she was about to blow Zabuza out of the booth, but Minato raised a hand in apparent acceptance of Zabuza's words. Hi Zabuza, I will answer your question, provided it is reasonable. Replied the blonde, causing a small nod from Zabuza. Hey, it's pretty simply, you said that boy down there is your Sachi, right? He started, getting an affirmative nod from Minato before continuing. Okay, well my question is, have you ever had another Sachi, or someone who looked just like him? Asked the bandage man, causing Minato and the other occupants of the booth to look extremely confused at Zabuza for a moment. The man seemed to accept their looks without any reaction, only turning back to look at Mei. To answer your question Misama, I was laughing because it seems that everyone here is severely underestimating just what that boy is capable of. Chuckled Zabuza, his eyes glinting slightly in apparent remembrance of something that excited him. Minato considered Zabuza's words for a moment before putting together what he knew and coming up with an answer. So this is about when you meet the team protecting the bridge builder. I understand that you were unable to take out the target and that my Sachi's team drove you off. Spoke Minato, drawing a small nod from Zabuza as he spoke. So what, did Naruto manage to impress you somehow during that fight? Asked Minato in apparent confusion. His information had been limited on the battle, and honestly he was having trouble remembering if there had been any information pertaining to Naruto's encounter with Zabuza at all. However, before he could follow this train of thought, it was derailed by a loud laugh from Zabuza that even managed to cause the stoic Kazekage to look around at the man in apparent interest. Zabuza managed to quiet his laughter after a few moments and reply. Oh ho oh that's a good one, managed to impress me, he damn well better have, hell, it's not every day a shinobi gets run through and eaten by my blade and then breaks my jaw. Replied Zabuza, his words carrying traces of amusement with them as he spoke. The booth looked completely stunned, everyone in turn looked towards Zabuza, focusing particularly on the massive blade on his back, the executioner's blade, known for drinking the blood of its enemies, and they had just been told that the boy below had somehow survived its bite. Most of the booth looked completely shocked at Zabuza's words, but Minato was looking at the man as if he could no longer see him, his eyes drifting through the man to the blade on his back and slowly drifting down to the arena below where Naruto had just been surrounded by a small army of Narukos, and his mind bleated out a small confused moan carrying with it a simple thought. Naruto. Meanwhile, as Minato had been having his discussion with the group in the cage booth, Kushina was looking around at an equally entertaining conversation, if not as revealing a one. No Mito, we can't hold two signs up by ourselves, I told you we should have just made a big one for your Nisan and Nisan's match. Hanabi said in an I told you so tone. This of course resulted in Mito bopping him over the head with one of a pair of signs she had in her lap before looking over at where Hitomi and Hiashi were sitting, her eyes flashing with sudden excitement. Well then you and I hold one and your cousin can hold the other. Replied Mito smugly, causing Hitomi to look over at her name at the two children beside her. Mito, cousin can't hold up the sign the whole match. Replied Hanabi in a small reprimanding tone. Mito looked over at Hitomi for a moment before feeling a little embarrassed at her idea. Hanabi's cousin was really nice, but she was also pretty weak and she knew that asking her to do something like that wasn't considered. But Hanabi, cousin already has Kyuid and we have to cheer them both on. Replied Mito, turning her wide eyes over to look at Hanabi, a small bit of moisture building in her eyes as she did. Hanabi suddenly felt a need to help Mito however he could, and before he could even realize it, he was busy searching for a solution to their situation. The boy looked down at the signs before looking around, for a moment his eyes focusing on something for a second, before he set his face into a hard look and turned to Mito. Hi Mito, we will, here give me a sign. He said, hopping off of his seat and holding out his hands for Mito to give him a sign. Mito looked confused but handed over a sign to Hanabi, who gave her a small smile before setting his face back into a look of determination. He turned to his right and marched over a few feet until he stood facing directly in front of Hiashi, who looked down at his Sachi, noticing his position before him. Hiashi had been sitting with his hands resting lightly on his knees in a regale posture, and before he could do more than look down at his Sachi, Hanabi was stepping forwards towards him and had maneuvered the sign in his hands into Hiashi's own. Hiashi just sat there stunned as Hanabi moved his hands to either side of the sign and then, as if positioning an action figure, took a step up onto the seat beside his Tausen and moved his arms up so that Hiashi was holding the sign above his head with both arms, his face completely lost as to what his Sachi was doing to him. After a moment Hanabi nodded at his work and hopped down to move back and sit beside Mito, helping her to heft the second sign over their heads, even as the little Reed looked at her friend with a huge smile and starstruck eyes upon her face. Hitomi and Kushina were at that moment struggling to keep from exploding into laughter at Hiashi's state. The man looked left for a moment to see that his wife was smiling happily at him and then directing his own eyes to look across her and into the happy face of his Sachi, who was grinning back up at him in apparent admiration. Hiashi took all of this in and couldn't help but let his face turn into a smile of his own as he settled himself to watch the rest of the match, the sign held above his head as he did. So as the group looked back down, two signs were now raised above the group, the first held in the small fists of two children reading, "Go Aniki. Go Nisan." Along with small drawing of both of the combatants done in the excited hand that only a child can accomplish, as though they somehow managed to put their very happiness into the simply pictures they could produce. Hiashi in the meantime was standing stoically holding a sign proclaiming in bright letters "Go Team Kawaii." And looking happier than he had in a lifetime. Naruto was slowly looking around him, a small bit of panic growing in his chest as he looked around to see what looked like over 100 MIF Narukos looking at him from all sides, some cracking their knuckles, while a few had pulled out kunai or were simply standing with their arms crossed facing him with quite anger. From that sea of blonde and blue, Naruto focused on the original Naruko who stood just a few feet apart directly ahead of him, her eyes back to their bright blue, but still holding the slitted pupil that showed she was in completely control of the Kyuubi chakra within her. Naruto let out a small chuckle seeing at his situation. Ahahaha, well it looks like I still know how to push your buttons, Honeyson. Called Naruto in an oddly cheerful tone that caught Naruko slightly off guard. For a second she seemed about to smile, but fought it down, forcing her tone into one of command and authority. Naruto, this is your last chance, give up, you and I both know you can't beat me just with Kasen's seals, and I am not going to hold back anymore. Called Naruko as she lowered her arm slightly to her side, her bright blue eyes never leaving Naruto's own. Her words did not have the reaction that she had been expecting. For a second Naruto just looked at her confused before he let out another bark of laughter, actually dropping his form momentarily to hold his stomach before speaking. Asan haha seals hahaha, oh Kami that's good, I couldn't do a seal yet if my life depended on it, hahaha, oh man the first time Kasan tried to show me, it blew up in my face hahaha. Laughed the boy, his words coming out interspersed with laughter. His actions caused Naruto to falter slightly, not understanding why Naruto was so seeming amused by his words. After a moment Naruto managed to control himself enough to speak up again. Oh man that was a good one, is that what you thought I was doing till now, using Kasan's seals or mine, sorry Nisan, but no such luck, this is all me. He chuckled again. Naruto had now gone from confused to embarrassed and angry at Naruto, he was laughing at her, here in front of everyone, and she was not in a state that this was a good idea. Without waiting Naruto flew through a quick series of seals and forcing out a small burst of wind not very powerful, but enough for what she had intended. Just as she had suspected Naruto managed to bring his arms up to block the strike, but that had been her plan. The small blades of wind impacted his sleeves, just below the elbows sending bits of orange cloth and what she suspected to be where he was keeping his seals hidden. However, as the cloth fell away, what appeared confused her into a blank silence. On both of Naruto's arms, there were what looked like perfectly cylindrical water wings that stretched from his wrists up to his elbows, the same black color as the weapons he had been using throughout the fight. Naruto slowly lowered his arms looking down at them for a second before looking back to Naruto, a small proud smile playing across his face. See told you, but did you have to destroy my coat? Naruto half-joked looking over at Naruto who just looked more confused than ever. However, her confusion was soon replaced by annoyance. This isn't a game Naruto stopped trying to make this a darn joke. I'm done playing nice, I don't care if you have some new arm guards, I'm not letting you humiliate me, I gave you a chance now I'm taking you down. Called Naruto falling into a combat stance as her army of clones followed her example. Naruto seemed to sadden slightly at Naruto's words, his grin shrinking slightly. Naruto I'm not here to humiliate you, he said, even as the army of clones charged forwards at him from all sides, and these aren't armed guards. They are seeds. Finished Naruto just as the clones closed in on him, some leaping into the air as they aimed to land an aerial assault upon the blonde boy. Naruto just caught the last words as Naruto disappeared behind a wall of clones, and she felt a small pang at the look of sadness on Naruto's face before it was obscured by her own attack. However, before she could consider that feeling more she was suddenly assaulted by a wave of memories from the clones around Naruto, right before there was a small blast and smoke erupted around Naruto. Before she could even begin to focus there was another storm of popping as trails of clones began to disperse all around the arena as though someone was drawing huge lines through their ranks. More memories kept flashing before her eyes as what looked like black balls smashed through her ranks before shooting back towards where she knew Naruto stood. Then a voice called out through the smoke. I'm here to show you that I can stand beside you and that we can be a family again. Called Naruto from the slowly dispersing smoke in the center of the arena. Naruto's eye swiveled to the source of the sound just as the smoke dispersed, what she saw made her freeze, even as from inside her, the Kyuubi roared in anger calling out as he did it is him he is the enemy. Naruto was standing tall in the center of where the clones had attacked him, but there was something's with him. Slowly circling around him was what looked like large black orbs, all giving off a faint glow of purple energy. There were 6 in total, 4 of which had formed a small circle behind the boy and seemed to be floating unsuspended by anything in the air. Meanwhile the second 2 were floating just a few inches away from either of the boy's hands, and as Minami watched Naruto grasp small protrusions from the orbs and pulled, 2 identical bars slowly rising from the orbs as his did before snapping off with a soft crack as he settled himself back into his stance. Naruto's mind was racing trying to understand what she was seeing when Naruto spoke again. So Nisan let me show you just how much I've changed. Called Naruto, a grin spreading back across his face as he spoke. Because my world won't make you stand alone anymore. The boy finished dropping down into his stance once again and fixing his shining eyes upon the girl once again. Before Naruto could register or stop to consider Naruto's words, the boy shot off away from her and towards her army of clones, who seemed to be less confused about the situation and charged to meet the boy. Naruto turned to see Naruto and the orb smash into the oncoming wave of clones, throwing up fresh pops and trails of smoke. The memories came flooding again as she was able to watch from several angles as the Naruto cut into her army. The first clone to reach the boy had spun forwards trying to land a driving kicking into Naruto's side but was caught in midair by one of the orbs that shot into its chest, causing it to explode into smoke. The few clones seeing this hurtled a series of kunai forwards through their dispelled fellow and towards the projectile, but from the smoke there was a series of sparks and scraping sounds as the smoke cleared to show the shield that Naruto had used to protect himself earlier. Before the clones that had launched the assault could recover, Naruto was among them and he plunged one bar into the clone on the right and left before slamming his head into a third in between, causing them all to dispel again into bursts of smoke. A few of the clones saw Naruto's unprotected back and shot forwards looking to get in a strike, but were forced to leap left and right as from the 4 orbs circling Naruto's back, shot out a few chains each out towards them, rocketing forwards like pointed black missiles. Most of the chains missed, but a few smashed into their targets, causing them to dispel. Seeing this, a few clones drew kunai and swung them down on the chains, drawing sparks as they tried and failed to cut them. Before they could recognize the ineffectiveness of their attack, the chains waved slightly before pulling themselves back into the orbs as Naruto rose and turned to shoot off towards the clones. He was about halfway to them when he was forced to stop as several balls of compressed air and kunai flew from both sides at him from the still vast number of clones remaining. As the projectiles hurtled towards Naruto, he drew in his seeds, all of them shifting into round shields and racing around him, taking the impact of air blasts or deflecting kunai with small sparks of impact before they dispelled. The clones before Naruto looked on in a state of panic as the deflected or missed attack crashed into his shields, throwing up another cloud of smoke and dust around the boy until their assault died away a moment later. For a second the clones looked at each other, mixed relief and worry on their faces, wondering if they had been overzealous in stopping the boy's assault. However, they needn't have worried as a moment later black rods began hurtling out of the cloud, smashing into their number. The remaining clones began to dive and dodge as the cloud fell away and showed that 5 of the shields had formed into a half dome, protecting the boy from the two-sided attack. As the wall had fallen, Naruto had begun pulling rod after rod out of the remaining seeds and flinging them out as black missiles that tore into their ranks, sending even more up into clouds of smoke as they did. Something seemed to finally break within the remaining clones, as with a roar of defiance they all joined together, rushing towards the boy's position, throwing kunai and shuriken and whatever else Naruto had apparently had on her at him as they came. Naruto was forced to keep all of his seeds in shield form just to deflect the oncoming assault. He had managed to hold onto one final rod, but as the clones closed in, he realized that it looked like he wasn't going to be able to stop them all. The first clone to get past his seeds was met with a crashing blow to its head by his remaining rod, but this allowed 2 more to close and slam their fists into his back, causing him to stagger forward slightly from the impact. Luckily, it seemed that the clones could not survive a hit on the boy, and as the 2 impacts came, the clones vanished in turn. This was a small comfort, however, as more and more clones poured through his defenses, each hammering him with kicks and punches and the occasional cut of a kunai. Those were rare. "Amajubi, this isn't good," called Naruto as he swiped his arm into one of the clones, even as another landed an axe kick onto his back, almost driving him to the ground. Jubi watched worried as Naruto was slowly being overcome by the constant assault and recognized what Naruto needed at that moment. "So that's it, huh? After all of your big talk, you're going to get your butt handed to you by your niece in shadow, and here I thought that you said you wanted to change this world for the better. With that attitude, maybe I should try and talk to Hinata. She seems to be at least able to handle her own problems," called Jubi in a forcibly mocking tone, trying to get Naruto to get angry. It worked better than she could have hoped. Naruto froze for a second, not even noticing as the next few clones slammed into him before his face twisted into an angry expression and he stretched out a hand, causing a shield to shift back into a seat and fly into his hand before he slammed it down into the ground with a yell of angry defiance that could be heard even through the din of battle around him. "I won't fail now," Naruto screamed as he smashed the seat into the ground, sending cracks out through the ground around him. His words caused the clones to halt their assault for just a moment before they were suddenly looking around as the ground beneath them started to shake slightly. Before any of them could do more than look at one another, confused black chains erupted from the ground all around them, shooting up, dozens, hundreds flying out in every direction, catching clone after clone and dispelling them, turning the arena around the boy into a sea of black spires and smoke. After a moment, Naruto made his way steadily to his feet, looking around as the chain slowly shrank back into the ground and the seat he had plunged down rose to place itself back among its fellows behind the boy. As Naruto rose, he looked to see Naruko standing where he had last seen her, more than halfway across the arena from him, still just looking at him as if she could not believe that he was standing in front of her. As Naruto turned to face his niece and a final clone shot out the smoke behind him, a swirling ball of chakra clutched in each of its hands as it shot towards the boy's back. Naruko finally reacted, starting to call out a warning to Naruto, even as she saw it was too late to stop her clone from finishing the attack. When she had made the clones, she had been running on anger and aggression, and they were particularly ready for combat. At seeing its fellows so easily decimated, had apparently driven this last clone to throw away whatever care she had for the boy before her and instead just go all out on him. Naruto turned slightly as he saw Naruko's expression shift, seeing the clone closing in on him, its eyes red with Kyuubi's chakra apparently guiding its movements. Without thinking, Naruto shot 5 of his seeds forwards at the clone, but it avoided the hasty attack and charged towards him and his final seed. His final seed shot in front of him and seemed to break right before the clone met him, and there was a deafening explosion from where the two forces meet. For a second the area around the boy was obscured as bits of the arena floor and dust settled down around two figures. The first was Naruto, looking received and slightly winded, the recent battle having left multiple cuts and scuffs all over his form. However, it was the other figure that drew everyone's attention. It stood just as tall as the boy and was dressed identically, except it was apparently clothed in black from head to toe, except for 2 wide glowing eyes that shone with a purple light that danced around its form. The creature had one hand outstretched before it, in front of a small crater where the clone had apparently detonated. Everyone including Naruto stared in silence as Naruto turned and the other marched up to stand beside him, looking around the arena in apparent interest, letting out small humming sounds as it did. Slowly Naruto's remaining seeds floated back to where Naruto stood before spreading out gradually from him and cracking, slowly dripping down till Naruto stood beside 6 of the creatures, all looking around in apparent interest, letting out small hums as they did, and one even looking over at the stands and waving its arms in excitement. Naruto stared forwards at the scene before her, before Naruto's voice called out to her from across the field. "Oh, and I'm not going to hold back anymore either, Neeson," he called as the seedlings, and he sunk down into a familiar combat stance, all turning to face Naruto. In the stands there was blanket shock playing across the faces of most of the crowd, and none more so than with the Jonin senseis and their pupils, some more vocal than others. "What the hell, there is more than one of those things and Naruto is the one who has them. What the hell is going on here?" Ino practically screamed, her hands digging into her hair as she looked out at the arena. Choji had simply dropped the chips he was holding and still had one hand frozen a few inches from his face, the chips still grasped in it and apparently forgotten. Ino meanwhile went on ranting. "What the heck is going on? Since when could Naruto control chakra like that? I mean, I went into that thing's head, it wasn't a clone, what the heck is going on?" Continued the blonde, apparently lost to the world around her in her ranting. Ikumo on her side was fighting back a smile at the girl's reaction, but a giggle escaped her lips and suddenly Ino turned on the girl, her eyes wide, with an almost maddening look in them. "Ikumo, you know something, spill it." Fired off Ino, almost pouncing on the poor girl, who had clapped her hands over her mouth to keep from laughing in the girl's face. After a second Ikumo seemed to gain control before speaking in a voice still with traces of her own giggles present in it. "Sorry Ino, but I can't tell you anything about Seedkin," the brown-haired girl said as Ino's eyes widened and looked from the arena and back to Yakumo, her expression changing as it did so. "Seedkin? Is that what they are called? Tell me, Yakumo," cried Ino, reaching out to grab hold of Yakumo's shoulder as Yakumo let out another small giggle at the expression Ino had across her face. Before Ino could continue, however, a strong hand placed itself on her shoulder and pulled her back from Yakumo. Ino looked up to see Kurenai giving her a small annoyed look. "Is Yakumo, would you mind not trying to attack my student right in front of me?" the woman asked, giving the blonde's shoulder a small squeeze as she did, prompting Ino to relax slightly and looking over at Yakumo a little embarrassed. Asuma looked over at Kurenai as she spoke before looking over towards his student in turn. "Ino, she is right, apologized to Yakumo," started Asuma, then looking over at Kurenai, his eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke his next words. "But Kurenai, it's clear that Ms. Yakumo does know something about what is happening, and I think we would all like to know." Finished Asuma, turning his gaze over to Kurenai, his tone soft, but with a slight amount of insistence behind it all the same. Kurenai turned her ruby-red eyes to Asuma's for a moment before letting out a small sigh. "Well, I guess they can't get angry at me after Naruto basically just showed the whole village, daughter, at least I hope not," thought the woman as she leaned back in her seat and looked over at the ground around her. "I won't go into great detail for now, but yes, Naruto wields a new type of chakra that allows him to manifest it physically. Those here," she gestured out towards the seedlings, "are clones built of the stuff. Apparently they get some kind of minor intelligence and mimic most of what they see, but besides that they are mostly harmless unless some attacks them," said the red-eyed woman, looking around as the members of Team 10 digested the information and put it to what they had already encountered. As the members replayed their encounter with the creature, they remembered how it had started relatively docile and had only gotten violent after they had initiated combat. For a second they simply digested that before a particularly lazy member summed up their reaction as a whole. "Troublesome, so if we hadn't attacked the darn thing would have just watched us like it did with Team 8 and then left," Shikamaru summed up as he looked out at the arena. His mind seemed to be poking at him for a moment until he felt a small pressure in his hand and looked down to where he still held the small black bowl he had picked up. For a second he just stared at it before his thoughts fell into place and he suddenly looked up and around the stadium, a slightly alarmed thought in his mind as he did so. "Asuma-sensei, how many of those marbles did you say were around the stadium?" asked Shikamaru, looking around as Asuma looked down at the boy, momentarily not seeing the point of his question. After a moment he looked down to see what Shikamaru was holding, and suddenly it all snapped sharply into focus for him before he replied, his voice not betraying the small worry he was feeling. There were several thousand Shikamaru. You don't think? He started, the rest of the group looking between the two, confused at what the two were talking about. Shikamaru simply interlocked his figures together and leaned forwards, looking out at Naruto, his eyes focused on the blonde boy more intently than he had ever done before. "Sensei, I think that Naruto has more at play here than just the match," replied Shikamaru, as the rest of the group looked at the pineapple-haired youth, oblivious to what he had apparently put together. While the senseis were busy handling their students, another group was also having their own reaction to the changes in the match below. Kushina and Hitomi had remained mostly unchanged, simply looking down with small smiles as Naruto managed to finish off the last of the clones and the seedlings made their appearance. Ieyashi for his part had looked over at the rest of the group, taking in their apparent acceptance of the situation and wondering just how much of the world was going to be going crazy on him and why no one else seemed to mind. He had immediately activated his Byakugan as the orbs had made their appearance and was shocked to see whatever they were, they didn't appear to show up as chakra to him, simply as the different black forms they seemed capable of taking. His attention was also drawn right to notice that whatever Kushina had in her hands was assuredly based off of the same principle of the things below, and that only made things even more confusing for the poor man. However, before he could make a comment, a sudden commotion between the adults caught his attention. Mito and Hanabi had practically dropped the sign they had been holding, the redhead letting out a squeak of excitement before diving down to where she had stored her signs, followed after by Hanabi a moment later. The two children rustled around under the seats for a moment before both emerging, holding what looked like two poles with a wrapping of cloth between them. The two children turned to one another, hefting the poles up and smiling as they both walked away from one another, the cloth slowly stretching out between the two as the distance between them increased. As the cloth unrolled, Ieyashi was able to see that it was not just a cloth but a banner. As the two reached the end of the banner, they both turned excitedly, drawing in a deep breath and suddenly calling out in loud voices the words written across the banner. "Boo! Seiyakun." The two children trumpeted as the banner's words showed to anyone the same words upon it in bright black and purple lettering, along with another picture, this time depicting several black figures all standing with their hands intertwined, along with two smaller figures that were obviously supposed to be the two children themselves. It was at this point that Ieyashi just gave up and decided that if the world was going mad, he might as well just sit back and enjoy it. Without a word, he slowly lowered the sign in his hands and reached over to catch one of Hitomi's, causing the women to give him a soft smile in return. Well, if this was the world, at least he would have his family by his side, and for now that was enough for him. Kushina as well was smiling as she saw her Musume's latest project, letting out a small giggle, even as Kyuid let out a small yip of apparent happiness, causing her to giggle all the more. The red-haired women looked down at the field and saw that Naruto wasn't about to let himself fail before he kept his promise to her, and that meant that no matter what, Naruto was going to help Naruko, no matter what he had to do to make that a reality. She felt a small welling of hope in her chest as she looked down at the boy she had almost lost so long ago, and then to her Musume, standing across from him in the arena. "Naruko, please let him help you, cause he won't let his world lack you as part of it, and he is getting in the habit of making the impossible happen," whispered Kushina as she blinked a tear out of her eyes and sat back to watch her Sachi fight to save his family. Even as Kushina was busy watching as Naruto fought to help his family once again, a particular member of his family was standing at the moment, his face twisted into a look of pure disbelief and horror. Minato didn't care that he was in front of two other cages, he didn't care if he was the Hokage of the whole village, or that at that moment Jiraiya, his old sensei, seemed to be trying to tell him something. Instead, all he could do was stare blankly down at where Naruto stood, surrounded by 6 black figures that were obviously the same things mentioned to him from the reports of the second exam. However, even that knowledge had taken a backseat at the moment as Naruto spoke to Naruko, his words to distance to be made out from where Minato sat, his form hunched forwards and leaning on the rectangular opening that served as the observation window of the booth, one arm bracing him against its frame as he eyes tracked around the field below, as if not able to take in what he was seeing. "Naruto, but I mean how you," Minato thought, trying and failing over and over to force his shocked mind to respond to him in more that small flashes. His mind had been racing once Naruto had first let out the orbs and begun his assault. Minato had risen from his chair like some kind of zombie, ignoring everyone around him as he slowly shuffled over to where he now stood, simply looking, but unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He simply stood there like a statue, not even flinching, as the orbs had cracked open and 6 of those figures had formed his mind, still battling to understand what he was seeing. Vaguely he noticed a pressure on his shoulder and turned wide eyes to see the concerned face of Jiraiya looking back at him, his mouth moving, but no sound coming out. After a moment Minato seemed to shake himself enough for the words of Jiraiya to start making it through, as though a radio was slowly coming into its signal. Hey kid, snap out of it, this isn't the time to fall apart, it will be fine," whispered Jiraiya, his face showing clear signs of concern upon it as he spoke. Minato almost laughed as his addled brain digested the words his sensei was saying. "Not the time to fall apart, this is the perfect time to fall apart. Naruto is down there holding his own against Naruto in the arena, using abilities I didn't even know existed, and I have a man standing a few feet away, claiming to have disemboweled the same boy, and I haven't got a freaking clue as to what is happening around me, and I'm getting to the point that I don't care anymore," thought Minato, his addled mind becoming angry at the sage for his calm attitude, which was clear with Minato's next words. "Fine," Minato said, his voice low but dangerous, his eyes narrowing slightly at Jiraiya as he spoke. "What in the name of all of Kami's court would you know about things falling apart? My Sachi is down there doing I don't know what right before my eyes, and I know less about him than a man who apparently rammed a sword through his chest. So you tell me, sensei, what part of this clusterfuck of a life I've made with my Sachi is fine?" Shot back Minato, his voice staying low, but the raw anger in it coming through clearly. Jiraiya's face hardened at these words, but he kept his voice calm as he replied. "Minato, it will be alright, we have looked after Naruto, and I trained her all last month, she will make it out of this, and afterwards you and I can check out what's happening with Naruto, but for now you need to stay calm," replied Jiraiya, his words not having the effect he had hoped. Minato seemed to stiffen at the Toad Sage's words, and Jiraiya could almost swear he heard the sound of Minato's teeth grinding as the blonde man let his sapphire blue eyes look back into Jiraiya's, the heat from them almost causing Jiraiya to physically recoil from him. However, before he could, Minato had reached out an arm to grab the front of Jiraiya's clothing and pull the older man closer so that he could make damn sure that the old man heard his next words clearly. "Sensei, I don't give a damn who wins this fucking match, hell I don't care if either of them win or lose, what I care about is that listening to you has destroyed my life with my Sachi and that his enemies seem to be closer to him than me. So sensei, don't you dare stand there and tell me to relax after what you have done." Minato spat at Jiraiya, the Toad Sage not flinching away from the blonde, but instead raising a hand up slowly to grab hold of Minato's wrist, not taking his eyes from the man as he did. "What we have done, Hikage-sama, and whatever you may think, coming apart here in front of the leaders of two villages is not a smart move. You are the Hokage, and if you don't get a hold of yourself the village could be in danger. Hate me if you want, but for now act like the leader you are," replied Jiraiya, slowly pulling Minato's hand from its grip on his shirt. The fight seemed to have gone out of the blonde as Jiraiya had spoken. One word repeating over and over in his mind as he slowly made his way back to sit beside his fellow Kages, who acted as though they had not seen anything out of the ordinary even as Minato's mind still repeated the word. "We Hikage-sama. We by Kami, what have I done? Oh Naruto. What have I done?" Minato's mind repeated even as a sinking cold feeling settled throughout his body as his eyes stared down at the fight below, his whole body numb to everything around him. The only feeling he had being the sickening guilt that was now working its way through his body, even as flashes of Naruto fired one after another before his eyes. A smiling child, his face scrunched up in concentration as he carefully made his way one foot after another into his own outstretched arms. The same child only a year later, laughing happily from his shoulders, one small hand clutched in his hair as the other pointed out at the parade before them, excited noises issuing between giggles as he had stood feeling the simple weight of the boy, letting him know that he was there. Still more flashed by a boy running around his office pursued by his Nisans hopping from couch to floor as the three giggled in excitement, the blonde's face turning to his and exploding into a large smile that reached all the way to his eyes as he shouted out in joy at seeing the man. Then a final memory came, a boy, no not a boy, a young man standing at a doorway looking back at him, one hand raised to hold the door ajar, tears glistening in his eyes as he whispered to the man before him, "Well Hikage-san, I've never been that good of an amicus, so I thought I would try it being an Uzumaki," the boy had said before he had turned and left the room. Minato saw all of this and more as he looked down below, and a feeling of deepest sorrow fell over him, like he had been cast out of a sunny day and into a cold starless night. And only one thought managed to make itself clear in his mind before he was simply unable to do more than watch the conflict before him in silence. Naruto. Oh dear Kami. I am damned. In the arena, Naruto was still almost frozen solid as Naruto finished off the last of the clones and turned to face her. During the entire fight her mind had been reeling, trying in vain to explain how what she was seeing was possible. So it was no great surprise that she found herself standing before Kyuubi's cage ankle deep in water and looking up at the great fox's face, which was contorted in rage, its eyes almost bulging, while its tail smashed into the watery floor, sending up waves of water that crashed upon the bars of the cage, sending echoing sounds of impact hurtling down the halls of its prison. In its fury the fox kept spouting out a series of curses even as it continued to smash at its cage. It is her. How dare she show herself before me? How dare she be here after Towson has gone? I will smash her form and drive her back to her prison. Howled the great fox as Naruto stood there watching the creature rage. After a few moments Naruto finally seemed to have enough and screamed out to the fox. Verbal, shut up and tell me what is going on. Your temper tantrum isn't doing anything but giving me a headache. Shouted the blonde, the momentary pain in her head clearing out any other thoughts she might have been contemplating concerning her situation. Her words seemed to reach the Kyuubi, who paused his cursing to glare down at Naruto, slamming both his arms into the cage a final time before letting out a heaving breath that blew hot air all over Naruto's form, tossing her hair around in it as though she was caught in a gale. The fox seemed to take a few seconds to calm itself before turning its eyes to Naruto and speaking. For once you are right, meatbag, this opponent is not one we can face half-heartedly, and if we are not careful we are the ones who will be destroyed. He finished, drawing a confused look from Naruto as he did. What are you talking about? Naruto may be throwing some pretty weird moves, but you're acting like he is some kind of monster or something. Fired back Naruto, still trying to piece the situation before her into something she could understand. Kyuubi let out a huff of obvious annoyance at the girl's words before replying. That isn't your brother out there, that is my cousin, the 10-tailed beast that my Towson the sage imprisoned in the moon. Somehow she found her way out of the moon and into the boy. Make no mistake Naruto, what we face is nothing short of a god. She almost ended the world the last time that she was free, and even limited she is not something to underestimate. Spoke the fox, even as Naruto's face contorted into a horrified face. What? Naruto is being controlled? Asked Naruto, abject horror in her voice as she spoke the words, her mind already showing her scenes of some faceless monster tearing the boy to pieces and taking his form. Kyuubi seemed to notice her distress for a moment before speaking up once again. I would say it is likely that she is inside his mind, that chakra he wields is proof of that. From what my Towson passed to me before he died, she can appear in many forms and sometimes comes in peace, but it is always a trick. My siblings and I were torn from her and set free, but she can consume us again to get back her power. Likely this is why she is using the boy to get close to you. Didn't you yourself mention that he had changed a while back? Spoke the fox, turning his head to look down at the girl with one great red eye. Naruto let out an involuntary shiver at the fox's words, remembering how Naruto had behaved differently after his trip to Wave and how his eyes had changed. Oh Kami, we have to save him. Kyuubi, how do we get her out of him? Called Naruto, her voice almost desperate with worry. The fox in turn let out a huff before looking away from the girl, a small growl in his voice. Stupid girl, if she had the boy then he is as good as dead. We must consider how we can survive this battle, not worry about the niacin that you never cared for. Kyuubi shot back, causing Naruto to stiffen as though his words had been a physical blow. The girl's head slowly dropped as memories of her time with Naruto flashed by, the arguments, the fights, the insults, but also the laughter and times when they had played as children. As these memories shot past her eyes, Naruto clenched her fist, looking up at Kyuubi, her face set in a determined glare that caused the fox to quirk an eyebrow up in apparent interest. Fine Kyuubi, will take whatever, this bitch is down to size, but we are getting Naruto out of this safe. Do I make myself clear, furball? Shouted Naruto, the water around her kicking up as the yell acted to physically push the water away from her form. For a moment Kyuubi only looked down at the girl, slightly disgusted before shaking his head in apparent agitation. Fine, but the kid gloves come off. I am not going to get eaten over this. Replied Kyuubi, stretching a hand out of the cage, slowly palm out as it did. Naruto in turn raised her own hand out so that their palms were facing one another as red chakra began to leak into the girl. Back in the real world, Naruto's eyes snapped wide as she took notice of the situation before her and, acting on instinct, tried to call out a word of warning to Naruto as one of her clones rushed him with twin Rasengans. However, as she watched, the clone was destroyed and Naruto turned to face her, the orbs around him forming into the figures she had heard described formed around him. As the forms before her sank into battle stances, Naruto let out a breath before allowing the Kyuubi's chakra to flood out of her, flowing around her like a sudden torrent held back for too long. Her blue eyes shifted to dark red as her canines and nails sharpened noticeably and the whisker marks on her cheeks darkened and lengthened. Her lips also darkened slightly, taking on an almost black countenance as her long golden hair shot back from her, fanning out as if caught in a gale wind. The final change was the red chakra bubbling up all around her, solidifying into a cloak of chakra, sprouting two long fox-like ears from its top and a pair of transparent tails from the girl's back. The effect was quite intimidating as Naruto bent forwards until one hand rested on the ground before her, her legs bent slightly at the knee, and her one arm raised up like in her toad style, but the palm open, letting the clawed hand point towards the figures before her. Naruto watched all of this while he was forced to start asking himself some interesting question. Great, why do I keep opening up my big mouth and pissing off every single girl I know, first Kasen, then Minami, even Hinata has had a few shots at me, I swear am I just cursed or something? Thought the boy, looking over to where Minami was staring at him. Now is not the time for jokes, Naruto, you need to be on your guard, the way she is now, I'm not sure that all of you will be enough. Called Yubi, biting her lip as her mind showed her the raging face of her Sachi, obviously helping to feed the girl's anger towards the pair. Naruto in the meantime noticed Yubi's discomfort, or more accurately he noticed her discomfort again. After all, it was hard for either of them to hide emotions from one another, one of the perks to having someone in your head, he supposed, they could always tell when something was bothering the other. So Naruto gave a mental shrug and continued speaking. Hi Yubi, I know that, but I knew that coming here, and I'm not about to start giving up now, besides we still have to knock some sense into your Sachi and my Nissen, so what do you say we get to work setting our family straight? Asked Naruto, allowing a small smile to play across his face as he looked over at Naruto. Yubi blinked at his statement for a moment, her mind trying to piece together how he could have known what she was thinking, but soon stopped, simply bowing her head slightly, a small smile spreading across her face as well. Hi Naruto, I think that is a good idea. Now let's go. Called the women, focusing back on the outside just as Naruto spoke up. Naruto, if you can hear me, I'm coming, so don't worry. Called Naruto, her voice harsh with emotion, both anger and worry. Her words seemed to confuse Naruto for a moment before Yubi gave him an idea of what might be going on between the girl and Kyuubi. Once Naruto understood what was happening, his smile faltered as he looked back at Naruto with the same angry worry on his own face. Naruto, I don't know what Kyuubi thinks is going on, but I'm me, and I won't be letting you win that easily. Called Naruto, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears as Naruto crouched and shot forwards towards the boy, one clawed hand drawing great furrows in the ground as she closed in on him, while the other remained cocked back ready to spring forwards in a destructive attack. Without waiting, Naruto responded, running forwards, his seating falling in on either side of him, forming an arrow that rushed across the field at the red blur that was Naruto. The two teens were about to meet when Naruto suddenly flickered out of the point position, replaced by a seedling that threw out an arm that suddenly expanded as it went, changing into a wrecking ball-sized fist towards the girl. Naruto, however, didn't even slow as she pushed herself slightly off of the ground and landed on top of the expanded arm, racing along it down its length and towards the obviously confused seedling. Before the seedling could do more that let out a panicked hum, Naruto had leapt forward, smashing a haymaker into the figure's neck and jerking it down sharply as she sped off the end of its arm and past the creature. The pull and impact drove the seedling head almost completely into the arena floor, and Naruto was still racing ahead, her eyes darting back and forth to find where Naruto had gone. Just as she spotted him again, she felt a tug as her right arm became ensnared in a wrapping of chains from two seedlings on her right, while a third was rushing her, two windmills shrunken, taking shape in its hands as it closed in on the girl. Naruto let out a small growl of anger as she tried and failed to pull the seedlings off their feet, anger flared in her ruby red eyes as she spotted that the two holding her had apparently shot some kind of supports into the ground, holding them in place. Before she could think of a way out of her situation, the third seedling was upon her, its two newly formed weapons twirling, becoming spinning circular blades that it swung forwards towards the blonde. Just as the blades descended, one of the girl's chakra tails came swinging around to smash into the seedling's right side, flinging it off to one side where it lost grip of its weapons, allowing them to spin off and bury themselves into the arena floor. Naruto then turned and with a swipe of her free hand, severed the chains holding her arm, glaring over at the seedlings that were letting out confused hums, as if wonder how she had done that. However, before Naruto could turn her attention to the pair, there was a sudden impact on her back, softened only slightly by the swinging chakra tails there. The blow caused her to stumble forwards a few steps before turning with a growl to see that Naruto had grabbed one of the bars he had thrown earlier and had leapt forwards to smash it into her back. Naruto was then forced to leap back as Naruto swung around her arm, coming up to grab hold of his arm, even as he pulled it back, attempting to avoid her grasp. Her hand was just about to close on his when he managed to substitute himself with one of the seedlings that had been holding the girl moments before. As Naruto adjusted to his new placement, he saw that Naruto had managed to grab the seedling and had flung it away from her, causing it to go skidding across the ground for several yards till with a crack, it impacted one of the trees of the field, snapping it almost in half from the impact. Naruto let out a small shiver as he saw Naruto turn to face him again, but steadied himself before taking a tight grip on the bar he held and looking over to nod at the seedling beside him. The seedling gave him a nod as well before the two shot forwards once again as Naruto raced towards them. The girl's speed was incredible, and Naruto only had a moment before she was upon him, spinning so that her new chakra tails would smash into him. Vaguely, Naruto noted that the blow was likely to be less damaging than the ones aimed at his seedlings, however the thought was quickly pushed aside as he was forced to duck under the blow. As he did so, the seedling with him leapt forwards, using his back as a springboard to launch itself up to deliver a flying spin kick directly into Naruto's face, staggering the girl again, but doing little else. A moment later, Naruto was forced to substitute yet again, leaving the two seedlings behind to be smashed into the ground. Naruto was apparently losing patience with the creatures, as just as the two most recent fighters were slammed into the ground, she formed two Rasengans almost completely made out of the chakra cloak around her and smashed them down into the two, causing them to blast further into the ground and forming two small craters that shot out spiderweb cracks across the arena floor. Naruto actually faltered a bit upon seeing this, but didn't have time to think on it, as Naruto rose again and turned towards him, flying through a quick number of seals before thrusting her hands out, sending a gale force blast of wind across the field at him. Luckily for the boy, the four remaining seedling jumped in front of the blast, the chakra of the blow lasting only for a moment before breaking apart and dispersing around them. Without waiting for instruction, the four raced forwards, even as the girl crouched down and shot across the ground, another pair of Rasengans forming in her hands as she came. As the two forces were about to meet, the seedling fanned out, causing Naruto to hesitate for a moment, and that moment was all the seedlings needed, as the two outmost seeding shot out long whip-like lines that wrapped around the girl's arms, so that the one on the left had hold of the arm farthest from it, its partner mirroring its movements. Before Naruto could recognize the danger, the two seedling had yanked with all of their might, causing the girl's arms to bend and slamming the two Rasengans together directly in front of her chest. There was an explosion of chakra at this, and Naruto was thrown up and back, the remnants of the seedlings' whips dangling where they had broken free on either arm. Before Naruto could steady herself, the other two seedlings closed in, one grabbing his partner and swinging around, hurtling the other like a missile up towards the girl. Naruto had just a moment to recognize the danger and just managed to twist in midair to avoid the seedling's fist, driving her own leg down upon the creature's neck and flinging it down into the ground below her with a crash. Just as Naruto landed, she had to turn suddenly to block an oncoming expanded fist coming from the first seedling she had encountered. The impact blew her back off of her feet and sent her skidding back across the arena, where she managed to spring back up a moment later. Naruto was breathing heavily as she looked across the field to see Naruto standing along with three of the figures around him, while the two she had hammered with her Rasengans seemed to be out of it for now, and the one she had just crushed into the ground seemed to be out of commission for a time as well. She allowed herself a small smile as she looked out at her work. Damn, those things are tough. Guess the other teams weren't kidding, but at least it looks like three are down for now. But Nyson keeps dodging me, and if I keep dialing back my hits, he will have time to switch out between those things, and I end up getting nowhere. Guess I need to hit them all at once. Naruto thought, stepping back and crossing her fingers in a familiar sign. Naruto was watching Naruto and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach as he saw the sign she was making. Before he could even shout, there were a series of poofs around the girl, and soon there stood a few dozen feral-looking Narukos, all looking his way, their eyes burning with battle fire. Naruto was about to take a step back upon facing such a force, but a humming sound from his sides drew his attention. On either side of him, the remaining four seedlings were all holding out their hands, palms up, letting out soft hums of concentration as they did. As Naruto watched, bits of black and purple chakra began to break away from their hands, swirling around and twisting as it did to form small orbs of swirling chakra in the creature's palms. Even as they all sank into a fighting position, their hands held limply at their sides, holding their mimicked versions of Naruto's Rasengans in their palms. Naruto could not help but let a smile cross his face, as with a small will of effort the two seedlings Naruto had smashed into the ground, collapsed back into seeds, and came flying over to float just in front of the boy's arms. Without pausing, Naruto thrust both his fists forwards into the orbs that seemed to slowly liquefy and work their way up his arm, leaving what looked like black skin-tight gauntlets as they passed over his skin. Naruto watched in sick fascination as Naruto's arm slowly became covered in the black substance until she saw it bubble up over his neck and face, obscuring it in for a moment in inky blackness. The liquid seemed to stop its progress at this point, shrinking back until Naruto appeared to be wearing a black Anbu mask, smooth like those that the Mizu shinobi wore, the only mark on it being a pair of bright orange orbs of light over where the boy's eyes has been. As she watched, Naruto sank down into his own stance before him and the four creatures shot off towards her force. Without hesitation, Naruto and her clones shot forwards in turn, several swiping their hands violently forward, throwing pure wind out, laced with their chakra like invisible missiles. The two sides closed, the humming from the seedlings clashing with the primal roars from the clones as the two raced in 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet. Then they were amongst each other. Mayhem was the only way to describe it. Naruto got a flash of memories as the first of her clones hurtled themselves upon the nearest seedling, while the creature threw its attacks forwards into the first of the two. However, even as those two fell, the remaining four rushed over the creature, slamming claws into it and dragging it down. Another 2 clones perished as 2 chains shot out of the creature's shoulders, impaling them and forcing them back, but the remaining 2 managed to dodge the blow and slam their fists down into the creature, once again forcing it further into the ground. Her mind snapped back as she saw Naruto slamming his now blackened fists into 2 of her clones, dispelling them, before turning his glowing orange eyes to meet her own red ones. There amongst the chaos, the 2 stood for a moment completely frozen, before at the same moment the 2 sprang forwards towards one another. Naruto was faster and managed to dodge Naruto's first strike, bringing down a hammer-like blow onto the boy's shoulder, but instead of buckling, Naruto grabbed hold of the arm, pinning it to his shoulder, before driving a fist forwards at the girl, slamming it into her chest, lifting her slightly off her feet as he did. The blow, however, did not stop the girl for long as her 2 chakra tails shot forwards to wrap themselves around the arm, jerking it back and away from her, opening up the boy's chest for a series of fast jabs that drew a muffled cry of pain from Naruto. Before Naruto could repeat the assault, Naruto forced every bit of strength he could into his feet and pushed forward, managing to throw the girl off balance, and together they toppled to the ground, leaving Naruto on top of the girl, his glowing eyes only inches from her own. "This is gonna hurt. Jubi, be ready, we're taking this fight inside," shouted Naruto inside his head as she swung back his head and slammed it down into Naruto's forehead with a cracking sound that sent splinters all throughout the mask he was wearing, but dispersed the chakra cloak around Naruto's heads as well. Before Naruto could do more than look surprised as the cloak's absence, Naruto hauled back and crashed his head forwards once again into the girl's head, this time sinking into it as he did. Naruto blinked his eyes open, looking around at what he could only describe as a dimly lit sewer. Idly he noted that his body no longer was sending him the small twinges of pain it had been, and he was able to stand up out of the water he was apparently sitting in. As he did, he looked back to see the grassy field he knew as Yubi's part of his own mind, the light from it stopping suddenly, even as the water washed up and over the grass, as what looked like the entrance to the sewer he found himself in. Before he could say anything, Yubi stepped up beside him, looking towards the end of the tunnel they were in, her eyes set and posture guarded. "It looks like Kyuubi's seal is more solid than Kyu's. I can't seem to do more than link them together. From here on out we have to proceed carefully," the woman said, as Naruto turned his gaze from her to the long tunnel before them, with a sigh. "Of course it is, I swear nothing is ever going to be simple, is it?" Naruto half-joked as he and Jubi set off into the sewer, Jubi's footsteps leaving behind a trail of fresh grass that managed to stay just above the water covering the floor of this chamber. The pair had walked for several yards before Naruto suddenly shot sideways, grabbing Jubi and pushing down, as a figure came flying at the 2 out of the darkness. As the 2 spun to see who it was, they saw that an angry-faced Naruto was glaring at Jubi, her eyes slitted and bright red as she called out to her. "You monster, get out of Naruto's head now or I'll tear you apart," screamed the girl, readying herself to shoot forwards once again at the women. Before Jubi could open her mouth to speak, Naruto's placed himself between the 2, speaking in a soft voice. "Jubi, you go and help your Sachi. We both have someone to save here," spoke the boy without sparing a glaze over at Jubi, but simply looking over at Naruto, his face set in a determined mask. Jubi looked at the boy's back for a moment before giving a small nod and turning to continue down the corridor towards where Kyuubi's cage sat. "Where the hell are you going?" shouted Naruto, attempting to follow her, but finding Naruto barring her path, his arms outstretched and his eyes focused on her. Naruto halted for a moment, the expression on Naruto's face causing her to turn her attention to him. "Naruto, get out of the way, that thing is messing with your head. I need to get rid of it so we can be okay, please. You don't know what's happening to you," called Naruto, her face heavy with emotion. Naruto for his part just looked back at his Nisan, a small look of pity playing across his face as he did. The boy didn't move at all, and Naruto, her emotions pounding at her, quickly grew angry and acted, throwing herself forwards trying to get around the boy. However, just as she was moving, Naruto moved as well, crashing into her and the 2 colliding with one of the sewer's walls and crashing through it, falling into the blackness beyond. The 2 fell for what seemed like only a moment before the 2 fell into a yard that they both recognized instantly. It was their own after all. As the 2 made their way shakily to their feet, they saw their own younger selves, no older than 4 or 5, running by, giggling. The younger children all dressed in simply play cloths, already dirty from a hard day at play. Before Naruto could do more than stare in shock at her own younger self, Naruto was already making his way to his feet and turning to face her. Without thinking, Naruto pushed herself forwards, talking the boy from his feet and onto the grass of the yard, just as her younger self did the same a few feet away. As she and Naruto rolled on the ground, their younger selves giggled happily, even the older pair's eyes blazed with intensity, locked in their own battle. The 2 came to a stop with Naruto on top, holding Naruto down, gasping out breaths as she looked down at the boy. From a few feet away, she vaguely heard her own self's younger voice calling out in a triumphant declaration interspersed with excited giggles. "Got you, Niacin," called the excited voice of the 5-year-old Naruto as she hopped up, thrusting a fist up into a victory pose. Below, the younger Naruto was grinning in a huge fox grin before he pulled one of the girl's legs, causing her to topple over beside him with a soft thump. The two children looked at one another for a second before both exploded into fresh giggles. Even as the younger children played, Naruto had managed to pull his legs out from under Naruko and thrust them up and into the girl's chest, flinging her back out of the scene, rising to rush after her a moment later. Naruto ran into the darkness, blinking as it faded, and he found himself standing in his own home, his whole family present in the living room, as Minato bent down to explain to him about delaying his training, Kushina standing a few feet back still with Mito held in her belly. Before Naruto could take in the scene anymore, he was forced to raise a hand up to block a fist from Naruto flying in from his right. Naruto managed to deflect the blow and pin it to his side, even as with a heave Naruto spun him into a wall of the house, even as his younger self spoke up. "Hi Towson, you better watch out Neeson, cause in a year I'm going to catch up in no time," called the excited boy, causing the family to smile and the younger Naruto to stand up on the couch, a large smile on her face. "No way Neeson, I'm going to be Hokage just like Towson by then, just watch," she called even as the family laughed happily, the room ringing with a happy sound. Meanwhile, the two teens struggled against one another, Naruto managing to push himself off of the wall and grabbing hold of the girl's other arm and turning it into a wrestling match to stay on their feet, their faces inches from one another. "Darn it Naruto, stand down, you don't know what's happening, I'm trying to help you," shouted Naruto even as she started to force Naruto back through the hall and back into the darkness around them. The two kept struggling until they stood in a clearing in what looked like midday, the sun beating down on them as it did with the other four there. Over to their side stood what looked like a 7-year-old Naruto and Minami, both dressed in training gear, as Minato and Kushina stood in front of them. As the two kept up their match, each trying to push each other back, the other figures kept up a conversation they seemed to have been having, taking no notice of the other two. "So are you two ready to get started?" called Kushina, grinning down at the two, excited to be able to get into the training for real after a year recovering and taking care of Mito. The girl smiled, nodding in excitement, but the younger Naruto looked around confused for a moment before looking up at the adults who looked questioning. "Hasan, where is Naruto? Neeson, isn't he starting to train with us?" asked a girl, causing the younger Minami to nod in agreement with the girl's question. What the younger girl hadn't noticed was the pained expressions that flashed across the older parents' faces at the time before they had replied, but the older Naruto did, and it caused her to pause just long enough for Naruto to force her back, the pair once again plunging into the darkness and exiting out into a park scene where young Naruto looked horrified as she turned to run from a red-faced 3-year-old Mito who had tears streaming out of her eyes. The young Naruto fled, soon followed by a concerned-looking Minami, even as Mito turned to see a young Naruto looking at her with a pained expression. "Mito, why did you yell at Naruto-san like that?" asked a younger boy, his voice soft but obviously carrying with it a bit of reproachfulness. The young Mito looked confused as she wiped stray tears from her eyes, looking up at the boy who had bent down onto one knees and reaching out to pull the smaller girl in, making shushing sounds as she held her close. The small girl sobbed in his grip as he held her, cradling her small form against his own as she continued to cry softly into his shoulder. The teen pair broke apart for a moment, Naruto jumping back to catch a quick breath even as the small girl managed to speak through her sobs. "But Neeson was being mean to Aniki. I don't know what to do," cried the smaller child as the younger Naruto just made soft comforting sounds, running one hand softly through her long red hair as he did. "It's okay Emoto, Naruto-san just wants to protect you, and me, she just gets a little block-headed sometimes, but she means well. So I want you to promise me that you won't stay angry at her, okay, cause she loves us more than anyone," reassured the younger boy as the small Mito blinked up at him, small trails of tears still falling from her eyes as she did. The small girl gave a small tearful nod before smothering herself into the boy's shoulder again. Naruto looked from the scene playing out before her and back to where Naruto stood, her eyes slightly wide as she did. "Neeson said that to her for me," thought Naruto, remembering the day and how Mito had come to hug her just the next day and had never even mentioned what had happened that day. As these thoughts flew past her eyes, she looked up to see Naruto backing up slowly from her, his eyes seeming to notice something in her own. Naruto stretched out a hand towards him and was about to call after him as the boy stepped back and faded into the darkness. Without hesitating, Naruto charged in after him. Naruto burst through the blackness into another scene, this one showing Naruto sitting alone in the yard as he looked off towards where she and the rest of the family were working on something, noises of enjoyment drifting over to where the boy sat, his eyes fixed upon the source of that happiness. As Naruto was about to make her way out of the clearing, the small boy spoke up. "Why, I don't understand you, Ubi. I know they have to help Naruto and Minami Neesons, but why can't I be there too?" the small boy asked, apparently thin air, even as Naruto turned to face the child. Then from nowhere she heard a soft voice answer the child. "I know it's hard sometimes, seedling, you can still leave if you want, the training would be easier if you hadn't split yourself." spoke the soft tone of what Naruto assumed had to the women she had briefly seen earlier in the hallway. As she watched the young Naruto shook his head in apparent disagreement. No, Jubi, I told you I have to stay, I can't leave them, they're my family. Besides, if I left my Nisans would be sad, I mean they're always looking after me and all, I just want to be able to help them too, you know," replied the boy. Although Naruto could not see the Jubi, she could imagine the creature giving a small nod as it spoke its next words. Seedling family isn't something you should ever let slip away from you. Agreed the voice. As those final words came, the scene before her began to fade slowly away, as if the color was simply draining out of it. Naruto spun as the scene began to fade and saw a visage of Jubi standing not far away. As Naruto watched, she too faded, and Naruto was left alone in darkness with only her thoughts to keep her company. And they were not pleasant ones. Naruto was alone all that time and we never even noticed why, how, I didn't mean to. No, please tell me it wasn't like that, please. I was trying to make sure I was strong enough to protect him, to protect all of them. That is what I'm supposed to do. The girl, though, even as the scene shifted to show the figures of Minato and Jiraiya standing before the girls, who looked to be just turning 11. See girls, you two have a big responsibility ahead of you, as Jinchuriki you have to be very careful, but it also means that you will be able to accomplish more than anyone else your age. Now that doesn't mean you get to boss everyone around, but it does mean you have a duty to look after everyone else. Remember, Konoha is like one big family, and we protect our family. Smiled Jiraiya while Minato nodded his head in agreement, and the younger versions of herself and Minami nodded in agreement. Naruto turned to the scene as another voice shot into her mind, her voice only younger, like the child version of herself she had seen not long ago. But we left Niacin behind, and he was family. Maybe we were wrong. It spoke softly. These words cut into Naruto like a physical blade as she spun, throwing out her arm, trying to tear the voice and the scene before her away, all the while letting out a pained cry of utter anguish. "No!" she screamed into the darkness. "No, I wasn't wrong, it's just like I was told, I have a duty to protect them, I'll make sure that everyone is safe, that we all are, no matter what I have to lose." She screamed in a pained voice as a flicker of color just behind her caught her eyes. Without thinking, she spun to face whatever new memory or shadow had surfaced, and her eyes widened in horror at what she saw. There, a few feet before her in a clearing that looked as though it must border some kind of lake or river, stood two figures. The first was kneeling, golden armor shining off of them, while the long red hair she recognized as her cousins fluttered in the wind. She was almost standing directly beside the women and therefore had a clear view of what she was facing. There, no more than a foot away, stood Naruto as she had seen him dressed before leaving for wave. A blade plunged clear through him, even as the light slowly faded from his eyes and crimson droplets fell from him the ground. Naruto screamed a cry of bone-deep pain as tears fell from her eyes and she found her legs unable to support her weight. She fell then, still screaming, her eyes wide, even as the scene wavered and the image faded. In another part of the mindscape, Naruto's cries could not be heard over the roar of the great fox that glared two giant red eyes down at the women who stood before his cage, her black pools full of sadness and small star-like tears glistening on them as she spoke. "Will you not even give me a chance, Achi?" Jubi asked, her tone carrying a note of pleading in it as she looked up at the great fox. Kyuubi in turn let out a snort before roaring down at the women again. The fox had been threatening and cursing at the women for a time now, even as she pleaded and begged him to let her speak to him to explain, but the fox would have none of it. "I told you to stop calling me that, Moster. Tausen told me all about you, if I relax for a moment you'll have me, but I won't let you, if not for this cage I would tear you apart." The fox cried as he slammed his tails into the bars of his prison, sending waves through both it and the water around it. Yubi did not flinch away from the harsh words of her Sachi, but stood looking at him, even as fresh tears poured from her eyes. After a moment she nodded her head as if accepting something and without warning, stepped forwards through the space between the bars of the cage. The Kyuubi let out a roar of anger as it first sprang back from her, landing in the center of the massive cage, his slitted eyes narrowing as he let out another massive roar. Jubi did not seem to pay him any mind and simply took a few more steps out before stopping to look at the massive fox, her face showing nothing but a clear sadness upon it. Without warning, the Kyuubi shot forwards, one clawed hand stretched out before it, claws extended like some massive spears aimed straight for the woman's chest. There was no resistance as the first claw rammed through the woman, no twitch, no movement to avoid the blow at all, and no cry of pain. The Kyuubi came to a halt, looking down at where the woman stood still unmoving, her black eyes looking into his red ones, even as his claw plunged through her and bits of odd purple fluid seemed to swell from the tip that stuck out of her back. Kyuubi couldn't understand, she had just let him attack her and even now was just looking at him. He was still frozen when she gently leaned forwards to brush her hand softly against his massive paw, a small smile playing across her lips even as tears continued to fall from her eyes. You just look at how big they've gotten. When you were born they were so small, so fragile, and I never got to hold you, none of you, but I saw them. I saw your ears and tails take their first twitches. You grabbed hold of Shikaku's tail first thing, do you remember that, Yubi?" said, her voice almost dancing in painful happiness as she just ran her hand through the fox's fur. The fox just seemed to deflate as he heard the words, his own mind remembering the vague shadow of a memory he had held of his birth. Of the figure standing back from where he was. No, that wasn't right, being held back, crying and looking at him with those eyes. The same ones now looking at him now. "And then I was gone away from all of you. And all I could do was watch. Watch as you went out into the world. So Kyuubi, please, even if you hate me, just let me be here with you like I dreamed of from the moment I first saw you," Kyuubi asked, looking up into the fox's face. Kyuubi's mind was spinning, his memories flashing by of the sage's words, his warnings, and of his death. The times after when his uncle had tried to tell them about a mistake, but he hadn't listened. How his older siblings had argued about what had happened. Always he had simply followed his Tausen's words, but the woman before him didn't seem like a monster. No, she felt safe. Slowly the Kyuubi drew back its claw, getting a small sob from the woman as her hand was slipped out of his fur. Without thinking, Kurama swept one of his massive tails forwards towards her, but instead of crashing into her, it simply caught her as she stumbled a little. The woman seemed to sink into the fur, sobbing as she just took happiness in feeling his closeness. At some point Kyuubi had begun to cry himself, and as she bent down, he brought the tail and the women close to him until they were pressed softly against his cheek, whispering a single word as he did. "Hakusen." He breathed out, causing the woman to let out a happy sob and bury herself deeper into his fur, trying to hold as much of the fox as she could, even as she choked out a few words between the cries. "Sachi, oh my Kurama. Thank you," she replied. And so the two sat there for a time, simply holding one another, never wanting to let the other go from their grip. Elsewhere, Naruto had collapsed, still crying, drawing her knees into herself as she cried softly into them. Every now and then there would be a small sob, usually accompanied by an apology or a single name, Naruto. She sat there for what must have seemed like an eternity before a small voice called out to her. "Naruto-nisan, what's wrong?" called a child's voice. Naruto looked up to see a 5-year-old Naruto standing a few feet away, his face holding a look of concern upon it as he looked at her. Naruto looked behind her for a moment, searching for what the memory could be talking to, but found nothing there. Then she felt a small hand rest itself on her own as the voice spoke again. "Nena-san, why are you crying?" the boy asked again. Naruto almost broke down into fresh sobs as she all but leapt forwards, wrapping the child in her arms and drawing him in close to her, fresh tears spilling from her eyes as she did. "Naruto, oh Kami, I'm sorry, please, I'm so sorry, please don't leave me, I didn't mean to hurt you, please, I'll never do it again, please. Please." Her cries petered out into an almost chant, begging, pleading for any kind of forgiveness from the boy. The child stood there for a moment before it wrapped its arms around the girl's neck, holding her close as well and speaking in a soft voice. "Of course, Naruto-san, that's what family is for," the child replied. As Naruto blinked tears from her eyes, she looked up to see that the child was emitting a soft golden glow. She almost cried out again as the child slowly began to break apart, but a whisper kept her from doing so. "It's okay, Nisan, I'm not going anywhere, I promised Adebayo," whispered the voice as the golden light began to eat away at the surrounding darkness. The blackness gave way to a field of soft green grass that slowly spread out around her, even as a clear sky began to become visible as the blackness seemed to be wiped away from it. Naruto, however, didn't notice, her eyes were drawn to a figure standing just a few feet from a great white tree, the figure of her Nisan. Without a pause, Naruto slowly walked down to where the girl sat, offering her a hand up. She took it before he pulled her into a strong hug, holding her close. She held strong for a moment before allowing herself to cry out once again, fresh tears falling from her eyes as she pulled herself into her Nisan, who just held her, whispering softly as he ran one hand gently through her long blonde hair. "Welcome back, Nisan," spoke the blonde boy as he held his sister close, and the two simply allowed themselves to bask in the happiness of being a family once again. Chapter 19. Talking. Thinking, mental conversation. Demon god or the like. Jutsu. We can throw one heck of a party. "It's okay, Nisan, I'm not going anywhere, I promised Adebayo," whispered the voice as the golden light began to eat away at the surrounding darkness. The blackness gave way to a field of soft green grass that slowly spread out around her, even as a clear sky began to become visible as the blackness seemed to be wiped away from it. Naruto, however, didn't notice, her eyes were drawn to a figure standing just a few feet from a great white tree, the figure of her Nisan. Without a pause, Naruto slowly walked down to where the girl sat, offering her a hand up. She took it before he pulled her into a strong hug, holding her close. She held strong for a moment before allowing herself to cry out once again, fresh tears falling from her eyes as she pulled herself into her Nisan, who just held her, whispering softly as he ran one hand gently through her long blonde hair. "Welcome back, Nisan," spoke the blonde boy as he held his sister close, and the two simply allowed themselves to bask in the happiness of being a family once again. For a long moment the two just stood there holding one another until a sound like a thunderclap rent the air and the two blondes spun their heads as a whine of apparent pain shot up from far off to their right. Both teens looked at one another for a moment before nodding and turning to run towards the source of the sound. When they arrived, Naruto almost fell over laughing as Naruko just looked on, her own mouth falling open at the sight before her. The Kyuubi was hanging from the top of his cage, literally hanging, his many tails wrapped around the bars on its top, while his great paws held onto it for dear life as it looked down with comically watering eyes to the figure below it. Tracking the fox's gaze, Naruko saw Kyuubi standing there, her fist set on her hips, looking up at the fox with all the authority a Kasen could possess. "Sachi, you get down here right this instant. You pranked your sister Chmei for over 100 years and I won't have my children getting away with that," called the woman, raising a hand to point up at the great fox and then down to the now grassy ground below her with a swift motion as she called, "Now get down here and accept your punishment." The fox responded by tightening its grip on the top of the cage and shaking its head violently from side to side before shouting back down at the woman. "No, I am the great Kyuubi no Yoko and I will not allow you to spank me like some errant child. If you want that, go find Kyu," shouted the beast even as Kyuubi crossed her arms and fixed an annoyed look on her face as she did before responding. "What you are, mister, is in a great deal of trouble if you don't get down here right now, and Kyu already got his punishment and now it's your turn. I'm not angry about the claw, but I will not let this slide," called the woman, even as the fox shook its head in apparent dismissal of the woman's comment. "Never. You may be my Kasen, but I will not be treated like a child," fired back the fox, even as Kyuubi quirked an eyebrow up in apparent amusement before she allowed her head to drop slightly, absently rubbing one hand over her forehead. Says the 10-story fox currently clinging to the ceiling like a frightened cat, "Kami, give me patience, at least Kyu took his spanking like a man," the woman continued to mutter to herself. This was the breaking point for Naruko as she too succumbed to a fit of laughter beside Naruto. The combined noise drew Kyuubi's attention behind her and a large smile broke out over her face as she saw the two laughing children standing out on the grassy meadow. She looked up, giving Kyuubi one more annoyed look before making her way over to the two who were just managing to stifle their laughter. "So Naruto, I see you and your Nisan seem to be doing better. How about it, Naruko, are you going to attack me again?" asked Kyuubi, her tone carry a twinge of mockery but surrounded by a bone-deep happiness that made it come off more playful than hurtful. Naruko had just managed to stop her laughter and shot an annoyed look up into Kyuubi's wide black eyes, taking note of the teasing smile spreading across her face as she did. The girl managed to straighten herself before breathing out a reply. "No." The girl responded, a little embarrassment at her own actions clear on her voice. Kyuubi saw this and the small downcast look on the girl's face and shrugged before plopping a hand down on the blonde's head, ruffling her hair slightly as she did. "It is okay, Naruko, this is all a bit fast, but I'd like for you and I to be friends, so let's just start fresh. You can call me Kyuubi and I hope that we can get along. Besides," here she shot a thumb back over her shoulder at where Kyuubi was still hanging from the top of his cage, "my youngest is renting a room here, I should at least try and be on good terms with the landlord, shouldn't I?" She finished in a kind tone that brought a small smile to Naruko's lips. "Hi, thank you, Kyuubi-san," replied the girl, giving the woman a smile just as Naruto managed to control his laughter and stepped forward to clap on hand onto his Nisan's shoulder. "Aw, come on Kyuubi, lay off, after all she's still getting over losing to me in the match," chuckled Naruto, a large smile spreading across his face as he said it. Naruko spun to face her brother, an annoyed look now on her face instead of a saddened one. "You're right, nice, and I totally had you beat, I was holding back and I was still bouncing you all over that stadium," shot back the girl, making Naruto's smile falter slightly as he looked back at the girl, a little annoyed as well. "Bouncing all over, heck, you were doing your fair share of that if I remember, and I was holding back too, and besides I got you in here, didn't I?" Naruto fired back, leaning in just as Naruko did the same. Naruko waved that aside for a moment before speaking again. "Yeah, but that doesn't change the fact that if I hadn't pulled my punches, you would look like Neji after his fight with Hinata," the blonde girl replied, leaning in even more just as Naruto had. Naruto in turn leaned in until their heads were almost butting together and let out a small growl. "Want to try me?" he said in a challenging tone, a smile spreading across his face as he said it. Naruko smiled as well, the same smile she had once worn years ago when the two were still children, when one had challenged the other to a game. Neither had ever been willing to back down, and this was no exception. "Bring it on, Nyasan," Naruko said, her voice carrying a happiness in its challenge that had not been there for years. Sometimes it is the simplest things that brought people comfort, and for the siblings their old rivalry was just that, there were still many things that the two needed to overcome between each other. Even now Naruto could see the ghost of those feelings etched into Naruto's eyes, and Naruto could see the small twinges of pain still visited upon Naruto as well, but for now. Just for now they could be as they once were, without anything else to focus on, nothing to take their attention away from one another. Which is probably why they didn't see it coming when Jubi swung a fist down onto the top of both children's heads, causing them to let out gasps of pain as they both pulled up their hands to rub furiously over the small bumps appearing on their heads, even as water appeared at the edges of their vision. As the two looked up at Jubi, she had an exasperated look on her face as she let out a small sigh. "I swear Kushina must have had the patience of a saint to look after you two as children," the woman muttered as she gave the two a wiry smile. Both teens shot the woman an annoyed look even as they continued to nurse their heads slightly. "On ice, and it's like you have another cousin living in your head and she hits just about as hard," commented Naruto as Naruto paused for a moment before letting out a small chuckle. "I guess I do, but she does keep me in line. Heck, if not for her, I'd probably have been ranting and raving like a maniac, shouting about my vengeance and going emo on everyone," replied Naruto, giving his niece a small smile that didn't quite cover up the twinge of sadness that had come from thinking of how much he had been forced to rely on Jubi. True, she had been happy to help him, but it was never easy for him to remember that it had been necessary because of his own messed up childhood. Naruto seemed to sense in some way Naruto's discomfort before doing something she hadn't done for him in years. She leaned over and grabbed the boy's head in a headlock, laughing as she did. "Oh no, you don't, nice, and I already have to deal with one emo, and trust me, Sasuke is enough of one for any village," laughed Naruto as Naruto struggled to break the girl's grip, laughing despite himself as he did so. After a moment Naruto managed to slip out of the headlock before giving a little huff, looking away from Naruto in mock contempt. "As if I, the great and powerful holder of the mighty Jubi, would sink to such levels of self-pity," the boy said in lofty tone that caused both Naruto and Jubi to look at one another before they both stepped forward to push Naruto so that he toppled back onto the grass with a soft thump, accompanied by the playful giggles of the two females. As Naruto was making his way back to his feet, Naruto was just beginning to relax, her mind finally coming down from what had occurred to her moments before, and with it came a fresh release of questions, and before she could stop herself, she let one tumble from her mouth. "Naruto, why didn't you tell me, Tausen and pervy sage, about having Jubi with you for so long?" asked Naruto, not noticing that the gentle breeze that had been blowing around the open field had suddenly stopped. What she did notice was that Naruto seemed to stiffen slightly, his hands gripping the ground tightly as if holding back something. Jubi looked over worriedly at Naruto and then back to Naruto as she stepped forward, reaching out to the boy, a worried expression on her face. Right before her hand alighted upon his shoulder, her wrist was caught in a strong pale hand. As she looked up, Jubi's black eyes met her own as she gave the younger woman a small shake of her head before pulling her lightly away, even as the grass around the boy slowly darkened as if it were feeding on something deadly. Naruto looked both confused and scared as she caught the sound of two voices arguing with one another from where Naruto sat, as though there were two boys there instead of the one she was seeing. Confused, she looked up at Jubi, who had led her away a few feet and was looking back at the boy's form, a concerned look on her face as she did. "Naruto, you need to leave him alone for a moment, he needs to gather himself again," spoke Jubi, her tone not commanding but carrying with it a gravity that did not suffer anyone to question it. Naruto looked confusingly from her to the form of her Nyasan before turning back to Jubi, her face etched with confusion and concern. She was still not sure of what to think of this Jubi woman, but it looked like Naruto was in some kind of pain. "What do you mean, what is going on with Naruto?" she managed to ask, even as Jubi looked down at her and let out a small sigh. "I suppose you need to know something. I take it that he showed you a few of his memories during your fight," began the woman, getting a small nod from the girl. I saw him." Here she was forced to stop as the vision of Naruto impaled resurfaced in her mind. Jubi seemed to understand the girl without her saying another word and nodded before continuing. "I see he showed you the events in Wave, well, that makes things a little easier to explain. I'll leave most of it for him to tell you, but for now I'll cover the basics. You see, Naruto was split, not unlike how Masachi Kyuubi and Kyu are now. You grew up knowing the Naruto from Wave, and when he was attacked he was mortally wounded, and the other Naruto and he joined together again, but there was damage. You see, the Naruto now is made up of those two halves, and usually they are in agreement, and you see the happy boy you knew your whole life," explained the Jubi, Naruto looking more confused than ever. "Wait, then what's this?" she asked, pointed over to where Naruto was sitting, the voices slowly fading as she did. Jubi turned a sad face over to look at where the boy sat, letting out a breath as she looked at him. "This is when the parts don't agree. Think of it like when you argue with yourself, only a little more literal. You see, one half of Naruto is still hurt by the Hokage's actions and wants him to answer for what he did to him, but also still wants to have a Tausen. The other side was the one who watched Naruto be left alone and then die before him, powerless to do anything," continued Jubi, her tone soft and worried. Naruto looked up at her and then back to where the grass was slowly coming back to life around the boy as Naruto seemed to be coming to the end of his private debate. On that other Naruto, what does he want? Asked Naruto, scared of what she was about to hear. Jubi looked down at her for a moment before looking back at where Naruto was pushing himself up to his feet. When he learned the true reason for it, all he wanted to kill the Hokage and Jiraiya with his own hands. The woman said, getting a shocked look from Naruto as she looked over to her Niasen's form, a vague memory of his first response to her when he had arrived back from Wave, as though he had been holding himself back from her in some way, and with that came a fresh wave of sadness. Kami Naruto, what have we done to you? She thought, her hands tightening into fists as her own anger at herself grew. However, before she could do more than look down ashamed, a soft hand alighted upon her shoulder and she looked up to see Jubi offering her a small smile. It is alright Naruto, he is getting better and you being here for him will help more than you could ever know. The thing to remember is that Naruto is doing this because he wants to, he had a choice to make and he chose to have a family again. As for your Tausen, well, let's just say that this will be a much harsher wake-up call, but I think Naruto will be able to manage just fine if you're willing to help him. Spoke Jubi, offering her a smile as she finished. Naruto considered the woman's words for a moment before nodding, but noticing something missing from Jubi's words before speaking up again. Jubi, you said he wanted to work things out with Tausen. What about Pervy Sage? Asked Naruto as the boy turned to see them and slowly made his way over to them, an embarrassed little smile on his face. Oh, the toad, well, I wouldn't hold my breath. Replied Jubi just as Naruto came within earshot, calling out a small apology as he did, even as his mind replayed the recent argument over in his head. Argument a few moments before. The Hokage. As if I would tell him or that damn toad anything. What the hell is Neeson thinking, asking me that? Maybe I should have pounded her into the ground a few more times cause her head seems to be practically full of so much useless crap she could stand to lose some of it. One half of the boy shouted to himself. The sound forcibly continued so that it came out only as a whisper to those around his form. Immediately another voice, calmer and gentler, responded to the other's harshness. Neeson didn't know, how could she? Darn it, we have been over this. She is just as much a victim here as we are. We are not taking out our anger and failings on others, not after what we just went through to get close to her again. Do you want to waste that chance? We just argued like we used to, we smiled, we laughed, isn't that what we wanted? The other voice responded in an almost pleading tone. This seemed to halt the other for a moment before there was a growl of anger and it continued. Fine, you're right about Neeson, but darn it, if she thinks we are just going to leap back to the Hokage and that useless excuse for a godfather after some nice words, she can forget it. She, Minami and Kasen may have been hurt just like us, but it ends there as far as I'm concerned. I won't be letting him get away scot-free from hurting them and me just like that queen from Snow or Spring or whatever it's called hurt me though. Shot back the voice. The other let out a sigh of apparent exasperation before speaking up again. Hi, fair enough, we both know that the Hokage and Toad have some things to answer for, but lashing out at others when they come near our family isn't the way to solve anything. You and I both know that we don't want to be some raging lunatic, so just calm down already. I swear it's no wonder all of Yubi's kids have anger issues. I swear, did she put something in your food while you were with her or something? The voice replied, half mocking. The other let out a small indignant huff before letting a small amount of annoyed happiness creep into his tone as he replied. As if Jubi was just okay with me expressing my anger is all. Not all of us had hinata to cuddle up with in the park or take on secret dates to the Hokage monument. It shot back, actually drawing a small smile from its fellow. Still jealous about that, are you? Mocked the other, the laughter almost visible in his tone. The other let out an annoyed huff before responding. Well, I'm here now and you didn't seem to mind letting me take command during that last kiss. Haha, I swear you were so shocked I was afraid you would freeze up on me again. The voice huffed out in a mocking tone that caused the other to fall silent for a moment. But I guess you're right, sorry, let's just get back to Neeson already. We must look like a lunatic at the moment. And it was good to see her like that again. It's been a long time. The voice finished as the other gave a mental equivalent of a nod as they allowed themselves to shift back into one entity again. As they did, Naruto blinked slightly as he felt a small headache. I hate it when we. Oh, whatever, I hate it when that happens. Why is it my mind has to go into a civil war all the time? Still, I guess it does make me happy knowing that they are still there. Here, forget it, where did Neeson and Jubi go? Naruto said to himself as he stood up and looked around, spotting them a short distance off. End of argument. Sorry about that, just had to get my head in order. Chuckled Naruto as he reached the pair, one hand slipping idly behind his head and scratching it lightly. The gesture was so Naruto that Naruto found herself relaxing as she saw him do it. I guess Neeson really is still here, she thought as she let a smile cross her features and playfully punched Naruto's arm before speaking up. You better be, I don't want to win on account of you having a mental breakdown. She said, noting the irony of her words as she did so. Naruto grinned as well for a moment before seeming to pause for a moment, as if only remembering something he had just forgotten. Oh yeah, about that, I kinda forgot, but we have to push back our fight for a while. Something big is happening in the stadium, I don't know what, but I've been hearing weird things all month from around the village, and something big is supposed to happen today at the stadium from what I've heard today. The boy said, drawing Naruto's attention in once again. Huh? What do you mean something big? She asked, her tone expressing the confusion mirrored in her face. Naruto gave a small shrug in answer. Don't know exactly, I have just heard snippets here and there from my pollen net, but the village is on high alert and something is going on, I just don't know what, replied the blonde. He then proceeded to explain the idea of the pollen net and the info he had managed to gather with them over the past month. After he had finished, Naruto nodded in understanding. I guess wearing each other out more in a fight wouldn't do us any good, but still it's not like we can just call a halt to it and give up, right? She asked as a large smile played across the boy's face. For a second Naruto looked confused before she started shaking her head in apparent fear of what was to come. Oh no, no way, we are not settling the match like we did when we were kids. I never won once against you, and you know it. Called Naruto even as the boy's smile grew steadily bigger, threatening to cover his whole face. Nice in that. Replied Naruto, letting out a small chuckle as Naruto dropped her head in an over-the-top comical gesture of surrender. You're evil nice, and but it's nice to talk to you like this again. She said, giving him a happy look as she straightened herself back up. Naruto simply shrugged before holding out a hand and speaking. It is, now get ready to lose, Neeson. He called, his voice echoing around the open expanse of grass around the pair. In the arena, everyone had been watching with anticipation as the commotion below was obscured momentarily by a burst of smoke as Naruto had tackled Naruto to the ground. A moment after the two teens had crashed to the arena floor, the remaining sea of clones exploded into clouds of smoke, throwing up a concealing dome. As the smoke finally cleared, it showed first four of the black figures, two of them having to work to pull themselves out of holes they had been smashed into, looking around, apparently just as confused as the audience. A moment later, the figures of Naruto and Naruto came into view, the boy still crouched over his fellow blonde, only this time with a kunai held in his hand and to the girl's throat. For a moment no one spoke, and then from the two a voice issued out, slightly hoarse from apparent discomfort. Proctor, I surrender. Called Naruto, her voice carrying in the silence of the arena clearly. A moment later, the Jonin, who had been standing a good deal back, flickered into view beside the pair, his eyes tracking wearily around to the black figures around him for a moment before raising a hand up in the air and calling out in a loud voice. Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze has surrendered. Naruto Uzumaki is the winner. He called, his voice ringing out around the stadium. For a second there was no response to his words, till a sudden call of happiness came from a familiar part of the stadium. That was awesome, and Nikki and Narukana-san were awesome. Yuta Seatkin. Called a young girl's voice overflowing with apparent happiness and excitement. The girl's voice seemed to act as a trigger, and soon the crowd was roaring its approval, even a few of the shinobi joining in, though most still watched the black figures below with obvious suspicion. Naruto stood up, offering a hand to Naruko, which she took, and soon the two were standing giving a small wave as they moved back towards the contestant box and medical area. The seedlings in the meantime were following behind, humming happily as they did, one even waving excitedly at the crowd, unfortunately shifting into its Ino form as it did so and bringing forth what sounded like a series of curses and shouting from a part of the stands that had been silent a moment before, but that could have been simply the two's imagination. As they walked, Naruko elbowed Naruto gently in the side with a look of annoyance on her face. It just had to be janken, didn't it? You know I'm horrible at that game. She whispered to him, even as he forced himself to keep from laughing as the two made their way through the arena. Hey, not my fault, you always lose. He teased as they continued on, nearing the contestant booth, Tsunade and Shizune standing a few feet in front of it, both looking at the two approaching teens with hopeful and at the same time proud looks on their faces. Naruto let his face show a small smile as the two stepped forwards, running brief check over the two. Well, Gakis, this is odd now, isn't it? Naruko, you don't look all that hurt, it's almost as if you two decided to throw the fight. Tsunade said with a knowing tone and smile that caused the teens to smile back at her. Shizune in the meantime handed both a couple chakra pills before giving the two a quick hug. Good match, you two. I have to say most of the crowd are still picking their mouths off the ground. Continued Tsunade, fixing a few of the minor scrapes on Naruto, Naruko's having already healed thanks to Kyuubi's presence. At this, Naruko gave Naruto a playful shove that almost overbalanced the boy. Naruko was many things, but a delicate flower wasn't one of them, however all her action got was a happy little smile from the rest of the group. You well thank this guy for that, and those. She said, jabbing a thumb back at the seedlings who were standing behind the two, humming slightly in apparent contentment. Shizune gave a shrug at her words, while Naruto looked over towards the four seedlings still behind him, as if he had managed to forget they were there. With a small pulse they all collapsed back into seeds and shot into his coat, taking their places on the tree on its back once again. You know you're going to have to explain how exactly that works sooner or later. Naruto said while Naruto just gave her a mischievous grin before replying. Hi, but for now you just get to be amazed by how awesome I am. This caused Naruto to roll her eyes as the two started to make their way back to the competitor's box. As they approached, Naruto held out his hand to Naruto, palm down, pushing something into the girl's hands as he did. When Naruto looked down, she saw a small black orb the size of a marble. Before she was able to ask what it was about, Naruto's voice spoke up in her head. It's just a gift, Neeson, don't worry, it won't explode or anything. At least I don't think so. He finished in a tone only a known prankster can master. Naruto was about to ask how he was doing this, but thought back briefly to the discussion and decided just to wait. After all, she had already learned a lot for one day, and if Naruto's feeling was correct, the day was going to get more interesting. Great, more craziness, just what I needed. She thought as the two reached the steps and started up them. Preaching to the choir, Neeson, preaching to the choir. Naruto replied, causing the two to snigger slightly as they reached the top of the booth. Before the two blondes could prepare themselves, they were both impacted in by two figures. Naruto was the first as Minami crashed into her, giving her a hug as she did, the girl's own pollen allowing her to instantly communicate with her Neeson. Naruto, you baka, I was worried about you, but you did it, didn't you, Naruto, and you're okay now, that's great, now I can stop hiding it from you. Kai was driving me crazy, wanting to talk to Kyuubi about it, oh and good match by the way. The Redeed said, firing off so many comments that Naruto at first thought that Mito had suddenly aged a few years and had replaced Minami in the booth with her. After a moment, Naruto was able to steady herself enough to reply. Hi Minami, we are getting better, I won't say it is fixed or anything, but we have a chance now. On sorry for being so pig-headed about everything, thanks for trying to help me see it, if you hadn't I don't know if Naruto and I could have this chance. So thanks Neeson. The blonde replied, just getting an exasperated smile from Minami as she gave her Neeson another quick hug. No problem Naruto, after all one of us has to keep their head in this group, or you and Naruto would have blown up the whole stadium before one of you gave in, I swear you two are the most stubborn people I know. But it's good to have you with us again. Replied Minami as the two broke apart and turned to see their brother locked in another long kiss with Hinata. At first the two just blinked as the kiss seemed to stretch on for a few seconds, then a bit longer. Finally even Sasuke was having to suppress a blush at the two's antics and Minami spoke up. Okay, that's it Hinata, you and Naruto get a room, some of us here are single and you're making us feel inadequate. Called Minami loud enough to break the couple out of whatever world they had been lost in and bringing them back, causing both to flush bright red as they looked around the booth at everyone's watching eyes. For a moment neither moved, then to everyone's surprise Hinata leaned up to kiss Naruto once more before taking his hand and walking them over to the railing in a posture that made it clear that embarrassed or not, she was not going to let anyone else forget who Naruto belonged to. Naruto in the meantime just followed her with a small grin on his face as he looked around at the rest of the men in the booth as if saying, yeah, that's my girl. As the two teens reached the railing, both Naruto and Minami looked at one another for a moment before sending each other a small mental agreement. Okay, yeah, Hinata-chan might be onto something, we need to find a guy. They thought at the same time, causing them to giggle a bit even as the announcer's voice rang out again and Sasuke and Gaara moved to exit the contestant box. Joan and Proctor called for the next round of contestants and a red and black-haired youth respectively made their way into the arena. A figure in the cage box was looking like he had just been hit squarely in the face by one of Tsunade's blows. Jiraiya was looking down as though he expected someone to suddenly jump out and yell just kidding and show him that the last few minutes had been some kind of dream. His mind raced as he tried to make some sense of what he had seen. Naruto, the child of prophecy, had been beaten by Naruto, a boy that had only followed the basic ninja training through. He didn't know what exactly the boy had been using in the fight and he was determined to figure out just what was going on, but at the moment his mind was consumed by one overarching thought. Naruto had lost, she had fallen. And as is the case when the mind is forced to comprehend something it doesn't want to, it grasps at straws, trying to find some kind of thread to attach onto. And the thread he found was one that led to a truly unpleasant view. The way the old man's mind saw it, there were only three possibilities to explain what he had seen. First, that Naruto wasn't the child of prophecy and that it was now clearly Minami as she fit all of the requirements now, but he had been so sure it would be Naruto. Well, he supposed he could have been wrong about the girl, but still Naruto's abilities made it harder to simply write Naruto off. The second possibility was that the defeat had meant nothing after all the prophecy had said fallen, it hadn't said how. For all he knew this defeat was nothing more significant than a setback or a coincidence, but again, Naruto's strange new abilities seemed too strange to simply be dismissed again. Which brought him to his final view and, most assuredly the worst possible of the three. What if Naruto was somehow involved? True, he couldn't be the child of prophecy, after all he didn't have any great burden like the girls, and how could he be two people, but could he be an obstacle? Jiraiya had never considered threats to the prophecy, in fact, where had Naruto gotten his abilities? And there were powers working in the shadows these days. But at the moment this was all speculation. Jiraiya may not have found any answers yet, but one thing he was sure of, after the tournament Naruto was going to have some major explaining to do. As this final part flashed vaguely through his mind, the sage looked over to where Minato sat, looking just as blank as he had after he had taken his seat halfway through the match. For all the movement or noise he was making, he might as well have been a statue. Jiraiya, seeing this, put his own mental debate aside for a moment and walked over to stand by the Hokage, bending down as he did. "Hey Gaki, we need to look into this, but for now you need to focus, you're in the middle of the tournament, I know it's hard, but we need to not show any weakness here, so just put it away for now." Minato's head cocked slightly as if he had been poked suddenly as he turned to fix Jiraiya with a look that clearly indicated he was questioning the other's sanity at the moment. "Focus. Is he serious? He wants me to focus on some blasted tournament, some stupid politics, or my fucking job? My Sachi just won against my Musume, something I would have called impossible an hour ago, and he wants me to focus. I have all but destroyed my family, I have hurt and pushed everyone I have ever loved to the breaking point, all of it to figure out some fucking prophecy, and I've followed everything you have said like some damned puppet, and now it looks like it was all pointless because apparently Naruto managed to best all of our work despite me basically abandoning the child. And he wants me to focus. The only focus I have right now is deciding where I want to hit him with my Rasengan and where I want to plunge the damn thing into myself, cause I'm starting to think I have lost everything I have ever loved and it was all fucking pointless." Minato roared inside his mind. The intensity of his anger at both the man before him and himself was so great that the intent coming off of him almost caused the other members in the cage booth to lose their own composure as they fought against their own instincts to distance themselves from what felt like a volcano about to erupt. Whether for better or worse, Minato's rage actually managed to render him incapable to speaking further, and he simply looked from the man beside him and back down at the arena, trying not to contemplate a murder/suicide combo as the next competitors Gaara and Sasuke entered the stadium floor. As for his guilt, well, it would be the one aiming his strikes, it had had enough of its peaceful and passive resistance and was seriously throwing in with the mutual destruction option. While this was occurring over with the rest of the Hokage's family, while a few of its members were busy celebrating the last match in their own way. Mito had been jumping up and down for the last few minutes, giggling and calling out excitedly as the match had ended. She wasn't concerned about winners and losers for the last match, all she had cared about was that the two seemed happy when they had left, and for her that meant the world. First Minaminasan and now Narukanasan, she was seeing her family happier than she could ever remember them being, and for her that was the greatest feeling she had ever known. Unfortunately, her celebration had an easily foreseeable result. As Mito had begun to cheer and clap, the banner she was holding had of course fallen out of her hands, and the cloth had been dragged forwards over the figures sitting next to her. So for a moment it looked like she was cheering beside several very lazy trick-or-treaters before the three managed to pull the banner off of them with the helpful hand of Hanabi. As the banner came down off of Hitomi and Hiashi, they turned at a small soft choking sound coming from over where Kushina still sat covered by the folds of the banner. The two looked at one another for a moment as Hanabi hopped down to join in Mito's cheers and then back to where the woman sat, apparently unbothered by the sheet currently obscuring her from view. Hitomi gave Hiashi a small concerned look that he understood without words, and with a gentle effort he lifted Hitomi gently from her seat and carried her over, setting her beside her friend before moving over, taking the two younger children with him. Hitomi gently leaned over to Kushina's covered form as she gently pulled the cover off the woman, allowing the soft sound of sobbing to come out, no longer muffled by the cloth. There Kushina sat, her eyes pressed shut, but unable to halt the slow trickle of tears that came from her eyes all the same. She had pulled Kyuid close to her chest and was cradling it as though it were a child, the small orb letting out a small concerned whine barely audible over the woman's own stifled tears. Hitomi reached out, resting a hand upon her friend's shoulder and leaning in before speaking. "Kushina, what's wrong? I thought you would be happy, Naruto won," asked the confused woman as Kushina shook her head, allowing a few tears to fly from her and land on the area around her. "I'm happy, Hitochan, I'm so very happy he did it again. What did I do to deserve a Sachi like him? That would fix all of my failures. Oh my maelstrom, thank you," whispered the Redeed more to herself than to Hitomi. The Hyuga woman didn't say anything more. She understood her friend's words all too well. To see something like her family saved was the greatest gift Kushina had not dared to truly believe in. She had spoken of it, she had dreamed of it, but in the end she had believed that after her and Minato's actions, she had doomed them all, and her Sachi had just shown her that hope wasn't gone after all. For that Kushina wept tears of joy as her friend sat by her, one hand resting on her shoulder as she bowed her head in silent agreement with the source of the Riti's tears. At the same time below, the match had just begun with Sasuke dodging in and out of blast of sand and attempting to breach Gaara's defenses. While this was occurring, Kakashi and Guy were busy having a conversation about the match, Kakashi explaining his own teaching method as his rival listened, throwing in a comment every now and again. Meanwhile, a few feet below them, the other Jonin senseis and their students were having a very different conversation, oblivious to the conversation of the others. Well, that was a surprise with the last match, commented Asuma as he leaned back, his eyes lazily tracking the match below without much interest. So far neither competitor had shown any real shift in their abilities since the prelims, and while Gaara's sand was impressive and Sasuke's speed had improved after the previous match, it was hard to capture the same amount of interest. Kurenai gave the man a look before letting out a sigh. "You're angry at me for not telling you about what I knew, aren't you?" replied the red-eyed woman, making it a statement rather than a question. Asuma in response just pulled out a cigarette and popped it into his mouth, lighting it. To his surprise, Kurenai did not move to pull it from his mouth. He turned to see her measuring him with a steady gaze. After a moment he looked back down at the match, letting out a puff of smoke as he did. "In a way I am, but more than that I'm wondering what is going on. I'm not stupid, Kurenai. I know someone told you to keep quiet, but that isn't what worries me. Something here doesn't add up. I've seen a lot in my time, and I mean a lot, and that last fight was just plain wrong." He finished taking a drag of his cigarette as he did. Kurenai looked puzzled at his words, but before she could say anything he spoke again. "I never told you I ran into another Jinchuriki, did I? Heck, must have been 9 years back, no idea what number he was, but he shot up a cloak and came at us trying to aim for the fire daimyo. Took 4 of us to put the bastard down, and even then he didn't stay down. And you know what I remember more about that fight than anything, Kurenai?" Asuma asked, his tone distant. The woman could only shake her head in response as Asuma pulled the cigarette from his mouth and continued on. "What I remember is hitting that guy with everything I had, blades, justices, heck my best stuff, and that damn cloak of his, sending it off like it was nothing. Heck, we had to bust out some team attacks just to punch through it, and I just saw a genin do what a team of A-rank shinobi couldn't do. So Kurenai, what I'm angry about is that either the Hokage is keeping secrets from us, or that we have all been duped by a genin who Kami only knows what his abilities are. Heck, from what Ino said he may be able to create life." Finished the man as his hand tightened and the cigarette in it was crushed in his palm. Kurenai let a small worried smile grace her lips as she laid her hand gently upon Asuma's, causing the man to look down at it and then back up into her bright red eyes. "Asuma," she began, her tone soft but firm, "I will tell you everything I know soon, but I can let you know that neither the Hokage or anyone else truly has any idea of what is happening besides a handful of us, but you can trust me that Naruto hasn't been duping anyone, he isn't that smart." She finished with a small smile as Asuma let a small chuckle spring from his lips as he opened his palm, allowing the woman's to slip into it. "Okay, Kurenai, I believe you. I guess I'll have to find out everything sooner or later, but for now I trust you," replied the man as she looked back towards the fight below. While the two had been talking, Yakumo had been edging slightly away from Ino, who in turn had edged closer to the girl, till they looked like there was some magnetic pull occurring between the two. After a while, Choji finally spoke up, his tone exasperated. "Ino, stop that. Yakumo doesn't have to tell us anything right now, and we can just ask Naruto later. You just got done screaming about that thing that changed into you, and now you're eyeing Yakumo like she is some kind of accomplice. Can't we all just get along?" asked Choji, his tone soft and hopeful. His kind heart did not enjoy seeing Yakumo in such obvious discomfort, and after finding Shikamaru in his own little world, he had relented to trying to help the girl on his own. Both girls turned their eyes over to where Choji sat, Yakumo sending a silent thank you, while Ino just looked slightly annoyed. "Look, I just want to know what's going on, Choji. That thing, seedling or whatever it is, looks like me, and she knows something, and I want to know what it is," the girl said, turning to look at Yakumo again, who had pulled out her sketch pad to try and hid behind. Ino, however, seemed unperturbed and just kept staring at the girl's sketchpad as if willing it to become transparent and allow her to continue to see her target. Choji let out a sigh and turned back to the arena, watching as Sasuke leapt back, dodging a fresh wave of sand before spitting out several blasts of fire that impacted upon Gaara's shield, throwing up clouds of smoke but doing nothing else as far as the boy could tell. Ino in the meantime was silently trying to piece together how she was going to get Yakumo to open up to her. "And from what Sakura says, she likes drawing and is rather shy. Great, I don't have idea one on how to get her to open up to me. Crud, and she knows something about those seedling things. Darn it, I can't have that thing running around looking like me. Kami only knows what it has been doing. Wait, if Naruto made those things," and as Ino's mind settled on that thought, a horrible and completely inaccurate idea overcame her on what exactly Naruto could have possibly done in connection to the seedling. Without warning, Ino let out a cry of mixed horror and anger that caused everyone around to suddenly focus on the girl as a fresh round of shouts and curses spilled out of her mouth. Over in the contestant box, Naruto and Hinata were standing beside Minami and Sakura, all watching the match with some interest. Naruto had already headed out of the box and was making her way up to where she had seen Mito's signs, looking to find a place to sit in order to watch the remainder of the matches. The group had mostly remained silent as they did, none of them wanting to miss what came next with the fight. "So that kid Gaara is like you and Naruto?" Sakura asked, looking over at the red-headed girl, who gave her a small nod. "Hi, from what Naruto and Caillou have said, he holds the one-tailed raccoon, Shukaku, but besides that I don't know anything," replied Minami, looking over at Sakura before the two turned to look over at the blonde boy beside them. Naruto seemed to notice their eyes on him and pulled his eyes away from the match to look at the two. Did you to say something?" asked the boy, turning to face the two girls. "Yeah, sorry Naruto, I was just asking about this raccoon thing that the kid from Sand has. I mean, I know Minami and Naruto have been trained to control theirs, but something seems off about this Gaara kid. Do you or will your guest know anything?" Sakura asked. Naruto seemed to consider the question for a moment before giving a shrug. "Well, really all I know is that he controls that sand via Shukaku's chakra. Apparently it was a trick he learned from the Juubi. He just adapted it to fit his chakra stores and abilities. Beyond that, all I can say is that it's Shukaku in the driver's seat out there. The Gaara kid might as well be a puppet," Naruto replied, the three girls nodding their heads as they took in what he had said. From a little ways behind, the four Tamari went rigid as she heard the other blonde's words. As the four genin continued to chat away, the genin from Suna was busy having a small panic attack. How did they know? Fuck, the invasion was based on Gaara being a surprise ace, and these genin seemed to know all about him. Damn, if they know, then there's no way the higher forces don't. This whole operation is Fuber and we haven't even started. And what the hell was that about Shukaku being in charge? What does that mean for Gaara? Crap, there are just too many questions here. Damn it, I'm almost empty as it is. If we lose the element of surprise, I'm as good as dead. What the hell was the Kazuki thinking? We never should have trusted that blasted snake. He's leading us into a fucking minefield. The girl raged inside her mind, trying to keep her calm facade in place. However, her subtle shifts in facial and body language had caught the eye of an easily overlooked genin standing just a few feet from her. Shino, who had been standing stoically in the rear of the competitor's box watching all of his fellow genin in silence, had seen the girl's apparent anxiousness. For a moment he was willing to let the action go unnoticed, however, a nagging feeling told him that to do so would be unwise. So he moved over so that he was situated directly behind the girl, his eyes trained on her, and his stance lax. Something is happening here today. Naruto took a dive in that last match, and I know darn well that Naruto must have had more up his sleeve as well. Something is coming, and this Suna Kunoichi seems to know about it. Better to be safe on this one, thought the teen as he took up his new position. Meanwhile, in the arena, Sasuke was quickly losing patience with his match. True, with his new speed and fully developed Sharingan, he could accurately predict Gaara's next attack, but even then he could not find a blind spot to exploit. Every time he had closed in, the sand had been there to either trip him up or funnel him into a more direct path. Once he had only managed to dodge the next attack thanks to seeing a small smile on his opponent's face. He was slowly starting to suspect that he was being led around the fight like a chess piece, led into attacks that were more dangerous to him, or bluffed into dodging an attack that never came, and this was making him angry. When that anger came, the sand seemed to almost slide around with some excitement, as if it had tasted blood in the water, as it rushed in, redoubling its efforts on the boy. So Sasuke had decided to end the game and had shot away from the reed and up the arena wall, ducking down as he did so. From Gaara's mind, a low chuckle came as Shukaku watched his opponent. So the little red eye has some brains after all. I was half expecting him to not notice I was leading him around. Still, his speed is a problem. Gaara is still slowing me down, or this fight would have been over by now, but no matter, the red-eyed one has gotten angry. All I have to do is wait, and he will make a mistake. They always do in the end, and I can wait, chuckled the great raccoon as he sat watching the match as though watching a particularly fascinating game of chess. As Sasuke dashed away from him, he allowed his mind to wander for a moment. It found itself thinking back to his encounter with his cousin a few days before, and with that came a small twinge of sadness. True, he did not question his choice, it had after all been the correct one, but to see the sadness on his cousin's face hurt him. After all, if he hurt her, how was he any different from that bastard of a man and his kind? Damn, I need to stop thinking like that. I do what is right. They harmed my family, so I will tear theirs to sunders. This is not petty revenge, this is justice, and I will not forgo it. Shukaku thought again as he idly waved a hand, causing Gaara to raise his ultimate defense. It was not wise to leave a vulnerable weakness exposed while he was thinking after all. Outside, people watched as Gaara was slowly covered in a massive orb of tightly compacted sand, encasing the boy in darkness. As the darkness fell, Gaara found himself standing on the edge of a great expanse of white sand. Shukaku sat way off in the distance out of the boy's view, but for the eldest of the tailed beast, the child may as well have been standing on his own finger, after all he was the desert and his reach was all-encompassing. Ideally, Shukaku gave a small wave and a figure rose from the sand, forming into the body of a motherly figure, her face soft and comforting, even thought it was made of the same white sand as everything else. Shukaku looked down at the figure for a moment before gesturing it away off towards the boy to act as his mouthpiece. He couldn't remember where he had first come up with the idea to use the child's mother as a disguise. Heck, he couldn't even remember how he had known what the woman looked like to begin with. He had just remembered awakening in his latest host and feeling an odd pull to create the mouthpiece, and so he had. Now that he thought about it, the mouthpiece had also acted oddly a handful of times, hugging the reed and pulling it out of his own shifting dome, as though it thought it was the child's real cousin. Of course, Shukaku had investigated the phenomenon, but as of late, he still had not found an answer to why the mouthpiece still acted every now and then to protect his host. It was as he thought this that he looked down to see that the mouthpiece hadn't left and was looking up at him, its white face looking at him with a blank and slightly saddened look on its face. "I told you to go, you useless construct, not to gape at me," called Shukaku in annoyance, then pausing, raking one massive clawed hand over his head, recognizing he was basically yelling at himself. However, before he could calm down, there was a voice soft and sad and definitely not his own. "Your cousin loves you and all she wants is for you to be safe, that's all any cousin wishes," spoke the figure below. Shukaku simply stared down in confusion at the mouthpiece as she slowly turned and made her way out over the shifting sands and towards his host's location. For a moment Shukaku just sat there, his mouth slightly agape before shaking himself slightly and forcing his mind to think logically. "I need to stop thinking about this kind of thing, my own doubts are starting to talk too, at this rate I'll end up being broken in half just like Kurama. Well, at least I would have someone to talk to, but for now let's see what little Red Eye is up to." He finished as he looked to see that the reed had stopped up the side of the wall and was focusing a large amount of chakra into his open palm. Meanwhile, the mouthpiece had arrived where Gaara stood. As it approached, it dropped to one knee and pulled the boy into a small hug that the boy sank into for a moment. "Hakusan." The boy half whimpered as he held onto the sand vestige that was an exact copy of his deceased cousin. Meanwhile, on the outside, Sasuke had finished charging up his next strike. His open hand now looked like it was holding pure lightning, bright violet blue that sent off small sparks as it bit into the wall the boy stood on, even as a high-pitched chirping noise accompanied it. More than a few jonin looked on in shock at the boy's latest move, many recognizing it as the signature move of Kakashi of the Sharingan. Kakashi at the time was busy explaining to Guy why he had taught his prized move to his student, while up in the cage box, the Kazukiya's eyes gleamed with an excitement that was almost physically visible. The rest of the genin, even Naruto and Minami, were forced to admit that this latest move had caught them off guard. They all watched with rapt attention as the boy speed down the wall and forward towards the great orb of sand. As he closed in, great spikes of sand shot out of the orb, deadly points plunging forwards towards the advancing teen. However, Sasuke's eyes allowed him to see the coming assault and dodge the deadly spikes, reaching the orb and plunging his hand forwards. There was a retching sound as the lightning first dug into the orb with a crack that echoed around the stadium. For a moment there was no noise in the stadium. As the crowd watched, a small trickle of red leaked its way down the red-eyed youth's arm, a few drops falling onto the arena floor with an indistinguishable sound of impact. As those drops fell, there was an ear-piercing shriek of pure anger from the orb of sand, and Sasuke was struck in the chest by a solid pole of sand that shot out of it, flinging him across the open arena, his eyes open and staring in confusion and fear at what he had seen inside the hole that his blow had punched in the orb. Several things happened at once as Sasuke fell back and a scream called out through the stadium. Feathers began to fall suddenly from the sky, while several figures in the crowd leapt to their feet and started to move. There was a deafening explosion from the cage booth, and over from the contestant box a particular blonde had called out in a half-crazed voice in apparent frustration. A few minutes previously Naruto had been watching the fight while the girls had continued their conversation on Gaara without him. The blonde had allowed himself a moment of calm after everything that had happened. "You know, Jubi, I think things are going to be alright. I mean, Naruto and I are shaky now, but I think we will be able to move past everything and nothing looks like it's going to happen after all. Maybe everything will work out," the boy said to his companion in a happy little tone. Jubi in turn gave a small nod, but her countenance was still dubious. "Maybe, Naruto, but I wouldn't relax just yet. True, we managed to get through the match, but even still the exam is far from over, and something tells me that it won't be that simple. Besides, we still have Shukaku to deal with, and he is one of the more dangerous challenges we are likely to face," Jubi replied, causing Naruto to give a small mental shrug. "Jubi, but still, come on, my luck can't possibly be that bad," Naruto finished. Juubi was about to respond to the boy, pointing out several occasions where just that had indeed happened, but it seemed fate beat her to it. Without warning, just as a roar went up from the arena, a sudden carpet of chakra started to cover the stadium as feathers began to drift slowly down. At the same moment there was a sudden explosion from the cage booth and figures began emerging from everywhere. Behind him Tamari started to make a move but suddenly fell to the ground as Shino's insects quickly drained what little chakra the girl had left. And Haku with a worried tone shouted something about Tsubuzasama before disappearing, leaving a small gathering of frost and snow where he had been standing. Naruto only had time to give the chaos before him a brief glance before he threw up his hands and in a snarl of rage yelled out. "Oh come on, you have to be kidding me." The blonde yelled, grabbing his hair in complete frustration. Inside his mind Juubi couldn't help but wonder if one of Kami's court enjoyed setting up moments like this just to see people like Naruto flip out. Luckily for the shinobi and citizens falling under the effect of the Jinjutsu, Naruto managed to keep enough sense in him to set off his contingency plan. When the Jinjutsu had first begun falling, the Jonin sensei along with their students had felt the effects just in time to throw up a counter. Some of the less experienced shinobi and kinwaichi around them, however, slumped forwards apparently asleep. Before the Jonin could get about to assisting their comrades, they were forced to swing to meet a now oncoming force of shinobi bearing sound and sand headbands. With an angry roar, Guy shot forwards, sending a pair of sound shinobi back into the concrete wall of the stadium, even as on his right Kakashi caught one attack Suna shinobi's arm, directing his kunai thrust into a kinwaichi from sound, How had attempted to get at his back before slamming his own kunai into the original Suna attacker. Kurenai had been forced to leap forwards to catch an attacker that was descending towards Yakumo and Ino, but managed to thrust her own kunai into the attacking sound shinobi's back, forcing him face down between the two teens, who both let out small gasps of panic. Asuma in the meantime had jumped to cover Kurenai's back and had already cut down a pair of advancing shinobi, but more were on the way. "Shit." The bearded man yelled as she gave another swipe, cutting both the opponent kunai and threw in one swift gesture, letting a small red mist fly out of the man. "They planned this out, there are too many civilians and comrades here, I can't use any jutsus," he called as he was forced to spin, taking another Suna shinobi down with a pair of quick blows. As Asuma shouted, Shikamaru had already dropped to a knee, firing out his shadow and catching a pair of charging sound that were headed for Choji. Of course they did, that was the point of the Jinjutsu, to shift the stadium into a killing field. The Konoha forces can't fire off larger attacks for fear of hitting the unconscious ones, meanwhile the enemy can go weapons free. It's not even that simple, is it? Their forces are less experienced than ours from what I've seen so far, but with this handicap the playing field is giving them every advantage. Thought the boy furiously as Choji swung his expanded fist forwards into the two figures that Shikamaru had immobilized. As the blow threw the pair back, Shikamaru spun ready to receive orders from his sensei when he saw it. There, floating a few feet off of the ground, was the black marble he had been holding just a few moments before. Looking quickly round, he saw that there were many other orbs hovering around, seemingly all around the stadium. The orbs also caught the eye of several other of the figures around them, but before anyone could do more than stare at them, there was a small pulse from the orb and all of its fellows. The shinobi all around the stadium felt a small wave-like sensation that came off as a small tingling sensation. At first the wave seemed to have no effect, but as Shikamaru watched he saw a Chunin sitting not too far from him suddenly stir from his sleep, blinking around confused for a moment before jerking left out of the path of the kunai, swung by an attacking sound shinobi. Managing to grab the attacker's arm and pulling him down to the ground where they continued to struggle. The boy felt a sudden dawning understanding as he looked around, seeing shinobi and civilian alike coming to. Some beginning to shepherd the civilians out of the fight, while others rushed forwards to attack the invading force. Shikamaru felt a fierce grin spread across his face as he saw the effect the orbs were having. "Well played, Naruto, it seems you managed to even up the playing field," the boy thought as he trapped another figure who had rushed towards Kurenai's unguarded side as a section of the stadium seemed to come to life and grab hold of a shinobi that had leapt over his fellows aiming for Shikamaru. The boy turned to see Yakumo holding a painting out depicting a great stone fist coming out of the ground, reaching out to grab a figure. Beside her, Ino was lying limp as a Suna shinobi leapt forwards to attack his confused sound allies. However, while their group seemed to be holding its position rather well, most of the rest of the stadium seemed to be in utter chaos. Before he could focus again, a blast caught his attention from over on the other side of the stadium. Spinning, he saw a strange figure on all fours crouched beside a group of people, and if he wasn't mistaken, whatever it was, it had several of what looked like tails. When the Jinjutsu had begun to fall around Kushina's group, she had immediately recognized the danger, but before she could do more than cry out in surprise, several enemies were springing forwards aiming at the group. It seemed the enemy had a particular interest in taking out the small group, and as Kushina's eyes went wide, she saw that the oncoming forces were likely to simply overrun them. She spied out of the corner of her eyes that both Mito and Hanabi had fallen asleep, their small forms held against one another, and their faces sunk into small faces of sleep. Hiashi had jumped into action, stepping over the pair, towering up as he sank into his stance, and his Byakugan flared, but even he knew that protecting the children and himself was a losing battle. However, if that bothered the man, he did not show it as he set himself ready to meet the oncoming horde. Kushina also noted that Hitomi looked to be in a clear panic, knowing that she could only put up a token defense at best, but more horrified at the possibility of seeing her husband and child fall just a few feet from her. All of this flashed through Kushina's mind, even as she summoned as many chains as she could, fire them off towards the oncoming shinobi. However, it was too late. Although her chains struck true, at least half of the oncoming attacker barreled through the golden assault and plunged forward, kunai bared like the fangs of some great beast. Kushina gritted her teeth as she waited for the blow to come, fighting the fear she felt as she roared in her mind that she would not die here, not now, not when she was just starting to have her family again, and that is when it happened. The Ashi had just battered away two shinobi as a third managed to plunge a kunai into his back before the Hyuga spun, slamming a palm thrust into the man's chest and liquefying his chest cavity in a second. As he turned to meet the next assault, a sudden blackness rushed across his vision as he heard a strangled gasp from the attackers he had seen racing towards his exposed back. Hitomi also saw the black appendages intercepting the coming attack and, with her Byakugan blazing, turned to see where the long, oddly furry-looking thing had originated from. Both Hyuga's eyes fell upon Kushina, who was looking just as shocked as her fellows, as the figure to which the tails belonged to crouched beside her, as it left off a low humming growl, and its purple and red eye flashed in apparent anger. Kushina could only blink down in surprise, momentarily forgetting her position or the fact that she was under attack. A moment before, when the enemy had closed in, the orb in her lap had exploded out as 9 great well tails of black fur shot out, either slamming into the shinobi around her or flying out to grab the ones headed for those around her fellows. As the Redeed watched as the orb in her lap fell to the ground, breaking and spreading out into a figure that looked like a cross between Harsachi and a fox. 2 long, almost rabbit-like ears shot out of the creature's head, twitching slightly in apparent agitation as from its newly formed face, a small humming growl escaped from. Kushina was able to take notice of a small jagged crease where the creature's mouth must have sat. With a jolt, she realized that the creature before her looked almost identical to the girls when they had manifested 4 tails of power. However, before she could do more than look down in shock, Kaiuid had leapt between where Hitomi and Hiashi were, dragging several of the wolf attackers with it in its powerful tails. With a few jerks, its tails swept out, flinging those held in them out into the stadium, bringing small cries of pain as they smashed into different parts of the stadium seating. Then the creature was back down between the group, its eyes narrowed as it looked around at the others that had sprung forwards to attack the group. The 3 adults stared confused and a little afraid of the creature before them, even as Hanabi and Mito blinked, slowly awake as the pollens around the stadium let out their pulses. The 2 leaned up off of one another, apparently ignorant to the havoc occurring around them. The 2 blinked for a moment before Mito leaned over and grabbed hold of one of Kaiuid's tails, letting out a small sigh as she let herself fall back to sleep with a small mutter of "Hi Kaiuid," before the Jinjutsu's effects caused her to slip back into sleep. The Jinjutsu may have been broken, but the after effects were enough to overpower the children, and after ranging themselves happily against one of the Kaiuid's tails, the 2 children sank back into sleep. Kaiuid, along with all of the other adults, could only look in wonder at the children, wondering how they could have fallen asleep at a time like this. However, the next moment another pair of sound shinobi were rushing them, and before any of the adults could do more than start to move, Kaiuid had allowed its mouth to pop open and spit out a blast of purple and red chakra that impacted the 2 in midair, flinging them back into a wall with a blast that caused the watching adult's hair to blow back slightly in the wind. The last assault seemed to have caused the attacker to fall back for at least a time, and Hiashi managed to put into words what the others were feeling at that moment. "What the heck is that?" the man asked through the pain in his back as he reached around to yank the blade from where it had been buried in his back. Hitomi grimaced and pulled herself over to Hiashi, tearing a strip from her kimono as she did to push into the wound and keep it from bleeding out. The pair turned to look over at Kushina, who had moved to put her back to them, her eyes looking around, trying to make sure that no one got in an attack on them. "Do you think that's Kaiuid?" Kushina said, not dropping her guard or taking her eyes away from any potential attacker. However, she almost let out a yelp of shock as Kaiuid, hearing his name, let out a half hum and purr, leaning over to rub affectionately against the woman's side, looking up at her with her bright eyes now back to their round proportions. Kushina managed to look down for a moment and couldn't help but give him a small smile before looking back out over the stadium, her mind racing as what to do next. However, before she could do more than start thinking of her next move, there was a familiar voice not far from her, accompanied by several explosions that caused both her and Kaiui to spin their heads around to focus on the commotion. "You picked the wrong girl to mess with today, take this Rasengan," called Naruto as she blasted through a mixture of sound and soon a shinobi, her form already cloaked in a level 1 shroud and her red eyes spinning in search of her family. Her eyes spotted them a moment later and she hurried over, swatting a few stray enemies away as she did. As she reached Kushina, she almost lost her footing as she saw Kaiui, but managed to keep from crashing by falling to all fours a few feet from the group, bringing her almost eyes level with Kaiui himself. For a moment the two just looked at one another before Kaiui let out a small purring hum and proceeded to rub its face against her cheek. Naruto just stared momentarily dumbfounded as inside her mind her thoughts matching her confused expression perfectly. "Ooh. What the heck is that thing and what's it's doing?" Her mind blankly asked, even as she heard a deep chuckle coming from Kaiubi's cage. "So it seems I'm an uncle, no wonder Kaiu was so excited, oh and look he likes you," chuckled Kaiubi in mocking tone, directed at the frozen girl. Naruto shook her head slightly, giving the fox a mental glare as she did. "Oh shut up Kaiubi, we don't have time for this." She shot back just as the whatever it was leaned back, its 9 tails swishing back and forth in apparent happiness. Naruto pushed herself to her feet and looked over the group, letting out a small happy sigh as she saw that Mito and Kushina were unharmed. "Asen, what's going on? I was on my way up when all heck broke loose, and what's that thing?" she asked, looking over at her Kasen for answers. Kushina gave Naruto a small smile before focusing back on her surroundings. "Hi, Naruto, we're all okay, but this position isn't secure and Hiashi is injured, we need to move, oh, and that's Kaiui," the woman said, firing off a pair of golden chains to stop a sound shinobi from jumping onto a leaf junin that was just staggering up from his seat. "Naruto, we need some cover and time to organize, I need you to buy that time, okay," Kushina said as she yanked the enemy shinobi forwards and down the stairs. Naruto gave a fierce little grin before crossing her hand in a familiar sign. Soon there was a large poof of smoke and there were several dozen Naruto charging in every direction, charging into the sound and Suna forces. As her clones crashed into the enemy forces, Kushina took a moment to look upwards to where an explosion had torn the cage booth apart. She spied a blonde figure charging up to the roof after someone and let out a breath she hadn't known she had been holding. It seemed that Minato was alright and joining the fight as well, so she turned back to focus on protecting those she could. "Okay Hiashi, we are getting out of here and getting the kids to the hospital, it will be the most heavily defended, and knowing Tsunade and Shizune they have already gotten there and raised the alarm, understood," called Kushina as the group around her nodded in agreement. Before they moved, Kushina cast a look down below into the arena where Minami and Naruto were likely still there along with Hinata. Naruto seemed to notice her Kasen's gaze and without waiting summoned another force of clones around her, drawing Kushina's eyes. "Don't worry Kasen, I'll head down and support Minami, Hinata and Naruto, you just get everyone out of here, my clones will give you cover," called Naruto as she flashed a smile towards the Redeed. Kushina looked as though she wanted to argue, but the words died in her thought as she looked around at her group, 2 children sleeping, while 1 cripple and Hiashi was injured. No, she couldn't move them all alone. After a moment she finally managed to speak up. "No Naruto, I need you here, I can't protect everyone here and get them to safety alone, I need you here, send a few of your clones below and tell them what is happening, but I need you here to help me," Kushina called as she bent down to pull Hanabi and Mito into her arms, while Hiashi picked up Hitomi, without showing the obvious pain it must have caused him to do so, giving the pair an affirmative nod as he did. Naruto looked left and right for a moment before seeing the small smiling face of Mito as she pulled a lock of Kushina's hair in her sleep. Then without any further argument, she directed a few of her clones into the arena and towards the contestant box, while the remainder formed up around them as she took point. The group noted that Kaiui seemed to have been watching them in slight confusion, its head tilted to one side as it watched them talking to one another. With a small bolt of inspiration, Kushina called to the creature. "Kaiui, go with the clones and look after everyone," called the woman as Naruto moved to take her position. Kaiui looked at the women for a moment before letting out a little yip that seemed to indicate its understanding, before taking off after the clones Naruto had sent into the arena, ideally swatting a few sound shinobi out of its path as it headed out. At the same moment Naruto had moved to stand in front of the group and had her eyes closed in concentration for a moment before, with a blast of chakra they opened and she called out in a loud voice. "Hi Kasen, let's go, I have point," called Naruto as a second tail of chakra sprang from her back and she charged forwards with the group falling in behind her, even as her clones flanked the group every now and then deflecting an incoming attack or dispelling as it flung itself in between an attack headed their way. As Naruto's group shot out of the seats heading for the hospital, Minato was racing up the side of the stadium, his eyes blazing as they focused on the figure before him and the 4 that were flanking him. The blonde's eyes focused upon the bright yellow eyes of Orochimaru as his viper-like smile leered down at the Hokage, even as he fled to the top of the tower, disappearing into another cloud of smoke and dust from a second series of explosions. The first set had apparently been interwoven into the false cage robes that the snake had been wearing. As the screech had come up from the arena floor and the genjutsu fell across the stadium, Minato had turned just in time to see the cage's cloak flying towards him, small sparks of flame already dancing across it, the seals drawn over its inside. Minato had managed to move in time to teleport just out of the blast radios, his eyes blazing as the disguise fell away and revealed the grinning face of Orochimaru. Before Jiraiya could call out to the Hokage, he had already thrown a handful of his kunai into the snake, disappearing into a flash of yellow and appearing just before the still motionless enemy, smashing a swirling ball of chakra into the figure's smiling face, only to have it crumble into earth. As a wicked laugh issues out from above him, causing him to jerk his gaze up to see Orochimaru and 4 others retreating up the tower. Without hesitating, Minato was up and after them, followed close behind by Jiraiya, whose face had set itself into a neutral mask. As the two landed on the top of the building, Minato swept his hand out in a fierce gesture and a blast of wind flew out, forcing the smoke and dust off of the roof. As the wind flew, Minato caught a glimpse of Orochimaru a few feet away, flying through hand signs. Without pausing, Minato flung a kunai towards the man before slamming out a few hand signs of his own, multiplying the projectile from 1 to dozens, before he disappeared into a flash of lights that seemed to dance in between the multiple kunai as they hurtled towards the pale figure. Just as the blades were about to reach the snake, his grin broke as Minato appeared, slamming another swirling ball into his chest and causing him to cough out a small glob of blood before pushing away from the cage. Minato, however, was not about to let the snake go and disappeared into another flash of light before appearing behind the snake and kicking him with enough force to launch him into the air above him. Even as the pale figure went sailing up, Minato pulled 2 fists full of kunai out of his pouch, hurtling them up around the figure before disappearing into another flash of light. Before the sage could right himself in the air, he was slammed in the chest by a bone-crushing kick that caused his bones to crack with a loud snap, but that was only the beginning. Minato flashed back and forth between the kunai in the air, landing blow after blow, throwing the kunai he had teleported to a fresh one as he did, and using the momentum to slam blow after blow into the figure, each becoming harder and faster as he continued to build speed. The pale figure in the center of this shining ball of dancing light in pain could only jerk and spasm as blow after blow fell, too quick to even properly react to the first blow before 3 more had fallen. Finally, after a few moments that felt like a lifetime through an almost destroyed face, the man saw Minato appear above him, 2 swirling balls of blue chakra clutched in his hands, along with small trails of what looked like wind swirling around them, as though each had a mini tornado wrapped around it. The snake opened its eyes in horror, but was only able to watch as with another flash, the orbs were suddenly buried in his chest as he and the blonde flew down into the ceiling, with a small destination from the force with which they struck. There was a horrible breaking sound as the pale figure's form distorted under the blow, his insides turned into an absolute mess as bone became a ripping blade that shredded the figure's chest from the inside. And all the while his barely visible yellow eyes looking up into his killer. Blank. It was that blankness that caught Minato's attention and allowed him to escape the coming attack. Just as Minato vanished into a flash of yellow, the explosive tags literally stitched into the pale man's chest went off with a deafening blast, throwing up a fresh cover of smoke, from which came a horribly familiar laughter from the obscuring cloud of smoke and ash. Before Minato could do more than grit his teeth, 4 walls of purple light shot up around the roof, enclosing both he and Jiraiya in a tower of purple light. Minato was about to let out a howl of anger before he felt Jiraiya step up beside him, motioning for the younger man to hold himself steady. As the smoke once again thinned, the pair could see Orochimaru standing a few yards from them, his face practically ecstatic as he looked at the two. "Well, this is better than I had hoped, both the toad and his tadpole in one net. You must be slipping, oh great fourth, to not notice that. Well, the term person no longer really applies, does it?" The real Orochimaru chuckled as he gestured lazily with one hand over to where the smoking remains the broken double had been. Minato gave the spot a quick glance before focusing back on Orochimaru, his eyes narrowing as he did. Orochimaru smiled even wider as he saw the Hokage's action. "Oh, don't worry, fourth, he was no one of consequence, just a pawn who served his purpose. Truth be told, I doubted I could even survive the assault you just levied, but thanks to my pawn the game has changed," chuckled the pale-faced man as 2 figures stepped out of the cloud of smoke behind Orochimaru as the smoke revealed a pair of open coffins where the 2 had come from. There standing before them was the first and second Hokage, both blinking in apparent confusion as they looked around them, not seemingly able to understand how they were standing there. Minato and Jiraiya both let out a small choked gasp at the sight of the 2, even as the pair focused on the 2, and the 2 seemed to become aware of them for the first time. "Ah, is that Started Minato not believe what his own eyes were showing him, as Jiraiya let out a small bitter snarl and nodded. "Hi Gaki, that's your predecessors alright," answered Jiraiya as the first and second Hokage's eyes focused on the two, their expressions blank and their eyes wide and unseeing. As Minato and Jiraiya were setting up to engage Orochimaru, Naruto and his group were trying to figure out what to do next. Naruto looked from those around him and back to the boy for a moment, then around to those in the booth. However, before he could do more than summon his seedlings, a group of clones of Naruto including Kyuubi arrived in the arena sprinting towards their position. Without waiting, the remaining Konoha shinobi rushed forwards to meet with the clones and figure out their next move. As the teens rushed down the steps, the sounds of battle flared even louder around them, coupled with cries of pain and roars of challenge. The two groups meet at the base of the stairs as the clones drew up to them looking around as if checking to make sure they were all present. "Oh thank Kami you all are okay, Kasen sent us to tell you she had to evacuate the stadium with Mito and the Hyugas, the boss is there now and they are falling back to the hospital to get Hitomi and the little ones out of danger." Spoke up one of the clones as Kyuubi bounded over to sit beside Naruto and Hinata, letting out a small humming purr as it brushed up against the girl. However, they didn't have time to play with Kyuubi at the moment as a howl from the other end of the arena drew their attention where they saw a monster sight. Gaara, or at least what had been the boy. Now he looked nothing so much as a cross between a tanuki and a sandstorm as he swung clawed arms forwards towards Sasuke, the blue-veined claws ending in great black talons. The boy's body from his waist up was now covered in a thick coating of sand that gave him monstrous proportions, including one long tail, all of it made from sand with wicked blue veins running all around it, from the tips of its pointed ears to the tip of its grotesque tail. Even as the group watched, they saw the dark-haired boy dodge the swipe, only to be hammered by a smashing blow from the arena floor, where the earth had turned to sand, throwing him back as the tanuki turned its yellow eyes to see their group standing across from it. "Oh crap." Sakura muttered as the tanuki seemed to have finished playing with the uchiha and had turned its focus to them. However, it seemed that Sasuke had some fight left in him as he rose, a black mark racing around his skin as he did so, a burst of purple chakra falling from his body as a fresh ball of lightning manifested itself into his palm. The boy sprung forwards at the turned back of Gaara, red eyes spinning as he roared out at the target. If not for his own rage brought on by the curse mark, his blow may have managed to land, but as it was, the sound alerted the figure to his presence and time to spin, turning the ground below the uchiha's feet to sand, causing him to falter. And open him up to a smashing blow from Gaara's tail that sent him sailing into the nearby wall with a loud crack that sent both the boy's senses and his chakra scattering all around. With that, the teens let a small shiver of terror run down their spines as the sandy figure turned its eyes upon them once again. "Naruto, I'm sorry to ask this, but I need you to help me now." Kyuubi suddenly spoke, causing Naruto to blink for a moment before responding. "Wawado Kyuubi, please tell me you aren't going to ask me what I think you are?" asked a boy, having a horrible feeling he knew exactly what the woman was about to ask. Kyuubi seemed to know that the boy knew, so settled on simply sending a mental nod before speaking. I'm afraid so, Naruto. Minami could definitely defeat the boy, but I want to help my Sachi and the boy, and we are the only ones who can do that," replied Kyuubi, causing Naruto to let out an agitated sigh before sending a mental nod of his own and turning to address the group around him. "Okay everyone, we need to move. Hinata, Sakura, we need you two out there helping people to get to the hospital, and you two are the only ones here that can manage that. Minami, you need to go with them and cover them, they can't fight off attacks and help the injured at the same time, and they will need your clones to help carry the wounded," continued the boy as the group around him listened. "Naruto's clones can start moving on the offensive throughout the village, helping where they can. My seedlings will go with to provide backup. Naruto, you instruct them with what to do and try and keep them in line." The blonde spoke as 2 to 3 Naruto clones stepped up to 4 of the seedlings as Kyuubi blinked up at Naruto. After a moment, Hinata spoke up. "Naruto, then what about you and Kyuubi?" asked the pale-eyed girl, fighting the worry of her family as well as the growing worry for what she feared Naruto was about to say. In answer, Naruto simply jabbed a thumb back at the monster's figure behind him. "We get that, Kyuubi, and I have to get some work done," responded the blonde as his Nisans and Hinata looked ready to start arguing with him. However, before they could, he raised a hand up. I know you want to stay, but this is something I have to do, please trust me. You can all help save the village in a way I can't, but this I can do. I need you to trust me, K," he said as the girls and the clones stopped their protests before they could form. Finally, one of the Naruto clones let out an angry little sigh before speaking. "Fine, but just so you know, boss is going to kill me for this," she said, turning to face the others, who all gave Naruto a small nod. Hinata gave the blonde a quick hug before she and Sakura prepared to move. Naruto's clones gave him a quick nod as they too headed out. Minami was the last to leave as she looked at Naruto as two of the seedlings collapsed back into seeds and Naruto struck them, redonning his black skin-tight mask and armor around his arms, neck and face. Before she left, Minami gave Naruto a quick hug and then she hopped back as a chakra cloak surrounded her and she and the others raced out. The three girls headed up into the stands to find any injured, while the seedlings led by the clone teams headed off into the village to attack any targets they could find. As they all left, Naruto turned slowly to see Gaara staring at him with a positively evil smile upon his face as his massive arms and tail slammed into the arena floor with dull booms. "Oh yeah, this is going to be just great," thought the blonde as he stretched out his hands and Kyuid on all fours crouched beside him, letting out a small growl towards the figure across from them. Up in the stands, the Jonin senseis had managed to gain the upper hand in their area and had managed to gain a quick breather as they turned to their students prepared to issue orders. Kakashi and Guy had already shot off in pursuit of the enemy after Guy had told Tenten to stay with the others. So Asuma and Kurenai turned to face the 5 genin who were in varying states of weariness. Battle is not an easy thing to do and even a brief bout of hard fighting can quickly exhaust someone, but to their credit, the genin looked prepared to move again if they needed to. "Okay everyone, it looks like Sound and Suna are launching a joint attack. I need you to start getting the civilians out of here, Kurenai, and I need to start taking out the pockets of resistance. Stay together and you should be okay," Asuma called, turning to look around at the gathered genin. Kurenai beside him nodded her head in agreement before shifting her gaze around the stadium where she could see fighting still going on. The genin looked at one another before Shikamaru let out sigh. "Troublesome, okay we'll head out, where is our meet-up point?" asked a boy as he glanced up at his sensei. However, before he could answer, a group of 4 figures jumped up over the arena wall and into the seating. The group was about to jump the new arrivals when they saw that they were 3 Narukos, along with the seedling version of Ino. For a moment the two groups looked at one another before one of the clones let out a small chuckle. Hi, we were just leaving," it said as the 3 clones started to leave, along with their seedling, but Ino was having none of it. Exhausted and in the middle of the battle, didn't seem to even register with the girl as she leapt forwards in time to grab onto the end of the retreating seedling's ponytail, bringing it to sudden halt as it let out a startled hum. As it tried to turn and see what had attached itself to its favorite appendage. "Oh no you don't," called Ino as with a yank she pulled the seedling over as it let out a panicked hum and started to try and run, only causing it to trip and fall over its own feet as it was pulled back, resulting in it toppling over on top of Ino. The two came down onto the seating with a thump. For a moment everyone just looked over at the spot where the two had fallen before the Ino seedling shot up, looking around in apparent panic as it spotted the Naruto clones and took off like a rocket towards them, humming in apparent terror as it sprinted past them. The Naruto clones looked around at the retreating seedling and then back to the group before giving a small shrug and following the girl's hasty retreat. The rest of the group in turn had their attention drawn down as a small groan came from where Ino was pushing herself to her feet. As she did, Shikamaru spotted that she had a few strands of what looked like black hair clutched in one fist as she rubbed at her head, blinking around. "Where'd it go?" Ino asked a little punch drink as she looked around at the rest of them. The rest only shrugged before Shikamaru spoke up in a slightly annoyed tone. "Ino, just drop it for now, we have a job to do, you can hunt down your double later," the boy said as Asuma gave him an affirmative nod. "Hi, he's right Ino, and Shikamaru, meet back here if it's clear, if not then head to the Hokage Tower, now get moving, the civilians need to get moved out of here now." Without any further arguing, the genin took off, headed for the nearest group of civilians, while Asuma and Kurenai dashed off in the opposite direction, heading towards where the fighting was thickest. What neither group had noticed during the small exchange and confusion was that the small orbs that had been floating a few feet away since the pulse went out were slowly unfolding as if they were a bit of paper that had been folded up, fading slowly from black to an electric purple that seemed to be waving slightly as if they were being blown in the wind. Nor did they see when it and its fellows suddenly began heading down into the arena below as another crash occurred below. Meanwhile, Naruto's group was having problems as they battled their way through the town heading for the hospital. Though Naruto could handle just about anything that was thrown at her, she was constantly summoning more and more clones to act as shields for her group, whose speed was horribly slow. Between Hiyashi's damage and the 2 children held by Kushina, they weren't able to effectively travel at their usual speed. This made the trip a moving battle, with the enemy taking the opportunity to attack and harass them as often as possible. Early on, Naruto had tried to carry the group with her clones, but one wind blast later they had found that the clones created too great an opening to get at the weakest of their party if they were dispelled, so the going was slow at best. However, as they reached the square, things went from bad to disastrous as the summons appeared. The first warning they had was a sudden crashing as the store a little ahead of them became flying rubble as a great 2-headed serpent forced its way through the stone structure, turning its 2 massive heads to face the oncoming group. With movement that they would have sworn was too quick for such a massive beast, it shot forwards towards them, its massive jaws open wide as it came, its hiss causing their bodies to shake despite themselves. Naruko, however, was having none of it, with Kasan and Mito at her back, not to mention the Hyugas. The girl was not going to let some snake get anywhere near them. With a primal roar, the girl shot forward into the oncoming serpent's first head, smashing a Rasengan into the creature's form and turning its head into a blast of gore. However, even as the first head detonated, the second seemed to split from its fellow, striking forwards. Naruko had just enough time to swing her now gore-soaked arm out of the mess that had been the summon's head and into the passing cylinder of snake hide, her claws digging deep into the snake's flesh, tearing a deep furrow in it as it passed, causing the creature to hiss in abject pain and rage. Before the summon could do more than scream, however, Naruko's clones were upon it, slamming weapons and blows into its body, keeping it back from the rest of the group. However, this seemed to have been the enemy's plan. Just as the clones abandoned their position to finish the snake sound, shinobi appeared, jumping from the rooftops and doorways, all hurtling down towards the now unprotected members of the group. Kushina was about to panic, but before she could do anything she felt a soft impact as Hitomi was pushed onto her back and the women's arms locked around her shoulders. Kushina's eyes turned in time to see Hiashi darting towards the oncoming shinobi, blood trailing from his wounded back as he threw himself into their midst. Hitomi was letting out shocked sobs as she held onto her friend. Hiashi had told her that should they be stopped, it was her job to look after Hanabi on to apologize to Hinata for him. Hitomi knew that Hiashi was planning to buy them the time they needed, and it broke her to know that she may well have just been beside her husband for the last time, but she forced herself to choke out the words to Kushina. "Oh Kushina, he will catch up with us at the hospital. Go." The Hyuga matriarch said as Kushina steadied herself before hefting the four of them forwards. Naruko's clones had managed to hack their way through the latest summon and now turned to throw themselves at the oncoming numbers, but the area they were in did not give them a real fight. The enemy had chosen their ambush spot carefully, it would seem. High walls and openings were perfect for hidden attacks, and even with a massive amount of chakra, the clones would still dispense from a solid kunai or shrunken blow. Naruko herself had managed to clear them a path and was rushing to meet them as the second summons burst out of a nearby building, its mouth open wide as it charged towards Naruko. The girl spun in time to meet the attack head-on, but the sheer weight of the great serpent was enough to force her back and into a wall. Kushina was about to turn when she heard a strained voice call out to her from where Naruko had crashed into the wall. "Asan, go, I can handle these guys, get Mito and the rest out of here, I'll catch up," called Naruko as with a snapping sound she forced the summon's mouth open even more that the snake could manage. Kushina seemed ready to argue, but realized that carrying who she was in no place to argue. Without waiting, she pushed her quickly tiring body forwards and out towards the hospital. She had made it a few blocks before another screaming hiss roared above her and she turned her face suddenly upwards to see another massive summons, this one with 3 heads falling towards her, fangs bared and its 3 mouths gaping as they shot towards her. Without another thought, Kushina threw herself and her 3 companions sideways into a nearby stand as the serpents' heads crashed down into the street one after another, sending cracks all throughout it and rattling the nearby store doors and windows. Kushina looked up to see the snake's head pulling themselves up, their tongues darting out to taste the air, and she felt a horrible shiver as the 3 heads turned slowly to face her position. Kushina slowly pushed herself up to her feet while moving the 2 still unconscious children into Hitomi's arms as she turned to face the summon. Her armor was still at home, her weapons left as well, but she was not defenseless. As the snake reared back, Kushina let a dozen golden chains shoot from her back and position themselves to receive the next blow and protect those behind her. "Well, come on, you overgrown purse," she called as the snake rushed forwards. As Kushina's group began to strike out in defiance, Minato and Jiraiya were engaged in their own battle. As soon as the 2 past Hokages had arrived, Minato had moved to try and get both he and Jiraiya out of the area to come back when the odds were not so heavily stacked against them. However, it seemed whatever kind of barrier Orochimaru had constructed had severed Minato's connection to his other kunai. While he could still move between them inside of the barrier, escaping was not on the table. So without any other choice, the 2 had turned to attack the 3 figures before them. Minato was still the fastest and closed in on the 3 before they could raise their defenses in time. His first blow drove a hard kick into Orochimaru's chest, forcing the snake to fly back, even as the 2 cages both swiped out with their arms, trying to catch the man who had appeared between them. However, with another flash of yellow light, Minato was gone, and before the 2 could even realize this, a torrent of flames smashed into them courtesy of Jiraiya. As Minato appeared beside his sensei, they saw the 2 black figures amongst the flames falter slightly. However, the next moment they were forced to dive apart as a bullet of water fired past the 2, tearing up the roof, where it impacted, sending clay tiles spinning out in every direction. Before the pair could steady themselves they were forced to move again as what appeared to be living forest shot towards them, long vines and roots digging into the roof as it came diving in and out of the structure like some giant living creature reaching out for them. The vines closed in around the two, but before they could tighten there was another pair of yellow flashes as Minato disappeared, soon followed by Jiraiya, the two landing on top of one of the large wooden roots that had stopped growing. The blonde Hokage looking down at his two predecessors as the fire died away and he saw as their bodies were knitting themselves back together even as they turned those dead eyes up to look at the pair. Jiraiya, what the hell is going on with them? Minato asked as he summoned another kunai to his hand and prepared to re-engage the two below. Jiraiya in turn was looking down at the two, his mind racing, before as though struck by a shock he stiffened. "Okami, he did it." The toad sage muttered as the bit into his thumb and started drawing a seal onto his other palm with his blood. Minato flashed his sensei a puzzled look as the sage finished his work and slammed his palm into the wooden surface, obscuring him momentarily in smoke. When he had re-emerged he had changed, his noise had swelled out and sprouted a few warts, while his hand had become slightly webbed and the lines of red on his face now stretched out. Minato recognized this as his sensei's sage mode, something he had only seen the man adopt once during the last Great War. "Did what, Jiraiya?" Minato barked out, his anger still fresh in his mind and in no mood for the sage's half-answers. Jiraiya turned slightly to face the blonde man before answering. "Ito-tensei." The man breathed out before the two turned to face their opponents once again. Minato's mind raced as he recalled what he knew about the forbidden jutsu and he felt himself suppress a small shiver as he thought what it meant they were up against. However, he was the Hokage and Orochimaru had picked the wrong day to pull off this attack. Without waiting for another word, Minato disappeared in another flash, hurtling down towards where the Hokages and presumably Orochimaru waited. At the same time, just outside of the stadium, another group was having its own run-in with the living dead. Mei the Mizukage stood tall, one hand raised to her lips, tapping idly as she looked across the chaotic area outside the stadium where fighting was still occurring towards where three figures stood. The first was a man apparently in his late teens, his hair was pure white while his skin just a shade darker. He wore a simply open kimono tied with a purple rope and his sunken eyes focused on the woman before him with a calm attitude of a trained killer. Behind him stood two men taller than him that Mei recognized clearly. The one on the right was a skinny man, his head covered by a huge mane of shaggy blonde hair, almost like some kind of animal, and his face hidden behind the mask of a hunter shinobi. The other wore a simple green kimono and had his head and one eyes bound up in bandages, his brown beard hanging down over his chin. Oh yes, she knew these two men, after all she had killed them herself just a few months ago during the revolution. What caught her eye more than anything were the weapons clutched in their hands. The skinny figure held a needle-like blade lightly in one hand, while the other had a massive club-like blade that had a roll of explosive tags carpeting one side of it. Well, now isn't this interesting? Who would have thought I would run into some familiar faces, and in the middle of all of this chaos, what are the odds? The woman spoke her dangerous sensual tone, telling anyone who listened that she found nothing about the situation amusing. From behind her, Zabuza let out a small chuckle as he glanced over at the three, looking them up and down. "Oh, I don't know, Mei, I would say they were here just to see little old you. Aren't these business reunions always such a blast?" Mocked Zabuza as he unslung his blade from his back, allowing it to crash into the ground in front of him, even as a small mass of purple chakra began to form behind him, taking on the form of a demon. Mei actually gave Zabuza a small genuine smile at this, before casting a look over to the pale member of the group. "Well, now a survivor of the Kagaya clan, I had heard you had all died out. Are you here for some petty attempt at revenge, because the time for that is past?" Called Mei, even as three figures dropped in behind her and Zabuza. The pale figure didn't seem to even notice her words and his eyes tracked to the three newcomers. Haku, along with Karen and Sujetsu, had just arrived, the three looking over at the figures across from them, their faces blank with apparent shock. "Hey, isn't that Jinpachi and Kushimaru? I thought they were dead." Called Sujetsu, raising a hand to point at the two. His question was answered by the impact of Karen's fist on the back of his head, causing it to explode into a wave of water. "Aka, of course they are dead, this has to be trick or something," she called out in an annoyed tone. Haku let out a small sigh at the other's antics before looking over at Karen with a blank expression. "Karen, you know he can't hear you if you destroy his head like that," the boy said in a tone that made it clear he had had this same discussion countless times. Karen seemed not to notice his words as she looked up to where Mei was still watching the three figures across from them. "Mei, tell you what, I'll take the two big ones and you and the genin get to play with the bone boy," Zabuza said, stepping forwards to stand before her and the genin. Mei seemed to consider it for a moment before giving a small shrug of her shoulders. "That is fine by me, it will at least let your apprentice fight someone after his match was so rudely postponed," smiled the woman, her tone one of almost sensual pleasure. Zabuza smiled behind his bandage as he fixed his gaze across at his newest targets. "You hear that, Gakkus? Try not to die out there." The man called as he charged. The two figures behind the pale figure darted out to race towards him, leaving the Mizukage and her genin relatively alone with the pale figure who finally seemed to have found his voice. "No," he said in a flat tone, which almost sounded like it belonged to a dead man. May and the genin looked slightly puzzled at this before he continued. "In answer to your question earlier, this is not some revenge on the mist. I am here at the bidding of my master and nothing more." The pale figure called before he pulled his head to one side and with the same dead expression, yanked a blade made from bone from his shoulder before pointing it towards the woman before him. "And he had ordered me to make sure that you do not interfere in his plans for the leaf," finished the youth. May looked at the boy for a moment before a small laugh escaped her lips and her eyes flashed with an almost primal excitement, her lips curving into a wicked smile that promised nothing good. "Well boy, you don't lack for courage, but let's see just how long you can keep that up," she called as with a small flick she blew a kiss that was accompanied by a small ball of molten lava that the boy threw up his blade to block. As he lowered his blade he saw the three genin charging forward as May smiled behind them. Without another sound he flung himself forwards intent on serving his master's goals, even if that meant slaying the cage before him. As the cages began their battles, Naruto was about to get their own match underway. Gaara had turned his full attention from the now unmoving form of Sasuke as he watches the two figures before him. Without a moment wasted he dug his two hands into the arena before with a move like a cross between a track starter and a pole vaulter he flung himself forward at the two. Shukaku in the meantime was staring across at the two figures, his mind focused on the two as a nagging feeling kept trying to force its way into his mind. Gaara's rage should be enough for these two, but something doesn't sit right here. That one on the left looks like little Kurama, I wonder why that is, and the monkey ... why does that form of his look familiar, it's almost lick. Shukaku was saying before his thought suddenly slammed into place and he let out a cry of rage at what he had just realized. There was no time to communicate with his host or to stop the assault already in progress, but he could act now and hopefully stop what he feared was about to happen. As Gaara flung forwards, the sand that had been shifting around him suddenly swarmed in front of him like a cloud, spreading itself out into an almost cushion-like shape between him and his target. Just as the sand expanded out, what looked like a sudden wave of black and purple shot over the walls of the arena, shooting forwards to form a wall-like structure just a foot in front of the Retide's two targets. If not for the cushioning sand, Gaara likely would have plowed directly into the obstacle and smashed against it like a bug. Instead the sand broke like a wave and Gaara managed to dig his tail into the arena floor before flipping back to land crouched as he let out a roar at the obstacle keeping him from his prey. Shukaku in the meantime was not much calmer than his host as the anger boiled up inside him seeing his Kasen's technique, the one he had painstakingly recreated in the hands of one of those puny monkeys. What he saw was a wall made up of overlapping leaves that shifted lazily between black and purple, the same as those that adorned his mother's true form. As he watched, the leaf seemed to relax before, as if carried by a gentle wind, moved too slowly, circled the boy's form a few, gently alighting upon him and covering the orange of his coat, turning it that same shifting countenance. Even as he watched, the coat seemed to spread out behind the boy, as if caught in a breeze itself, the back parting becoming 10 separate ends gently swing like tails flashing purple and black in the midday sun, even as his face looked at him with those two glowing orange globes. The rest of the leaf simply drifted around the boy gracefully like his own sand, almost as if they had a life of their own. Naruto let out a small breath that couldn't been seen through his mask and privately thanked himself for all time he had spent working with Yubi to work on the foundations of her own style. The real luck had come when they had found that tree in the forest of death that had been so saturated with chakra, without that he doubted he could have collected enough chakra paper to even get the real training with his pollen underway. Still, he had to admit the feeling was still very odd to him, as though he was directing 1,000 fingers all attached to one hand. The boy did not have time to ponder this further as Gaara and Shukaku recovered and threw out their arms howling in a blind rage as his now monstrous voice rang out. "How dare you steal from mother? Sand shuriken!" shouted the Tanuki boy as what looked like dozens upon dozens of bullets of sand shot out, forming into spinning stars. The hail of bladed sand shot forwards, seemingly cutting the very air as they came, sending up a shrill shriek as they came. Naruto in turn swung both his hand through the swirling leaves, swiping them violently forwards towards the oncoming projectiles. As if by themselves, several leaves pulled themselves forward and grouping into spinning blades of their own that plunged forward, shimmering between violent purple and black as they spun forwards. The projectiles smashed into one another, bits of sand and leaf scattering as they impacted with a sound of ripping furiously. Even as Naruto had launched the assault, his own voice rang out in a commanding tone. "Aiuid, get in there, I'll cover you." The blonde shouted as he swiped his arms forward, again countering a second volley of sand that flung itself forwards. Kaiweed let out a small humming growl before it shot off like a dart on all fours, racing over the ground towards the sand monster before him. Gaara was still too focused on Naruto to give the approaching figure any mind, but Shukaku was not so blind to the danger. Great claw-like spines shot up out of the ground as the fox creature charged, trying to entangle the creature. Kaiweed dodged in and out of the virtual forest of sandy spires, its eyes glowing as it closed in on the boy. Finally Gaara seemed to recognize the danger and swung his arms over into a crushing blow that looked likely to smash the creature before him with his two great sand claws. As the two arms closed there was a sudden surge of those same purple and black leaves that slammed like living waves into either arm, forcing them apart enough for Kaiweed to rush through the gap. With an unintelligible cry of rage, Gaara looked up to see Naruto, his two arms outstretched towards him, as if pushing on a great weight, the leaves that had been dancing around him now holding the Tanuki's arms at bay. Before there was time to process this there was a crashing sensation as Kaiweed plowed into the boy's chest with a cannonball worth of force. Suddenly Gaara found his arms wrapped in several powerful black bands as he twisted his head down just in time to see Kaiweed's mouth opening right in his face. This may have been the end for the boy if Shukaku hadn't been ready for the next attack. Without a moment's hesitation Gaara felt his mouth slam open, pulled by the sand around him as a concentrated ball of chakra formed in his own mouth. Just as Kaiweed had finished its own blast, Shukaku Gaara spit their own down into the creature's mouth, causing the two to detonate. The resulting blast blew through the two apart, sand flying out in every direction, even as Kaiweed skipped back over the ground near to where Naruto was still standing. As Kaiweed skidded to a halt, looking disheveled, one of its tails bending in an odd way as its ears drooped in obvious discomfort. Gaara was in a similar state. The sand face around him had been crushed back along with most of the chest and one of the arms of the beast, sand trickling down like blood from his monstrous form. However, even as Naruto watched, the sand stopped its collapse before surging back up the face, repairing as the boy's body and arms swelled out to their previous form. "Oh come on, that's just not fair," Naruto shouted as Gaara stood again, apparently unharmed from the last assault. Kaiweed beside him let out a small whimpering hum of annoyance. The two looked at each other for a moment before Naruto nodded his head and Kaiweed flicked its tail in "I'm ready if you are" kind of motion before the two turned to face the sand figure before them once again. Gaara had just managed to recover from the last blast when he looked up to see the two charging him. Without another thought he threw his arms up in violent slashes, great clumps of sand flying off of his arms, becoming great flying claws of sand, followed by slivering rivers of the grainy substance. Kaiweed leapt into the flying claws, swiping its tails around to smash the coming projectiles, spinning forwards through them one after another. Naruto beside him was busy directing waves of his leaves crashing into the waves of sand, countering them before they could push forwards and entrap the pair. As the detonations of sand and leaves blasted all around them, Naruto and Kaiweed closed on Gaara, bringing the battle into close quarters. Kaiweed was the first to move, leaping up at Gaara's face, his claws pointed forwards towards the boy's face. Shukaku, however, was coming to an end of his patience with this fight and without pause, pulled the sand around the boy's right arm, swinging it up to block the oncoming creature. Kaiweed buried its claws into the great sand arm, its tails wrapping around the appendage, even as a couple shot forward to wrap around the sand boy's neck and chest, pulling, trying to force itself closer. Almost without thought the sand upon the arm shot out into spines, several shooting up into the creature's tails and body, sending up a cry of humming pain from the creature. The cry soon turned into a roar as Kaiweed swung its head round and began spitting out small fast blasts of chakra into the sand around it. However, before he could get off more than a handful of shots, Gaara's tail came slamming forwards to crash into the figure's head, crashing it down into the sand of its arm and smothering its attack. At the same moment Naruto had shot up and under the beast's other arm, even as he threw out another wave of leaves to intercept a missile of sand that shot towards him. As he reached the base of the sand monster he slammed his still armored palms into one another in a clapping motion. As he pulled them apart a length of chain extended between the two as Naruto swung himself up and around the figure, looping the chain around the beast's neck before yanking it taut, pulling the howling beast's head back just as it let out another blast of chakra that had been meant for the entangled Kaiweed. Without pausing Naruto set himself before pulling the chains taut and sending what few leaves he had available into the boy's exposed leg, causing it to buckle with a force and the whole beast come toppling down onto the arena floor. As the beast fell Naruto released the chains before leaping up and towards the now fallen boy's head, looking to end the battle now while he had the advantage. Kaiweed in the meantime had managed to free a few of its tails and was even now fighting to free its mouth and open up with a fresh volley of blasts. Gaara was lost in a blind fury as she struggled to crush the two figures around him, all sense of reason having left him some time ago. Shukaku, however, had calmed into an ice-cold calm. So the little monkey wants to play like he is a monster. Well, let's show him what a real monster is like. called the great sand tanuki as he closed his eyes in focus and let out the seals, limiting the amount of chakra allowed into his host. The only warning that Naruto had was a sudden pulse of bone-deep fear and Juubi suddenly calling for him to watch out, but both came a second too late. There was a moment before it happened when Naruto was still hanging in midair committed to his next strike, even as Kyuubi was just managing to pull its head free. In that moment Gaara suddenly halted his shifting as his yellow eyes went wide and the sand around him stiffened for a half a second before suddenly exploding out. Naruto was caught and flung away from the sheer force of the coming wave, flying a few dozen feet to skip across the arena floor, swinging his head up to see the slowly growing mass of sand before him. Kyuubi wasn't so lucky, he was carried up with the blast as the arm he had been battling with slowly formed into a single claw of one great hand. Naruto watched in horror as the sand slowly formed into a head and legs while an immense tail burst forth from its back. Bright blue veins sparkling up around the body as the mouth opened in an earth-shaking roar. Shukaku's body fully formed now stood in the center of the stadium, its bulk taking up nearly the entire floor area, the still form of Gaara hanging limply from the center of the beast's head. With an almost lazy movement the great beast looked down at its figure, where Kyuubi was firing off a few blasts of chakra into the beast's arm and chest, blowing chunks of sand that shifted back into place a moment later. Without another thought the massive creature flicked its arm in a swishing motion, flinging Kyuubi free of its claw and into the air away from itself. Kyuubi. Crap Juubi, why the heck do I ever listen to you? Called Naruto as his wave of leaves surged around him, even as Shukaku looked down at the boy, along with Gaara hanging limply from the beast's head. Oh, and you never get us into trouble. Juubi fired back, her tone a little anxious as well. Well, this is still worse. Naruto yelled back, almost causing Juubi to smile despite the situation. However, before she could respond Naruto forced his waves of leaves to fly between him and an oncoming blast of wind that the giant-tailed beast had fired off at the boy. The blast hit the wall with such force that the whole structure bowed in, despite the chakra being weakened as it hit. Juubi, I don't think I have a chance here. Naruto shouted, his tone slightly panicked. Juubi let out a breath before nodding and starting to move up the tree she had been sitting in with a determined look on her face. Naruto, get it ready, we don't have a choice. Called Juubi as she climbed, causing Naruto to look up at the slowly breaking barrier he had formed as a second blast hammered down into it. Some of the leaves fell from the mass, slowly crumbling away until it was caught up in the intense wind still flying around the last blast and was carried away and off over the battle around him. The boy watched the remains for just a moment before bowing his head in acknowledgement as the black armor around him slowly receded, leaving the boy's face exposed, covered in sweat and slightly panting. The black armor continued to shift away from him until one seed was there floating just a foot in front of him, while the other flew back into his coat. At the same time that Shukaku was taking shape, the Konoha defenders were throwing everything they had into the oncoming forces. The Inashikacho trio had just finished fighting a group of enemies and were headed towards the outer walls when they saw something that brought them up short. There a few yards away were their children, all battling against a small force of enemies as civilians ran behind them, fleeing away from the conflict happening around them. Beside the teens was what appeared to be a noble-looking woman with long purple hair who seemed to be directing the panicking people away. As they watched, one man in fancy cloths tried to barrel his way over a pair of children, only to be caught by the neck by the woman's hand and yanked back before she slammed a foot down into his body, holding him down as she waved other on and out of the field of combat. Hey, isn't that the Queen of Snow? Chimza called even as the three rushed forwards to aid their children. The other two gave him quick nods as they raced forward. However, just when they were about halfway there, a giant serpent shot out of the building beside where the attackers were coming from before charging the Genin's position. The parents let out cries of fear as they saw the beast charge their children. However, before the snake could reach them, something else caught their eyes. From the top of the stadium, 4 figures leaped flying down like bullets down at the summon. The first 3 impacted the summon with blue orbs of chakra that exploded into small blasts all along the creature's side, sending bits of scales and blood out into the air. The final figure, however, wrapped what looked like its own hair around the creature's mouth before landing on the beast's head before driving a fist the size of a food cart into the snake's head, forcing it to crash a few feet before the Genin's position. As the parents reached the position, the form of the creature came into view, a perfectly black version of Ino who hopped happily down from the downed snake and letting out a small hum almost like a huff as it turned towards everyone, its hands planted on its hips as it looked around at the group in apparent pride. Before anyone else could speak, the Queen of Snow's voice bellowed out with an authority that did not allow for questions. You, the one with the snake, stop standing around waiting for someone to praise you and get over here and help me. The woman almost screamed, causing the Ino seedling to jump slightly before rushing over, taking orders from the woman, letting out small hums of apparent fright as it did. The rest of the group just looked over at the pair for a moment before Shikaku called them back to the matter at hand. Troublesome Shikamaru, Ino, Choji, Yakumo, Tenten will handle this spot from here, you head back with the civilians. The village still has pockets of resistance and they need an escort, called the man, immediately getting nods from the genin, who raced out to get to work as the adults rushed forwards towards the outer wall. Spying a few groups of clones that they recognized as Naruto's, accompanied by one of those strange black figures, usually causing 9 kinds of hell for anyone they came across. At the same time that the summon fell to the Ino seedling, Kushina had just finished spearing the final head of the massive summon she had been fighting. She was now sporting a pair of cracked ribs and one arm hung limply by her side, where she had been forced to hold her ground to keep the snake from charging past her to get at the 3 she protected. But the sickening crack, her golden chain snapped the final head's jaws open and back, almost splitting the creature's head apart as she turned back to see Hitomi and the children still huddled a distance away, still safe. Kushina let out a heavy breath as she moved back to the 3, her feet heavy, but the smile on her face showing through the pain as she pushed herself back to their sides. However, just as she was about to reach them, there was another loud roaring hiss and she turned wide-eyed to see another pair of serpents slithering forwards towards her over the body of the fallen serpent. These only stretched till the size of large horses, but even still Kushina let out a cry of rage, shouting as she did. "When will you fucking purses get the idea?" she called as a new group of chains burst out of her back and pointed towards the oncoming serpents. The summons reared up, letting out hisses as their mouths stretched wide, showing long pointed fangs dripping with what could only be poison. However, before the pair could strike, there was a sudden boom off in the distance before a giant blade shot through the 2 snakes and into the ground a few yards in front of Kushina, accompanied with a crash that made the ground around her shake. The Redeed threw her head up and found herself looking up into the giant face of a red toad. "The Gamabunta," Kushina said, her smile returning as she spied the 2 figures standing on top of the great toad's head looking down at her. There was Minami and Naruto, both looking more than a little worn out, but smiling all the same as they looked down, waving and calling down at Kushina from their spot above. "Asen, sorry we were late, are you and Mito alright?" called Naruto as Minami just waved one hand limply, obviously running on empty, but smiling happily all the same. Kushina had to blink tears out her eyes as she looked up at the 2, nodding her head in before brushing away the moisture with one sleeve and looking back up at the girls. "Hi, we are all safe thanks to you, can you get us to the hospital?" called Kushina as the 2 girls nodded in reply. "Hey boss, we need to get my cousin, Midichin and the others to the hospital, think you can help us out?" called Naruto as the toad let out a heavy exasperated sound. "I swear you 2 are running me ragged, but I suppose I can help you out this one time," replied the massive toad, his tone intimidating, but the girls could hear the note of humor in it all the same. The toad boss may be prideful sometimes, but he was also very soft-hearted, only don't let him know that he thought he was a yakuza. So Kushina, Hitomi and the 2 still unconscious children found themselves lifted up in one giant webbed hand as the toad took another crashing leap and they were headed off towards the hospital. As the groups headed out, Naruto and Minami ran down to the toad's hand, the pair flying into Kushina as they arrived, holding onto her and letting out small cries of worry as they saw her injuries. Kushina in turn just pulled the pair close to her with her one good arm, ignoring her injuries, and was just happy to see her children safe. From beside her, Hitomi looked around before speaking up, worry in her voice. "Naruto, where is Hiashi? Where is Hinata? Where is my family?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion as she looked at the pair in clear panic. Naruto and Minami looked over at her before quickly giving her a reassuring smile before Minami spoke up. "They are just fine, Hitomi-san, they will probably beat us to the hospital," Minami said in a happy tone as the group continued to journey towards the hospital. Minami set about explaining to the Hyuga matriarch what she had seen just a few minutes before. The Ashi had stood in the middle of a street, weapons and bodies littered around him as several sound and soon a shinobi closed in from all sides as if predators circling a winded beast. A pair shot forwards only for Hiashi to spin, catching the 2 with another solid pair of strikes, causing them to draw sharp pained expressions before falling dead into the ground before him. However, even as they fell, Hiashi felt the bite of another kunai as it buried itself into his calf from behind him. Whether luck or simple odds, the sheer number of projectiles had found his blind spot a handful of times. However, that was all they needed thanks to their sheer number. So as Hiashi stumbled forwards, he looked around, his mind drawing the grim conclusion to this fight. "Adam, them, there's just too many." The stoic Hyuga threw as he saw the group pulling out another slew of weapons to begin their assault anew. As the next attack sprang forwards, Hiashi found himself in a sudden sense of peace as he thought of the smiling faces of his wife and children. Well, at least they are safe, the man thought as he prepared to sell his life at the highest cost he could manage. However, just as he swung to meet the attack that would likely claim his life, his vision suddenly picked up several fast-moving forms that crashed headlong into the forces around him. He had a moment to recognize the shapes of large hammers and oddly fluffy shapes before a voice called out to him through the din of noise. "Tausen," called a concerned voice, which Hiashi recognized. He turned in time to see Hinata jumping down from the back of the same massive grey rabbit, which stood up and in a swift motion, swung its massive hammer to catch Asuna shinobi in mid-leap, hurling the figure into a nearby wall with a loud crack. The man blinked slightly as he felt his legs giving out under him, even as his eldest leapt up beside him, her eyes the shining white and black that he had seen in the arena. Idly he also noted the horns that gave her the impression of having a pair of bunny ears shooting out from her head. She was speaking quickly and in half-panicked voice as she applied glowing green chakra to his form as the pain slowly began to fade. With it soon faded his consciousness as well. Hinata looked down at Hiashi, trying not to cry out at the wounds littering the man's body, while looking left and right to where Roku and his siblings were smashing their way through the would-be attackers. She, Minami, and Sakura had managed to fight their way clear of the stadium and were moving when they had run into an attacking force from sound. Minami's clones had been able to stall, but they were slowly losing ground and the injured behind them presented too great a target to hope that the assault would lighten any time soon. Then Minami had come up with the idea of helping Hinata to fuel a summoning to help get the injured out. The girls had seized upon the idea and the next moment Hinata had slammed the abundant amount of chakra that Minami had created into a summoning. The result was what stood around them. Roku and 7 of his siblings had arrived, turning their hammers into the attacking forces before moving to help evacuate the injured. The group had been on the move when they had almost crashed into Hiashi's battle, Hinata spotting her Tausen and calling the summons forwards into the battle. Now she sat kneeling over Hiashi, stopping the worst of the injuries as the rabbits formed up around her and the other injured, creating a very deadly albeit fluffy wall around their position. "Sakura, I need you," called Hinata, her tone panicked as Sakura dropped down beside her, taking a quick look before diving into her own medical work on the man. Minami in turn arrived a moment later, draped across the back of a smaller rabbit, the amount of chakra she had discharged between the clones and the summoning, having drained her impressive reserves more than she had thought possible. "Ho-ho, is he?" asked Aridid, the exhaustion clear in her voice as she posed the question. Hinata and Sakura remained silent for a few more moments, focused on the man below them, before they let out small tired but relieved sighs. "He's going to be fine," whispered Sakura, leaning back and letting out a small happy chuckle as one of the rabbits brushed up against her, causing her to lean gratefully into the softness for a moment. The rabbit didn't seem to mind and just let the girl rest for a moment. Hinata in turn was crying, unable to speak. The fear she had felt at seeing Hiashi in such a state had almost driven her to break down, but with an effort she forced herself up to look around them. "Araku-san," the girl called, causing the rabbit to turn its face to look back at her in recognition of her words. "We need to keep moving, the hospital isn't far and the injured need to get to cover. Can you and your siblings keep going?" she asked. The massive rabbit let out a small huff before calling out in a loud voice. "Well, Nisans and Niasans, what say you, can we carry our summoner and her charges to safety?" called Roku in a deep voice. There was an echoing cry of assent as hammers were lifted into the air and slammed back down as the force prepared to move again. That was when Naruto had arrived, looking like she had gotten into a fight with half of the invasion force herself, but a small happy grin playing across her face at the same time. "Hey, Kasan is up ahead, Minami, we need to head out," the blonde called as the Redeed lifted her head, giving a small wave of acknowledgement. Naruto looked around at the summoned rabbits for a moment before hitting herself over the head for not thinking of the same sooner and flying through a few hand signs before slamming her hands down, sending out a billowing cloud of smoke that separated to show the massive body of Gamabunta. A few moments later the group was off, Minami along with Naruto perched atop the toad boss, while the rest flew forwards with their furry protectors. Flashback end. As the girls finished, Hitomi relaxed slightly, a smile spreading across her face as she heard her family was safe. Kushina to let out a happy little smile at the news before she noticed that someone was missing. "Minami, Naruto, where's Naruto?" Kushina called even as a sudden roar caught her attention and the group turned to see the massive form of Shukaku rising out of the stadium a great distance away. Above the stadium in the purple pillar, Minato found himself being driven back along with Uraya against the assault of the 3 figures before him. The 2 resurrected cages seemed to be able to absorb everything they threw at them and keep coming. At the same time Orochimaru continued to harass them with long-range justice and weapons, fading back every time they got close to him and allowing his puppets to take any attack meant for him. Minato and Jiraiya had found themselves breathing heavily back to back as they looked over at the 2 immortal cages facing them. "Well, Gaki, I hope you have a plan for this, cause I'm just about out of tricks to pull. If we had time, we could figure out the seal that blasted snake used, but at this rate it isn't looking good that we are going to make it out of this," the sage said, setting his eyes forward towards the second Hokage who was standing a few yards before him. Minato in the meantime was still running on the combined rage he had been feeling and barely registered the sage's words. Instead he gritted his teeth in a silent snarl as he summoned a pair of shadow clones to either side of him. "Buy me some time now," shouted the blonde as the three began to focus on whatever they had planned. Jiraiya was about to argue but decided against it. Instead he flung himself forwards towards the second Hokage, throwing out everything he had at the figure, forcing him to fall back before swinging round to charge at the first Hokage in turn. On his shoulders Ma and Pot-O did what they could to hold off any justice flying in at the man from afar. In the meantime Minato was busy as two swirling balls of chakra slowly began to change as wing began to gather around them. A few moments later there was a whistling noise that drew everyone's attention back towards the blonde Hokage. However, even as their eyes turned there was a bright flash of light and then the noise was gone for a moment before it flared once again into clarity just behind the two undead cages. The two turned only in time to receive two massive bladed Rasengans like oversized shining shrunken that plunged into the two with a horrible sound of ripping and tearing that rent the air as though it could actually sink teeth into it. Jiraiya looked on in utter shock as the two figures disappeared into blinding blue orbs of light and that noise swelled out to ear-splitting volume. Then it all came to an end with a massive detonation that dropped the two cages to the ground, their forms unmoving, covered in what looked like millions of cuts and stabs. Turning, Jiraiya saw Minato standing a few yards above him upon one of the massive wooden branches that the first had thrown at them, breathing heavily, his arms hanging at his side and his palms a horrible blackened color. Jiraiya was about to call out to him when a sudden blow impacted his back, flinging him into a wooden root and knocking the man momentarily unconscious. Minato, who had been looking down, saw a long snake slinking back into the shadows behind the man, Amanda cackling filling the rooftop as it did. "Very nicely done, Minato, I must say you truly are a genius of the highest caliber, something so destructive, I have to say I am impressed," called the snake's voice as he stepped out of the shadows. Minato felt his stomach's bottom drop out as he saw the figure before him. Orochimaru's skin was still pale white, but instead of being its usual smooth completions, it had rough breaks in it like scales. His eyes, usually snake-like, had swelled out, his whole face shifting to become a horrible cross between snake and man, even as the snake that had impacted Jiraiya slunk back to show that it was attached to his back like some kind of grotesque tail. Orochimaru grinned up at the shocked expression of the cage's face. "Oh this," Orochimaru half-asked, waving his hands around at his form, "you didn't really think I would come here to burn everything you love without preparing, did you? I may be ambitious, my dear Minato, but I am not a fool unlike those who live in this village," called the snake sage, his grin becoming a leer of deepest enjoyment and insult. Minato's eyes narrowed upon the man as despite the pain in his hands, he clenched them into fists as he looked down at the figure below him. "Orochimaru, I should tell you this, you picked the worst possible day to pull this invasion," called Minato, even as with some intense pain, he pulled a new pair of kunai out of his coat. Orochimaru, giving the man a puzzled look as he did. "Oh, do tell, oh great fourth Hokage, why is today any different than any other?" called Orochimaru, his tone brimming with false interest as he reached out the hilt of a blade which he pulled out a moment later. Minato didn't even pause as he watched to display his focus elsewhere at the moment. "Because you traitorous snake, I'm about to show you what happens when I'm having a bad day," called Minato right before he disappeared in a flash of light before appearing behind Orochimaru as the snake sage swung his blade around to catch the oncoming blow, the viper coming from his back striking out at the Hokage as the blades clashed. Minato was forced to teleport again to avoid the incoming strike, landing a few feet away from the snake and flinging a few blasts of wind at the sage, who replied in kind, countering them with his own assault of wind. As the two prepared to move again, their attention was drawn to a tearing cracking sound that came from above them. Both turned to see something black and slightly humanoid smash into and then through the barrier surrounding them and crashing a few yards away from them with an audible thunk. The two shinobi stared from the hole that had already almost sealed itself back to the spot where the whatever it was had landed, both wondering how what they had seen was possible. However, before they could even grasp what had just occurred, a fresh shock occurred as Kyuid ejected itself from its landing spot, shaking its head and letting out an annoyed-sounding hum as it fluffed out its 9 tails. The Kyuid looked from Minato, who it didn't seem to recognize, then over to Orochimaru. It seemed to focus on the sage for a moment before its glowing eyes flashed and then narrowed and a clearly audible humming growl began to fill the air. The next instant Orochimaru was forced to raise his blade up to block as Kyuid spat out a ball of concentrated chakra that ripped towards him like a small black missile. Minato, seeing this, turned to face the sage again, his mind coming to 2 quick conclusions. First, that he had no idea what the creature was or how it had breached the barrier. 2, it didn't like Orochimaru, which meant it was alright by him, at least for the time being. So with that, Minato charged forwards even as on his side Kyuid did the same. Below in the arena, Shukaku was still firing blast after blast down onto the shield below that looked about to crack. Naruto in the meantime was huddled under the shield, focusing on the pair of orbs before his eyes. Slowly one of the orbs began to shake as Naruto concentrated. Yubi, for the record, if this blows up I'm blaming you. Naruto called as a small hum started to shake around the orb before him. Yubi, who had just reached the top of her tree when she let out a heavy breath, along with a small laugh. Haha, okay Naruto, but let's do this, I think it's about time that I started carrying my own weight around here. Yubi called as Naruto himself allowed his face split into a fierce grin. I suppose so, just make it count. Called the blonde as he threw his hand forwards to grab the orb in front of him. Without waiting he swung the orb down into the ground below him and with a small effort, fired the ball off like a shot, plunging it straight down into the ground with a loud crack. For a few moments the only sound was the continued crashing of air against Naruto's ever-shrinking shield. Then it came, a loud rumbling sound that shook the ground all around him, reaching all the way up to the stadium seats, causing more than one group to turn down past a great Tanuki, who was looking just as apparently confused down at the arena floor. For a long moment everything seemed to go quiet, the explosions around seemed to soften, as the cries of battle began somewhat muted, as all eyes seemed almost pulled to the arena and not towards the great-tailed beast, which wasn't exactly an everyday occurrence. What came next, however, shocked everyone more than anything they had ever seen. The silence was slowly overtaken with a sudden calm that seemed to stretch out over the entire village. Fire justice dimmed and winds broke as water seemed to calm its crashing, even the earth and lightning stopped their crashing, as if afraid of something that they had not felt in a lifetime. There was no violent roar or crash as the structure rose, no call of great power, instead an almost silent fear was all that announced its entrance. Thousands watched as from the arena floor a pillar of white slowly stretched out, slivers splitting off 2 foot branches as it went, as millions of leaves that seemed to shift between midnight black and electric purple sprouted out to cover its branches. The tree, for that is what it was, stretched up and up until it was taller than the massive form of Shukaku, who stood beside it, his mouth open wide in shock at what he was seeing. As the tree finally stopped its ascent, the leaves seemed to open up, casting a soft glow over the stadium, even as small flecks of black and purple lights, like stars, slowly drifted down from its branches. The eyes turned from the magnificent tree to spot 2 figures whom appeared to be riding upon the sea of leaves that carpeted the top of the great monolith. Naruto was there, sitting, his hands thrown out behind him to keep him from falling through the canopy and looking as though a stiff breeze may be enough to take him out of commission. However, that is not where everyone's eyes were drawn, they stared in wonder and shock at the figure standing beside Naruto, long purple hair blowing softly in the wind as the light from the tree played off her porcelain skin. The figure slowly drew in a breath, the first in over 1,000 years on this plane, and opened her eyes towards where Shukaku stood, a sense of power simply radiating off of her that swept out over the village and the elemental nations. In other nations across the land, a girl jumping excitedly from tree to tree while trying to learn to fly nearly crashed as the creature inside of her suddenly froze, causing the two to fall to the forest floor. In mountainous region, 2 men sat drinking before at once, both found themselves frozen as their tenants both suddenly came forwards at the same time, calling out as they did. In the land of mist, a traveler sat watching his student just as he was about to blow a fresh set of bubbles. A sudden distress call from his tenant caused him to breathe in and begin choking on the substance. From a lake off in the hidden waves, a creature that had been sleeping let its one eye blink suddenly open in shock and excitement. Even as a pair of jonin fell to their knees in the Raikage's office, both stunned at the intensity of their tenant's calls. In all cases the cry had been the same, called from many tongues in many lands, it cried out. Hasan. Yubi looked down at Shukaku for a moment, her eyes saddened but firm, as she did. Without a word she lifted one hand up in a smooth gesture before stretching it out toward Shukaku, the great beast withering slightly in her gaze. Shukaku, it's time you let your rage go, my brave little protector. Called the Yubi as from the tree around her great pillars of leaves shot up, giving the impression of 10 great tails swaying in the air. Thank you for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the next part, don't forget to turn on notifications by hitting that bell icon. Please like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know your thoughts. Check out my other videos for more content you might enjoy. Until next time, take care.